Hello. Welcome to the Fanfic Majesty. If you want more content, you can follow me on Patreon. I will be uploading more content on there that will be exclusive. The link is in the description. Please support me.
2 Centiliters Chapter 10. Because Nami is our navigator, proclaimed Luffy so loudly that his voice echoed through the room. Really? Arlong asked mockingly. You want her to navigate your pathetic little ship for you? Ha, I guess you truly have no idea what a monumental waste of talent that would be. He gestured around to the maps in the room. Look, there is no one else on the face of the planet who can draw sea charts with such accuracy and efficacy. That young lady has a gift. Luffy kept looking around as his eyes went to the desk. A small pen fell and clattered on the floor. Luffy stretched his hand over to grab it and stare at it himself. And there isn't really anything as ultimately regrettable as wasting natural talent. Staying here and drawing up charts for me is her only chance of living up to her full potential, Arlong declared, not noticing Luffy was no longer paying attention to him. But when Luffy next spoke, he said in a quiet but dark voice, this pen is stained with blood. Arlong, ignorant of the Chimera boy in front of him, was continuing to boast, in order for me to obtain world supremacy her sea charts are absolutely vital. He took his shark saw and held it to Luffy's neck so that his neck was between two of the blades. She will continue drawing her sea charts for my own ambitions. And once her charts give me full knowledge of all the world's oceans, we fishmen will be totally invincible, and the world shall kneel before us. Luffy still just sat there, holding the pen before he finally sighed. The first step is, this island, then we'll move on to the whole East Blue, Arlong continued to rant. You can never use her like me. She would be wasted on you. Luffy, who had just put the pen carefully on the floor in front of him, almost reverently. Those words had struck a nerve and you could sense that there was something in him that was now filled with a great anger. It could even be felt in the air as Luffy very gently took hold of one of the blades on Arlong's shark saw. His head was down and his eyes were shadowed. Arlong kept smiling until it was wiped off his face. His arm was shaking slightly and he seemed to be completely confused to what was happening. Luffy's fingers tightened on the blade. He could see that he was shaking too, but from anger, not fear. Then, all of a sudden, Luffy broke the blade as easily as if it was made of glass. No, Arlong exclaimed in shock, so that he was left holding a blade with only 2 of the 6 blades left. Luffy's expression was terrifying and the fishman felt his own spirit freeze at the look. There was no trace of his usual happy-go-lucky attitude, not even the blank or usual angry look that he got when he was faced with an opponent. There was cold fury on his face. A sense of a hidden power radiated from inside him as if there was a wildfire burning inside him. Use her, Luffy repeated in a voice that was filled with as much rage as his face. You jerk, what the hell do you take her for? Arlong just laughed as he said, she is an inferior creature, but she has risen far above her peers. If all other humans are sewer rats, then she's a feisty little kitten. After all, she is adorable. She has her place and it's here beside me. Can't you understand that? I can give her everything she needs, Arlong finished with a wide grin on his face. And all she has to do is continue to draw those marvelous charts for me, Arlong went on, but what he said next raged Luffy to the core. So, Nami will forever be my tool. No, she'll be my friend, he laughed again. Finally, Luffy had gotten back to his feet, but instead of attacking Arlong he kicked the desk right through the wall. Arlong stopped laughing and his grin was wiped off as if Luffy had kicked him. He blinked before he stared at the giant hole where they could see the desk hover in the air for a moment before it fell. Before he could register what happened, Luffy had kicked a bookshelf and one of the stacks of maps out as well. What do you think you're doing? Arlong screamed, but Luffy completely ignored him as if he couldn't hear him as he continued his destruction of the room, making sure to take out as much as he could with every kick so that the sky was filled with paper. Stop it now, Arlong screamed as he then waved what was left of his weapon at him, but Luffy easily dodged it so that Arlong ended up destroying an enormous stack of maps and he screamed, horrified at what he had done, the charts. Once he landed, Luffy then kicked another stack out. My charts, Arlong continued to yell as he watched all his plans and ambitions being destroyed before his eyes, his anger now growing out of his control. He finally pinned Luffy against a wall and held him there with his hand at his throat. Curse you, Arlong yelled, that's 8 years of work, 8 years of planning and ambition. Luffy turned his arm into a long mantis-like scythe and used the extended blade to take out more of the room and they could hear the books and papers smashing to the ground or splashing in the water below them. Enraged, Arlong snapped even further as he bit down on Luffy's neck. Now you've gone too far, Arlong yelled as blood sprayed everywhere. Luffy was growling with pain, but he didn't back down as he changed his arms into that of a monkey so that he could use the extended reach to grab Arlong by his nose behind his head and started to pull on it. You keep jabbering on about how much better fishmen are, he said loudly, stuttering a little from pain, and how much you need those sea charts. I don't understand anything about that stuff. His monkey-like hands started to bleed as he cut them on the sharp nose, but I finally figured out how to save her. With one huge heave, Luffy snapped Arlong's nose like a twig, causing the fishman to scream in pain, and as he opened his mouth to yell, he pulled his teeth out of Luffy's neck. Luffy was still on his feet, his eyes wide, looking worse than ever before. This room isn't anything but her jail cell, he declared with a hiss. There's only one way for Nami to escape. I gotta tear this place apart. Arlong glared up at him, looking ridiculous with his bent nose as Luffy suddenly grew larger and larger while his nose lengthened and he grew tusks, becoming a human-elephant hybrid. With a mighty leap, the Chimera captain was able to jump to the point where he broke through the roof and hovered for a few seconds before he started to descend. Elephant, he began, but Arlong wasn't beaten yet. You fool, Arlong yelled and was getting up. Arlong Park cannot be brought down by some inferior human. Arlong continued as grabbed hold of his nose and straightened it with a sickening cracking sound, especially not by some animal freak like you, shark tooth, drill, Arlong screamed out before he jumped and began to spin like a propeller, or even a drill, towards Luffy's falling form, his teeth bared. Luffy's eyes widened in terror but he managed to finish the attack as he landed on the tower, cannonball. Arlong's teeth sank deeply into his side just as Luffy's heavy body came down and slammed his face to the floor. For a moment, they were there, frozen as they stared at what happened. It was almost as if time had stopped here, but then the floor began to break apart. with Luffy's trumpet-like scream echoed as the force of the attack was so great that Arlong started to cough up blood just before Luffy's body slammed him down floor after floor of Arlong Park and hit the ground with an almighty boom. As Luffy stood from where he landed, the rest of the building was starting to collapse. The walls crumbled and the roof was falling in. Luffy just didn't seem to get to the hole he made in the wall in time. The ceiling gave way and the floor broke apart as he fell through it. The noise was so loud, but then everything went dark around him as the night sky came back. But suddenly the top of the rubble was moved and Luffy burst through so that he was standing on top of the remains. He slowly shrank down back to his human form, showing that his thicker hide prevented a majority of the damage along with his natural resistance. No one spoke as they all stared at him. Though he didn't say a word, their eyes were all drawn to him as if he had shouted. Luffy then took a deep breath and yelled out, "Nami," he finished screaming out, "Nami, you'll always be my friend." It slowly dawned on all the crowd what just happened as they were all screaming in joy, all of them cheering and crying as well. Finally, their nightmare was over. And the cry that echoed through the village was Nami's happy tears while Johnny and Yosaku screamed out, "Big Bro won." Later, back in Kokoyashi village, after a small altercation with a group of marines, an enormous party going on. The villagers were all dancing and feasting, music and laughter was in the air, and every single person here was smiling. "You moron," the doctor snapped as Zoro was gritting his teeth and moving painfully around on the bed as Johnny and Yosaku slept in the background. Well, almost everyone was smiling. The doctor continued, "Did you think this would heal on its own? Seriously, pirates are supposed to be smarter than this?" Zoro tried to defend himself but the doctor shoved his hand in Zoro's face to keep him still as he continued stitching. "Don't you have a doctor for this?" Just then a familiar face appeared in the window above Zoro's head, with a leg of meat in his hand, and he repeated, "Doctor, never thought of that. Good idea." "Luffy," Zoro said in surprise, "but we need to get a musician first, right?" Luffy asked, as if making sure that he got it. "Why's that?" Zoro asked him. "'Cause pirates really like to sing," he said as if it was obvious. Zoro actually laughed at that and sounded sarcastic as he said, "That's true, but why is that first?" Luffy didn't answer, but he grinned at him before he looked up to the doctor and asked where Nami was, claiming that she wasn't in the village. "Well then," the doctor said, looking away as he thought it all over, "if she's not in the village, there's only one place she'd go." Later still, it was still a dark night around and the only thing that had changed was that Genzo was in the more quiet location. He was on a cliff that overlooked the ocean. A bright moon was reflected in the sparkling sea below them, and there was a very simple grave raised there with a wooden cross. Genzo had poured an entire bottle of sake over it, as if the one who was buried there could enjoy it as well. It was very peaceful for a few quiet moments, but that soon ended when someone yelled out, "Where's the food?" Genzo had jumped and spun around to see who it was. Luffy was barely aware that he wasn't alone as he looked for food. "Oh, no food out here," he said to himself, sounding disappointed before he turned around and muttered something about leaving. "Wait, boy," Genzo suddenly shouted, stopping Luffy so that he would look back and they looked over at him. "Huh, a grave?" Luffy asked before he asked tactlessly, "Did somebody die?" Genzo turned back to look at the wooden cross and admitted to Luffy that someone did die a long time ago. "Oh, I'm sorry," Luffy said, bowing his head, though it probably would have been easier to take him seriously if he took the food out of his mouth first. "I give you to my conveniences." Luffy realized that he said it wrong and tried again. "Wait, my sincere compliments, no my deepest," he said several times before Genzo corrected him. "My deepest condolences," he said. "Yeah, thanks," Luffy said. "Listen boy," Genzo said, still not looking away but his voice was very serious, "I know Nami is going away with you. She has her mind set on becoming a pirate and that, dangerous business. And I'm fine with that, it can't be helped. But if any of you do anything to hurt her, I will kill you," Genzo said, his voice deadly serious. "We're not gonna hurt her," Luffy said to him firmly. But Genzo spun around and yelled out at the top of his lungs, "You sure?" Luffy looked startled at that before he nodded, "I'm sure." Genzo moved his cap back down so that he couldn't see his eyes, but a satisfied smile was tugging at the scarred man's lips, as if he just had a hard question answered for him. Day of departure, the 4 straw hats were already on the deck of the Going Merry as they began piling on crates and boxes of food and supplies. It looked like the whole island had come to say goodbye. Suddenly, Sanji had run to the side of the ship. "There she is," he screamed out, barely able to contain himself. Looking up, they saw Nami standing far along the road and everyone was looking directly at her. Her eyes were hidden by bangs before she screamed out, "Set the sails." And suddenly she started sprinting towards them as if she was being chased by something. "I don't get it," Usopp said, watching her sprint towards them, "why is she running?" "She said set sail," Luffy reminded him and he jumped a little at the seriousness in his tone. "No," Genzo suddenly cried out as he Nejiko and the doctor all looked surprised at Nami. "She's planning on leaving without letting any of us thank her or say goodbye." "Set sail," Luffy yelled and they did as Zoro pulled up the anchor. Soon they were moving away from the dock. "Wait, don't go," someone screamed, "they're leaving." "Stop, at least let us say goodbye." Nami didn't respond to any of their words as she continued to sprint with the citizens trying to stop her. Genzo fought his way through to the front. "Nami," he yelled, "come back here. You can't leave this way." "So," Sanji said to Luffy, "you sure you won't let her leave like this?" "Not my decision," Luffy told him, "she does what she wants." They sailed farther and farther away, with Nami now in danger of being left behind, but they didn't need to worry. Nami started to run between them all zigzag, diagonal, up and down. She ran past all of them all, slipping away without any trouble, thanks to her years of stealing. Once she passed the doctor and her sister she jumped, almost flying through the air, just barely made it to the ship. "Why?" Genzo cried out as she landed on the Mary's deck. Breathing hard, she didn't move for a moment before she pulled back her shirt to show dozens of wallets and coin purses falling out. At that they all checked their pockets and realized that she stole from each of them. Nami was pulling out some of the money. She kissed it before looking back with a smug smirk, "Thanks a bunch." The looks on each of their faces was priceless. "Why you little brat," Genzo shouted as their jaws all dropped. Usopp whispered to Zoro darkly, "Great, she hasn't changed a bit." "I'd watch my back if I were you," Zoro agreed, giving Nami a shady look, but Luffy was laughing as Sanji gave her a thumbs up. You lousy pickpockt, Genzo cried out, we'll miss you. But then Genzo suddenly yelled at Luffy and got their attention. Boy, Luffy looked back up, as he finished by yelling, remember what I told you. Luffy just smirked and gave him the thumbs up, you got it. Nami began to scream out, waving goodbye, goodbye everybody, I'll miss you, take care. She then turned to the rest of the crew and said, now that that's over with, I say it's about time we head off to the Grand Line. Everyone cheered and started to laugh together, glad that was finally over. It was another beautiful day later and the whole crew was relaxing on the Mary's deck. Nami was stretching out on a lawn chair as Usopp sat there, mixing together some of his infamous Tabasco stars. Zoro was on the upper deck and taking a nap, and after looking around for a minute, they spotted Luffy cautiously reaching for some tangerines that had been put on the top of the cabin. Sanji came out of nowhere and kicked him so hard that he was flung backwards right into Usopp, who had some of it get splashed into his eyes. Luffy, however, was glaring up at Sanji and yelled, "Ah, come on, I just want one of them." "No," Sanji yelled, standing there in front of the trees like a bodyguard, his arms folded. "This is Nami's tangerine orchard. I won't let anyone lay a finger on it." He then turned to Nami with his eyes as hearts and cried out, his arms now wide, "Nami, can you see how well I'm protecting your trees?" "Yes," she said, without turning to look at him, "you're doing very well." Soon, Nami was still going over the paper as Luffy sat up on the railing, looking hungrily up at the fruit as Usopp lay on his back with a cool cloth to his red eyes. "I only want one tangerine," Luffy whined. "Just give it here, you're so mean." He stuck his tongue at him. "No," Sanji yelled again. "Oh well," Luffy said, beaming widely, "I'm pretty happy anyway." "The world sure is a turbulent place," Nami suddenly stated, telling them what she was reading. She flipped the page and a straight piece of paper fell out. "What's that?" Luffy asked just as it fluttered to the deck and they saw what it was. Everyone gasped at what they saw and soon they were all screaming. Some of them were joyous or horrified. Luffy jumped up and picked it up to stare at it. His eyes were as big as dinner plates as he stared at it and held it up for them all to see, laughing out proudly. "Alright guys, we're wanted criminals." Usopp leaned over to look at it. "Wanted, dead or alive, 30 million. That's a whole lot of berries," Luffy cried out, still laughing. "Check it out," Usopp cried out, pointing at it as a dreamy look came over his face. "I'll be seen all around the world." "What?" Sanji screamed out, staring at it. "They put long nose in but left me out." He was then looking all over the poster, now demanding to know where he was because he couldn't see him. Usopp pointed in the lower corner where the back of his head was and began to laugh as Sanji sat on the deck to pout. "It's the back of your head, that's not so great." Usopp giggled and said, "Ah, don't be so glum, you don't have to be a captain to get your picture on one of these things." Sanji cheered up almost at once. "Is that true?" he asked excitedly. "Yeah," Usopp said, "just work really hard." The three male Straw Hats were all celebrating and dancing as Nami looked like she wanted to crack their heads together. "Let's go to the Grand Line, men," Luffy shouted out and the other two cheered along. "Yet again, you guys don't understand how grim our situation really is," Nami yelled at them before she slapped her hand to her head. "This means all of our lives will be in constant danger." Soon they were back on the Mary's deck, and the five of them were all on the upper deck with Nami poring over the map and find a way to the Grand Line. "We're getting closer," she informed them. "We've almost made it to the Grand Line and it looks like the only way through is here, Reverse Mountain." "There's not," Sanji suddenly said. "From what the geezer told me, that's the only place to enter." Usopp looked over at him. "Well, how come?" "'Cause it's really dangerous," he answered as if it was obvious, which soon led to the two arguing again. "See, the reason is," Nami began, but Luffy interrupted. "I got an idea. Why don't we sail right into it?" Nami looked deeply annoyed and snapped at him. "Are you really that clueless?" "My way sounds a lot more fun," he said brightly, smiling, "plus it'd be a whole lot better to dive right into it, right?" Nami put her hand to her head as if she had a headache and said, "Talking to you drives me completely insane." "First off," Luffy said, sounding more serious, "we have to stop by an island. We need to pick up some meat, need meat." Giving him an annoyed look, she pointed to a small island on the map and explained, "There's a famous city on this island, known as Louchtown." "Louchtown?" Luffy repeated mildly. "Why's it famous? They got delicious meat?" "You know," Sanji stated, "I'm surprised you love meat so much. I mean, you turn into most animals anyway. Shouldn't you be a vegetarian or something?" Luffy went wide-eyed before sticking his tongue out in a yuck face and declared, "No way, vegetables are gross." "I'm pretty sure I've heard of it before," Zoro said as he looked up at the sky, ignoring the captain and chef's developing argument on the values of vegetables. "It's the city of the beginning and the end." Luffy looked confused and Nami explained, "It's the town where the old king of the pirates, Gold Roger, was both born and killed." The Straw Hats were all looking at the make with new interest as Luffy asked in a hushed tone, "That's where the king of the pirates died?" She looked at him with a small smile. "Well, yeah, that's it," Luffy said seriously. "This was the man who had One Piece. Everything the world has to offer. I need to see where he was born and executed." Before long they were standing in a large town in what looked like the main square. Though it was wide open, it was filled with people. After agreeing to meet up later, the Straw Hats soon went their separate ways. Before long, someone in the crowd at the town square yelled that someone was up on the executions platform. When the other members of the crowd looked up, they could see a tall metal structure, several stories high, and starting to rust from the years of being exposed to the elements. Standing at the top, with his eyes shielded so that he could see everything, was Luffy. In the crowd someone screamed, "Hey, you up there!" Looking down, Luffy saw that a police officer, dressed in attire very similar to Genzo had been, was there with a loudspeaker. "Get down from there, immediately." "But why?" Luffy shouted back, like a child who had been told that he had to go to bed and didn't understand why he couldn't stay up later. "You are standing on an execution platform that belongs to the world government," the officer yelled. "Now, get down from there right now." "Fine, I'll come down," Luffy yelled down agreeably, "but first you have to say the magic word and smile too." I'm not playing, I will arrest you if you don't come down, the officer yelled, and he truly sounded annoyed. But before he could make good on his threat, someone came out from the crowd with a colossal iron mace over her shoulder before she hit the man so hard that he was out as soon as he hit the ground. She was a truly beautiful woman that was slim, well endowed, with dark green eyes before his brown, and full ruby red lips, but the most noticeable thing about her was her silky looking skin that looked so soft. Ahem, what was I saying? Oh yeah. The woman spoke. Now's not the time for such trifles, she said in a sweet voice that seemed strangely familiar. The woman was looking up to Luffy and cooed out, long time no see, Luffy. I've been looking for you. Apparently Luffy didn't recognize her as he looked down with a confused look on his face. When she noticed this, the woman sighed. Now that's just rude, she said. You mean to tell me that you, of all people, this face? Forgot? I'm pretty sure we haven't even met, Luffy said in confusion. Who are you? I'll never forget you. You were the first man who ever truly struck me, the woman said fondly, causing the other people around them to scowl up at Luffy, outraged that he had done something to this girl. What? I never hit you. Luffy yelled in incredulity, looking a little lost as to why everyone was glaring at him. When you struck me with your powerful fist, she answered, her hand over her stomach. It felt good. Luffy looked most uncomfortable at this and his eyes were darting around, as if hoping for a way to escape. Listen up boys, who is the most beautiful person on these seas? The woman suddenly asked the crowd. That would be you. Everyone in the crowd yelled as they got down on their knees and held their arms out to her. That's correct, the now highly familiar sounding woman said with a smirk, holding out her arm. I'm quite breathtaking, aren't I? There isn't a man alive that won't crumble before my beauty, but I prefer strong men, like you. Looking back to the platform she cooed out, I'm gonna make you all mine, Luffy, just wait. Luffy shouted out, now sounding completely sickened at the thought, gross, no way, just who the heck are you? You still haven't figured it out, she exclaimed in annoyance, losing her patience. Several officers came running to the square with their weapons and telling the woman to put her mace down and come with them. I'm placing you under arrest for assaulting a police captain, another officer yelled before he turned up to Luffy and shouted out, as for you up there, get off that platform. Hold on, who did you say you were arresting? The woman asked, as if she just wanted to make sure she heard right. We're arresting you, the officer stuttered, taken in by her beauty as she batted her eyelashes at him. Are you really going to arrest me? She asked sweetly, smiling as hearts now appeared in the officer's eyes, causing them to start saying that they couldn't arrest her because she's too beautiful. I don't give a crap, another yelled, though he was now looking close to proclaiming undying love as well, arrest her. But before they could act, a large cannonball came flying from behind them and it hit the fountain so that it ended up blowing it apart in large chunks when a large part of the fountain flew at the woman, but as it hit, it slid right off her as if it had been a giant bar of soap and went flying off near Luffy's direction but moved in time. Aw man, that's weird, Luffy exclaimed loudly as everyone stared at her. That little stunt was dangerous, you know, the woman asked, sounding just a little irritated as she turned her attention to a group of people who had come from the direction of the cannonball, each of them wearing a dark cloak to cover themselves. I'm flashily sorry, the one out front said softly, but that smooth skin of yours is unharmed of course, so there's no need to worry, fairest Alvida. Alvida, Luffy repeated to himself, as he finally made the connection, or maybe not, I don't see Alvida. Don't be so dense, you nimwit, the woman yelled angrily, I'm Alvida. WHI, the collective fans of One Piece screamed out upon reading this. You sure? Luffy asked, cause I don't think you're her. Alvida smiled. I guessed I really did change after eating the fruit called. She removed her heart cloak to fully reveal her new body to them all, and get the whole picture to how much she had changed. Smooth fruit. No attack can hurt my skin because it slides right off. Unfortunately, a lowly fruit could not improve on my already stunning good looks, Alvida sighed in disappointment as she touched her cheek. One big change you may have noticed was that I lost my freckles. Ah, sure, that must be it, Luffy whispered, though it was clear that he didn't believe a word he said as he continued to look around for a way to get away from her. After becoming a whole new person, Alvida went on. I decided to join forces with someone who shared my goal of finding you. She then finally gestured to the cloaked men. Here, the cloaked man laughed insanely as he and his crew threw off the cloaks, revealing to be Buggy the Clown and his whole circus was back. Now that I've flashily made my entrance, time for the real star of the show. He screamed out and pointed up at Luffy, Monkey D. Luffy, ever since the day you sent me flying, I've been obsessed with exacting my revenge on you. That alone led to me finally finding my crew. My travels are an epic saga. I went to hell, found friendship, I even lost parts of my body. I call this tale, Tiny Buggy's Great Adventure. The first thing that happened was, why the hell am I telling you a story? Luffy stared blankly at Buggy. Don't know, now, he folded his arms as he said, what was your name again? Buggy, Boogie, Baggy, aw, I know, he said proudly, it's Buffoon? Buffoon, Buggy screamed, enraged, you got a lot of nerve you bratty animal, and now Buggy the Clown is gonna make you pay for that. Hey, that's Buggy the Clown, one of the people yelled in fear, and at the mention of pirates, all the people there turned and began to try and run, wanting nothing more than to get away from the square as fast as they could. But the Buggy pirates seemed to be prepared for this as they each pulled out guns and swords, making sure that they wouldn't move. You people flashily stay where you are, Buggy proclaimed to them all. I want every single one of you to see exactly how scary I can be. Oh yeah, Luffy yelled proudly, having just remembered Buggy's real name, Buggy right? You mean you just now remembered it, Buggy screamed. Too late, with Luffy distracted, the man who fought Zoro on the unicycle, Kabaji, appeared behind him and slammed a large metal and wood board down on top of him to trap him so that he was pinned in the stalks that held his head and hands there. Hey, Luffy questioned in surprise looking around up at Kabaji, what gives? Long time no see, animal freak, Kabaji greeted with a scolding tone as he sat on the stalk and asked how Zoro was doing. Good shot, Kabaji, Buggy praised as he began to laugh and call out to everyone, to all of my followers, hundreds of billions of them around the world, we will now begin the most flashily public execution. You're trapped Monkey D. Luffy, you can't move so much as an inch. Luffy attempted to pull his head out of the board, but he couldn't pull his head out of the hole, and it wasn't easy for him to do so while he was being held like this. He honestly couldn't move at all. Suddenly he felt weaker for some reason and could no longer feel like he could transform into one of his animal forms to escape. 2. Tell me, Straw Hat, Buggy yelled up at him as he laughed. Feel honored? You'll die in the same place as the king of the pirates? Again, despite his weakness, Luffy was trying to move as a wind began to pick up and dark clouds were being blown over them so that the entire square was cast in shadows. And perhaps it was just the trace of electrical energy in the air that caused it, but there was also a strong sense that something big was going to happen here was building with each minute. Ignoring this, Buggy started speaking again like an announcer. Pirate Monkey D. Luffy of the Straw Hats, will be flashily executed for the crime of being stuck up and making me angry. Buggy yelled as he lifted his arms, suddenly standing beside the trapped Luffy. At his words, all the pirates around them were screaming in celebration, shooting off guns and jumping as if a great show was about to take place. Now live it up, flashily, Buggy shouted as his men all cheered at that. Luffy was looking down at them excitedly. Oh boy, I've never seen an execution. Well, you're about to kid, Buggy informed him with a dark chuckle in his voice. Luffy blinked at that and looked up as he slowly processed what he said. What? He screamed out in horror. Stop joking. It's no joke, Buggy screamed as Luffy was now trying to desperately pull himself free and call for help. I even got a little bit of sea stone just for you so you won't turn into something like a rat and escape. It wasn't easy, I'll tell you that. Now, he said as he turned away from the struggling Straw Hat. Alright, Buggy yelled to the crowd as Luffy continued to try to pull his head free. I hereby flashily begin the festivities of this public execution. Luffy finally stopped struggling and was now lying there with a pout on his face. I'm so sorry. Really I am, please spare my life, he said in a droning voice, and it sounded as if Nami forced him to apologize for breaking something instead of pleading for his life. It couldn't have been any clearer to them that he didn't mean a word to what he said. Why would I spare your life? Buggy bellowed in frustration. This is what happens when you go against us, Kabaji commented, moving back down to the ground so that he could watch with the others. Alvida sighed a little regretfully. I guess this is it for the man I had my eye on. Buggy held up a long sword and looked down at Luffy as he stated, You've got quite a big audience here today, Straw Hat. You want to say a few words before you die? Luffy continued to sit there with a grumpy look on his face, even as Buggy stepped on his head. Ah, cat got her tongue? Buggy asked, still taunting him. That's alright. Stay quiet or say a few words. It doesn't matter, you're still gonna die. Luffy lay there for a moment before he took a deep breath. Just as a great wind swept over them all, he bellowed out at the top of his lungs, so that the words seemed to echo all around them. Listen, I'm the man who will be king of the pirates. There was stunned silence all around them as the crowd stared at him in disbelief, yet at the same time it was as if they could feel a strange energy coming from him, as if confirming his words. Buggy, however, wasn't impressed as he grinned evilly. We're finally getting to the best part of the show, he asked him, looking truly pleased at what he was going to do. Bye-bye now. Luffy had tried to pull his head out one last time, but it was clear that he was trapped here. But then Zoro's voice echoed out behind them, Stop the execution. There they were, Zoro and Sanji had finally shown up and were now standing at the edge of the crowd as they watched on. Now, they both screamed out at Buggy, clearly warning him that they weren't playing around here. Zoro, Sanji, Luffy yelled in relief. Luffy, you idiot, Zoro teased, his hand resting on the two new swords hanging at his hip. Guess all that fooling around finally caught up with ya, huh? You starting a sideshow? Sanji added, looking around at the Buggy pirates. Or is that how you look? Pretty sad, he continued as he smoked. Now, all we gotta do is drive these goons away. The citizens all screamed Zoro's name in terror and fled. Thankfully the Buggy pirates turned their full attention away from them and onto the two men. Hey guys, Luffy screamed again happily. You made it here, Zoro, Buggy yelled cockily. But you're just a little bit too late. He raised his sword over his head, ready to cut Luffy's head off, and that got their attention as they rushed in to try and take down the platform before that sword fell. Of course, that was difficult to do since the pirates were now standing in their way, with Alvida now taking control and telling them what to do. Though the two members of the monster trio were easily able to plow through these weaklings, they were outnumbered and it was taking too long already. Buggy laughed victoriously as he held his sword high as the sky continued to darken overhead. The storm was almost here. Not even the great Zoro can stop me now. There's nothing you two can do. This is the end of your captain. Luffy's expression became terrified as he stared up at the blade as Buggy continued to laugh insanely. Zoro and Sanji were now fighting tooth and nail to reach the platform in time. They were quickly becoming more frantic and scared as they tried to force their way through. Creep! Sanji screamed at Buggy as the thunder roared around them. As the Straw Hats all watched the two fight to get closer, Luffy's voice from above them sounded out. Zoro, Sanji, Usopp, Nami. They looked up to see Luffy looking up. Everyone in the square was now staring up as the fear completely left Luffy's face. Instead, he was smiling. Each of the Straw Hats felt as if they had frozen in place as they stared at him. It wasn't a forced or painful smile, but serene, as if he was truly happy. This lingering smile, Luffy truly believed he was going to die here, but he wasn't upset about it. Sorry, Luffy went on, and he truly did sound like he meant it this time, but this time he was apologizing to his crew, not Buggy. But, I'm dead, he informed them all. And he kept smiling even as Buggy brought his sword down on his neck. Idiot, Zoro as he stared up in horror. Don't say that, Sanji yelled, now desperately kicking 5 or 6 pirates out of his way to get to them. But as the blade fell, it sparkled with electricity from the air, and with a great explosion from above them a single bolt of lightning came crashing from the dark clouds and struck the tower. The entire tower burst into blue flames and the skies opened up to the rain. In a matter of seconds, it was pouring, but the platform continued to burn, slowly bending and twisting around as it broke and landed with a crash sideways. The sound of when it hit the ground echoed throughout the square. No one said a word, on one even moved as they watched. They were all staring with their mouths open in shock at the twisted heap of metal and burnt wood. Just at that moment, Luffy had pulled himself out of the debris, his head still on and his body looking only slightly singed and dirty. Buggy wasn't so lucky, taking the brunt of the blast. He was lying on the ground and was badly burnt and out cold. 3. Like a puppy finding its owner, Luffy's straw hat dropped at his feet and Luffy picked it up to put it back on. As soon as he did he started to laugh, a laugh that cut through the silence. Hey, I'm still alive, that's nice. The people in the crowd hadn't recovered as quickly as they had and were all staring in stunned disbelief at what they just saw. Sanji's own mouth was open so that his cigarette fell out, but Zoro's face didn't react at all, but there was a strange contemplation expression there as he looked at Luffy coming towards them, talking about how lucky an escape that was. That was divine intervention, Sanji suddenly declared. Stop talking nonsense, Zoro said at once, the first one to really recover. Though still shaken up by what just happened, he grasped the seriousness of the situation as he said loudly, looking around them, we gotta get out of this town. Our troubles are not over. It looked like he was right, because at that moment, a small army of Marines came charging out from all sides. It was clear that they had the entire place surrounded from the moment that the pirates began fighting each other and were now trying to round them all up. Luffy was looking ready for a fight but Zoro grabbed him and reminded him that they had to run now. That if they didn't get back to the Mary now, they weren't going to leave at all. So, with everyone's attentions on each other, the three turned and went running down the street in the direction of the docks. As they ran through the empty streets, the rain was now coming down harder than ever before. Zoro yelled in frustration, what the hell is up with all this rain? Nami was right about this storm, Sanji said loudly, trying to shield his eyes from the water with his arm so that he could see where they were going. If we don't get back to the ship and set sail soon, then we'll be stuck here for good. On they ran, even when the Marines were right behind them, they kept going, not bothering to stop and fight. With every step they seemed to take however, the rain seemed to become thicker and fall harder so that it was getting hard to see anything in front of them. But eventually, they spotted someone standing in their way, a young woman with short navy blue hair and a sword in her hands. I didn't know you were Zoro, and a pirate as well. You lied, the woman said, her head down. But then she looked up and glared at Zoro and said loudly, you're just another liar. Zoro told her irritably, you never asked what my name was, did you? So I never lied, did I? The woman got angry at him and declared that she wasn't going to let him leave town with his sword. In the end, Zoro decided to stay behind and fight. The woman, Tashigi, charged ahead in anger and pulled out her blade, but Zoro was more than able to hold her back. His eyes held a thoughtful expression as Sanji yelled that he shouldn't fight a girl. That got Tashigi even angrier than before and told him off for that, as Zoro told them to go on ahead. Luffy nodded, deciding to leave it all to him as he and Sanji left, with Sanji threatening to kick his ass if he hurt her. As Luffy and Sanji ran through the raging storm that suddenly appeared in Logatown, Luffy met up with another Marine. This particular Marine's name was Smoker and he was the leading officer in Logatown. He was around Zoro's height with short white hair and wore a white marine jacket that looked like it was made to look like a biker's. He had a large metal jute strapped to his back and, most curiously, had 2 cigars in his mouth with more strap along his body. Luffy and Smoker weren't waiting around as they began to fight, but here, no matter what Luffy threw at him, none of his attacks did any good. Any attack launched at the Marine passed through him as his body turned to smoke, showing the Marine to be a devil fruit user. Luffy jumped around on cricket legs and tried multiple rapid fire kicks on Smoker, however his attacks just ended up going right through him like smoke. The Marine then flew a smoky fist that caught Luffy in the face during one of his failed attacks, sending the young pirate crashing to the ground. What's wrong? Smoker challenged, had enough already. Luffy slowly go back up and tried to attack, but nothing he did worked. This is bad, he thought frantically. I can't think of any animal that can hurt Smoke. 4. Smoker trapped Luffy in a cloud of smoke and slammed him to the ground, his face in the concrete and his hand on his head. I told you, Smoker yelled at him, you gotta go through me to get to the Grand Line, you're not worth 30 million berries, huh, your luck's run out. But as Smoker reached for his weapon, someone stepped out of the shadows and took hold of it to prevent him from moving. The man's face was a mystery, not only was the rain obstructing their view, but the man was wearing a long, dark green cloak that hid him completely from their view. I wouldn't be so sure about that, the man said in a hoarse voice. Though his tone carried no trace of a threat, they could tell that he meant business, there was something in that voice that seemed to demand attention despite speaking so softly. It's you, Smoker snarled almost exactly as Robin spoke. Hey, what's going on? Demanded Luffy with a muffled voice, hard for him to speak with his face to the ground. Who's that? The most wanted man in the world, Dragon the Revolutionary. How nice, Smoker said to him, now the government can have your head. Dragon didn't speak for a moment, but then he went on in that same hoarse voice, the world is still waiting for our answer. Just then the whole area was surrounded with an eerie green light and a great wind came rushing out of nowhere, a wind that was so strong that it was as if they were in the middle of a maelstrom. Luffy screamed as he was sent flying back, falling backwards onto soft grass. After recovering, Luffy was soon standing on the Going Merry, but it was still raining hard and the storm raged around him. Fierce gales and heavy rains and battered the ship something awful as Nami was shouting out instructions as they just left Logatown. Feels like she's gonna capsize, Luffy yelled from the front, but instead of worried, he sounded excited at the thought that they might end up drowning. Hey look, a light, Nami suddenly screamed out and they looked up to see a bright light burning in the distance, point the way through the storm. Is that a lighthouse? Usopp screamed over the noise of the storm as he hung on to the mast to keep himself from slipping. The Grand Line is just out ahead, Luffy repeated in awe, his eyes bright as he grinned at the lighthouse. Nami smiled just as brightly as she looked to him, and she was as excited as he was here. Zoro smirked and Sanji grinned wildly, giving them a thumbs up. Luffy and Nami were grinning at each other as Luffy held onto his hat to keep it from being blown off. Sanji then yelled out, okay then, I think we should say something to mark the occasion. Good idea, Usopp exclaimed, finally able to pull himself off the mast at the suggestion as Luffy yelled in agreement to that idea. Sanji rolled out a large barrel on the upper deck and the 5 crewmates stepped around it. Each one had an excited gleam in their eye, because they all knew that this was the first time of them fulfilling their dreams. They smiled at the barrel, as if each one was thinking the same thing as the others. Sanji stepped up first and put his foot on the top of the barrel. I'm going to the Grand Line to find all blue. Following suit, Luffy also put his foot up and proclaimed that he was going to become the king of the pirates. One by one, they all put a foot up and told each other their dreams. The reason they set out to sea with each other in the first place was for these reasons. Zoro and Nami both proclaimed their reasons for being here and looked to Usopp, who stood there thinking, as if he didn't know what to say, but then he quickly put his foot up and said, I guess I'm going to be a brave warrior of the sea. Though the five of them held their feet there for only a few seconds, it felt so much longer. They looked at the barrel that held their goals and hopes, each one smiling through the rain. At this moment, there was no fear or hesitation in any of them. There was no turning back for them even if they wanted to. They all knew what they wanted, and it was here that they decided that they were going to go to the ends of the world if that's what it took to get it, and no matter what happened, they were going to do it together. And now, Luffy yelled as they all raised their legs high, and brought them down to smash the barrel, to the Grand Line. Yeah, the Straw Hats shouted, with the little boat continuing on through the rough storm following the light. 1. I thought this be funny to add, showing Luffy's line of reasoning for why he's not a vegetarian like Beast Boy. Not quite sure what Luffy's actual opinion on vegetables is, but due to his childish behavior and his obsession with meat, I'd assume this is spot on. 2. This is the only way that I could think of for Buggy to successfully capture Luffy. I imagine that with all the sea stone the Marines use to capture pirates, chances are there is some black market stuff that Buggy could get a hold of just for capturing Luffy. 3. Buggy acted as a lightning rod and cannon, and with Luffy's durability I'd imagine he'd survive with or without rubber powers. He did get a bit more damage than in cannon, but not enough to be noticeable. 4. I myself can't think of any animal, real or otherwise, that can hurt Smoke, but I plan on researching this so that by the next time Luffy and Smoker fight, it'll be much more interesting. This will be because Luffy himself will be trying to find any animal that can fight Smoke. Also, he couldn't use his other forms that might have worked because, in his hurry, Luffy couldn't come up with a strategy in time. While smart while fighting, that doesn't mean Luffy can come up with an answer for everything. After all, it took him 3 tries before he could take down Crocodile in cannon. Chapter 11. The Straw Hats all enjoyed the breakneck ride down Reverse Mountain, the wind blowing past them as they continued to pick up speed as they went. The water sprayed everywhere, creating more mist. The entire crew was shouting in joy, obviously loving every minute of it. Downwards they sped, almost as if they were on a waterslide, breaking through the clouds so that they couldn't see anything but the white fog in front of them. All 5 were laughing, sounding as if they didn't have a care in the world, but then Zoro was shouting out, "Did you just hear something?" "Huh, what's that?" Nami yelled over at him as the Straw Hats stopped laughing long enough to hear them. "That groaning sound," Zoro shouted out, "didn't you hear it?" It was probably just the wind. She dismissed at him as they started to go even faster. At this speed, everything sounds distorted. But then they heard it, a distant wailing that sounded like a foghorn had come through the clouds. Usopp began to look through his goggles to try and find that answer as well. "Nami," screamed Sanji from the mast, "I see a mountain up ahead." "What? That's impossible," Nami yelled up at him in panic. "But it's right there," Sanji screamed back as he pointed in front of them, "I can see it." "Who cares?" Luffy yelled from the Mary's head, and it was obvious that he couldn't have cared less to what might happen. "Go." Nami began to scream that they should be home free after they passed the Twin Capes, but then that groaning wail sounded off once again, louder than ever so that no one could deny that they didn't hear it. Luffy was now trying to squint his eyes through the thick fog, trying to make something out. Just then, they broke through the white sheet and all that could be seen was a vast navy blue, almost black, which caused the 5 Straw Hats to scream in shock. "It's a black wall," Luffy screamed in fear. "No, it's not," Nami shouted in horror as she grabbed hold of the railing, tears in her eyes. "Then what is it?" Zoro yelled before she could finish. "It's a whale," Usopp screamed. To say that this whale was enormous would be the understatement of the century. In front of them was a magnificent creature that was so large, it looked like it could swallow an entire island in one gulp. The whale's massive mouth opened a little so that they could see the row of sharp teeth, and a single tooth about the size of a Mary, if not bigger, and his great head was also covered in dozens of scars, both old and new. But unaware of what was going on around him, the whale wailed out once again, the loudest one yet, that made the entire mountain shake. They all covered their ears, the noise piercing their brains and their eardrums felt as if they were about to burst. The Straw Hats, however, were all screaming in a panic. What are we gonna do?" Usopp screamed out, looking ready to faint as he stared at them all, desperate that one of them had a plan here. "Should we fight?" Luffy suggested quickly. "Idiot, how are we supposed to fight a 100-ton whale?" Nami demanded hysterically. "Well, do something," Usopp screamed at them both. "Our path is blocked, how do we escape?" "Calm down," Sanji yelled, though he too sounded close to losing his mind in blind fear. "If this creature looks like a giant wall to us, we must be a speck." Zoro yelled out that it wouldn't matter if they were small to him because they were going to crash right into him unless they changed course. "Look," he then shouted, pointing to the Titan's side where there was an opening, "we can get by on the left. Port, hard to port." "The rudder's broken," Usopp reminded him loudly. "Do something for Pete's sake," Zoro yelled, and it was strange to see him lose control of his calm like this. "Anything." "Wait, I know," Luffy yelled as he jumped off the figurehead and headed straight down to the hull. "This'll work, it has to." Nami yelled after him what he was up to, but he didn't stick around to answer as he disappeared through the front of the ship. The other 3 men went and tried to pull what was left of the rudder to the left. "This is pointless," Usopp yelled as the other 2 cursed, "the ship's not gonna turn." Just as they had almost reached Laboon, below deck there was an enormous blast which could only mean one thing. "The cannon," they screamed. The impact of the blast shot the ship back slightly and blew up in front of them once it hit the whale. The cannon had stopped them from crashing right into the whale and being destroyed, but it wasn't enough to stop them completely. The ship had slowed down considerably, but when it bumped into the whale, it ended up breaking off the Mary's figurehead. The sheep's head broke with a loud crack and went flying overhead so that when it hit the deck they could hear Luffy's scream of horror. "Hey, that was my special seat." Once everyone had caught their breath and let sink in what happened, they broke out the paddles and were now trying to slip past the whale without him noticing anything. Zoro, Usopp, and Sanji were all yelling at each other about what just happened. "Alright, let's get out of here before it's too late," Zoro began. Someone mind telling me what the heck is going on? Usopp shouted back, looking ready to cry. It's so big that the cannonball didn't even make it flinch, Sanji cried as they were working hard to paddle, that, or his reaction time is really slow. Who cares? Zoro yelled at him, at least we're alive. Once again, the gigantic whale howled out, feeling as if his voice was a shockwave. The Straw Hats were all trying to block out the sound and only focused on paddling right past him. They kept rowing until they were passing right underneath the whale's eye, which was easily more than 4 times bigger than the little ship, when Luffy came back up to the deck, looking furious. Luffy, Nami whispered, wondering just what it was that he was going to do now. You think you can break my special seed and get away with it? Luffy yelled as he balled his fist. Leaping off the ship, the wings of a hawk sprang from Luffy's back as he flew full force right into the whale's eye. Take this. You moron, all the straw yelled. Each one of them had tears of fear in their eyes. For a second, time seemed to freeze, for nothing could be heard but the sounds of waves hitting the ship, but then the massive eyes suddenly looked down at them and they screamed in terror. It sees us, they yelled, and looked ready to start paddling like crazy away from there. Luffy, naturally, stood his ground as he used his wings to hover in between the whale and his ship. I'm not through with you. There's a lot more where that came from. However, before their idiotic captain could escalate the situation even more, Nami threw a lasso from the ship's rigging that snagged the childish captain around his neck. With a yank, the noose dragged Luffy to the Merry where Zoro and Usopp proceeded to kick him in the head, yelling at him that he could get them all killed. The massive aquatic mammal groaned angrily before he slowly opened his massive mouth, revealing the large teeth once again. Please, no, Nami croaked out, now crying hard, but the rushing water going into the gaping mouth was like a current and their little ship didn't stand a chance as it was quickly pulled in. It acted as a black hole, they were pulled right into the whale's mouth and there wasn't anything they could do but hold on tight and hope for the best. But as they were swept away into the mouth, Luffy was knocked overboard, screaming the whole way as his crew called after him earnestly. Luffy almost hit the water, but had enough sense to regrow his wings and grab onto one of the iceberg-sized teeth and hung on tightly, lest the powerful winds brought up by the behemoth's breathing suck him in as well. I am not gonna die here, Luffy growled as he held on for dear life. Through the wind he struggled to climb his way up. After a few moments, the whale closed his mouth, eating the going merry hole, the ship spinning as if it was going down the drain. However, it was almost anticlimactic when it was over. Just then, Luffy had been able to climb up to the head, breathing heavily as if he had run for hours. As he attempted to catch his breath, he had anger and fear on his face as he looked around, wondering what to do. Aw man, Luffy stated, barely controlling his panic. Everyone was swallowed whole. Hey, he screamed as he started punching the rubbery skin under him, yelling that he spit them all at once. With each hit, Luffy shifted between some of his heavy hitter forms such as a grizzly bear, an elephant man, and a tiger hybrid. Seemingly ignoring the, for all intent and purpose, zoo hitting its hide, the whale stared to submerge. Where do you think you're going, you jerk? Luffy demanded, sounding more and more angry with each second. Listen, you big whale, I'm not gonna ask again. Stop sinking. I mean it, my friends and me are on an important adventure. I can't lose them. Luffy seemed to be going nuts as he took his chimera form and roared out, give them BACCCCCCCK. Meanwhile, the whale was continuing to go down and it would only be a matter of seconds before Luffy would sink along with it. The water was rising up quickly and as he stared around looking for where he should swim off to and thinking of any form that could do any damage to the whale, Luffy noticed something embedded in the whale's head. Luffy noticed it looked like a hatch for a submarine and, without thinking, he ran over to it and opened it so that he could jump in. He managed to close the door just as the entire area was submerged into the water. While he could have turned into any number of sea creatures, Luffy didn't want to lose track of the whale and by extension his crew. Despite the whale's size, Luffy didn't want to risk it. I might not know what kind of whale this is, Luffy said to himself after he got a good look around and found himself to be standing in an iron hallway with light hanging every few feet, but I'm pretty sure most animals don't have doors and lighted hallways in them. What kind of whale is this? The Chimera boy started to walk down the hallway, but then something else happened. The room seemed to tilt and Luffy was knocked off his feet so that he went tumbling down. Luffy was bouncing around like a rubber ball down the hallway until he ended up in a large tunnel with metal walkways on either side of a river. He was going so fast that he couldn't even concentrate properly to get into a form that would prevent his fast descent. Luffy bounced around violently and landing with a painful thudding sound on the walkway. Gasping for breath, Luffy raised his head and stared around. Hey, that's weird, the whale's got a river inside it too. He gasped as the room began to shake again and was tilted up one way. Luffy tried to hold on so that he wouldn't go sliding down again, but it was too steep for him. He slipped and fell. Despite all the constant rocking back and forth, after a few minutes, Luffy had been able to straighten up enough so that he was now running down the hall, looking like he wanted nothing more than to get out of this place. He was waving his arms around in panic, trying to stop himself, but before he could, he looked up in time to see 2 people standing in front of a large, metal door. The 2 were a strange-looking duo. There was a middle-aged man with a large crown on the top of his long hair and the numbers 9 written on each of his cheeks. The second was a young woman with long, wavy blue hair tied in a tight ponytail and a bit of a stuck-up expression. The duo didn't seem pleased to see Luffy. They looked scared stiff at seeing someone come running at them, screaming at the top of his lungs, before he slammed right into them with such force that the doors were forced open and they were flying through the air. It was a bit of a shock to find that they were back under a blue sky and clouds, along with a small island, complete with a coconut tree and shack with the Merry right alongside it. Luffy, Zoro's voice came from the ship, and he saw the 4 of them standing on deck as they watched Luffy and the other 2 go flying by. Zoro, is everyone okay? Luffy yelled in relief before he realized that there wasn't much to stand on and he was falling fast. So I can use a hand. He yelled before the 3 of them hit the digestive juice. Later, the crew had just fished Luffy and the other 2 out and were all on deck, and the constant shaking had stopped and there was a deep, almost humming sound that they could hear echoing off whales, whose name turned out to be Laboon, stomach walls. I don't claim to speak whale, Nami said, going to the railing and looking around, but it seems to have calmed down a bit. Seems that way, Zoro said, looking at woman and the man. Now, we saved your lives for the time being, he told them irritably, you better talk and make it quick. Sanji was right up next to woman and was almost drooling when he saw her. She looked at him with a mixture of apprehension and repugnance as she moved closer to her partner. They then heard her whisper, "Mr. Nine, these heathens are pirates." Mr. Nine looked to her and they heard him whisper back, "Yes, that's painfully obvious, Miss Wednesday. But if we speak to their humanity and compassion, they should understand our plight, maybe." "You know, we can hear every word they're saying," Usopp said, all of them shaking their heads at this. "Well, I noticed that some people do tend to think that pirates are stupid," Nami proclaimed. And she admitted that when you met people like Luffy, Zoro, Sanji, and Usopp, she could understand why. "You parasites are still here," yelled an aged voice from above them, and they looked up to see an old man standing up on a small iron platform next to the enormous gate that they had come charging out of. He had a rather stocky and muscular body, with a bald patch on the top of his head, but with white hair with yellow flower petal-like things. The man, Crocus, declared loudly, "I grow weary of this, and for the last time, as long as I draw breath you will not lay a single harmful finger on Laboon." "He's back again," Usopp said as Luffy looked to them and asked who he was. Suddenly, the two weirdos were laughing. "You can't bully us into abandoning our mission, Miss," Wednesday said in a conceited voice as she picked up one of two bazookas that they had been carrying with them. "We were sent here to hunt this whale and that's exactly what we're gonna do," Mr. Nine yelled in agreement as he also picked up one, "and this time we won't let you interfere." They held up the guns as Luffy looked on. "We're about to give this whale a new blowhole, fire baby." As they launched the two cannonballs at the walls of Laboon's stomach, Crocus jumped right into the line of fire, protecting the whale from the weapons. Crocus, burnt and injured, fell into the pool of acid as the Straw Hats all gasped at what he had done. The woman let out an annoying laugh and proclaimed, "Your defiance is pointless." "Go ahead. Waste your time," Mr. Nine yelled, and Miss Wednesday continued to laugh, "but make no mistake, that hulking beast will provide food for our town." With Crocus now trying to stay afloat in the acid, the two continued to cackle and Luffy seemed to lose his patience. He slammed their heads so hard that he knocked them out. "Aw, what was that for?" Usopp asked him. "I just," Luffy said looking up in aggravation, "wanted to hit them." After they fished Crocus out and tied the two up, the old doctor invited them over to the island, which was actually a ship with an iron bottom so it could float here without worry of dissolving. "I thank you for saving my life," Crocus said gratefully once he made himself comfortable in a lawn chair, "though I must ask, why did you do it?" "I wasn't trying to save you," Luffy answered bluntly as he started to climb the tree. "There was just something about those two I didn't like." "Okay, I think it's about time we got some answers," Nami said in annoyance as Usopp tried to pull Luffy back down the tree. "Who are these guys?" she asked, pointing to Ms. Wednesday and Mr. Nine. "And how did you end up inside this whale?" "These two are thugs from a nearby town looking for whale meat," Crocus answered grumpily. "If they caught him, Laboon could feed the townspeople for at least 2 or 3 years easy. All they're concerned with is feeding their fat, greedy bellies." "Laboon," Nami repeated in confusion. "That's the whale's name," Crocus answered gruffly. "He a unique and magnificent creature. An island whale, a rare species that can only be found in the West Blue. I won't allow them to slaughter him for food." None of them noticed Luffy's ears perking up as he stored that tidbit of information away for later. "But if these whales are found only in the West Blue, how did we end up meeting them in the Grand Line?" Usopp asked in confusion. "You saw how big they were. I guess that even an entire West Blue Sea isn't big enough all the time," Sanji answered. "I mean, it's not that hard to think that such a large pod of whales don't visit the Grand Line from time to time. They're bigger than some sea kings and I'm sure they can take care of themselves. It's a shame he's stuck here so far from his domain," Crocus went on with sigh. "You see there's a reason he keeps hitting his head against the red line and hollering at Reverse Mountain." "There is?" Nami asked a little quietly. "Yes," Crocus answered looking at them. "To put it one way, inside Laboon's body beats the heart of a human. He has most impatiently awaited and is eternally devoted to a certain band of pirates." He paused and added, "Going on 50 long years now." All who have seen Laboon ask the same questions. Crocus went on. "Why does he continuously strike his body against the red line? Why does he keep howling at Reverse Mountain? Listen closely and I will reveal Laboon's tragic story." Crocus sighed and began. "One fine, sunny day, while I was fulfilling my duties as lighthouse keeper, some good-natured pirates came down from Reverse Mountain. They were followed by a baby whale, spry and chipper, who I would soon come to know as the one and only Laboon." And so he told them the whole story. How these pirates had met up with a baby whale while they had sailed the West Blue, and Laboon had traveled with them for most of their journey. But knowing how dangerous the Grand Line was, they had decided that it was in Laboon's best interest to leave him behind where he would be safe. But Laboon had followed after them anyway because he had come to see these pirates as his family. The damage that their ship had taken just getting to the Grand Line, however, was very extensive, so they decided to stay here for several months to sing with Laboon until repairs were made. After about 3 months, and their ship finally repaired, they had asked Crocus to take care of Laboon for them until they came back. They had promised that when they finished sailing around the world, they would come back for him and that the whale would then come with them on their future adventures. Crocus sighed and finished his tale by saying, "That was 50 long years ago." 50 years, Sanji repeated as they all stared at him. "So Laboon has been waiting here all this time for his friends to return?" Usopp whispered, his eyes wide and his jaw falling open at hearing that. "No wonder he's upset," Nami said, looking up at the whale with new sympathy. "That kind of wait would drive anyone crazy." They could hear Laboon's voice crying out once again as the Straw Hats climbed up on the ship and had Crocus lead them out through the door and through a long canal inside Laboon's body. "This is some canal," Zoro suddenly said. "Amazing this whale's still alive with a hole like this in its body." "I suppose you're responsible for this?" Sanji asked Crocus, as the little island boat went sailing alongside them. Crocus was reading the paper and didn't look up as he answered. "Just a doctor's playful mind," he stated causally, as if telling them what day it was. "Doctor?" Usopp repeated in surprise. "That's right," he answered, "legally certified. I also ran a clinic on the Grand Line once upon a time. Before that I served as a ship's doctor." "Really?" Luffy said eagerly, as he sat up on the Broke Mary's head. "That's great, then join us, we need a doctor." "Don't be ridiculous," he called back, stopping near a ladder and started to climb. "I no longer have that kind of energy. Exploring the seas is a young man's job." Sanji asked what kind of doctor would hollow out a whale's insides. Maybe it's part of the treatment, Nami suggested as Crocus reached the top of the ladder and stood on a platform. The girl is right, he answered, looking back at them. With a creature of this size it's virtually impossible to treat it from the outside. Therefore I devised a more drastic solution. Here's the exit, he added as he then turned the wheel and the large door opened up and they could see the sky, the real sky. Don't you think 50 years is a bit extreme? Usopp suddenly asked. Those pirates sure know how to test someone's patience. Idiot, don't you get it? This is the Grand Line, Sanji yelled at him as they moved the Mary's head onto the upper deck. His friends are dead. He blew out smoke from his cigarette and added, that whale can wait forever, they won't be back. Nami folded her arms and said, sad to say, but it's probably true. Back in the day when those guys traveled the Grand Line it was an uncharted sea. 1,000 times more treacherous than it is now. Usopp gave a grunt of anger and ran over to them, yelling, why are you all being so pessimistic? You don't know that they're dead. They could still come back for him. Come on, have some sympathy would y'all? I thought it was very touching. I mean a whale still believing a promise that his friends made to him despite all these years? That's a true bond, right Pops? Indeed, Crocus agreed, but he leaned his hand against the coconut tree and answered, but the lesson here is that reality is cruel. Laboon's cohorts aren't dead. The truth is that they abandoned their quest. And then told them that he learned that the pirates turned and left the Grand Line through the calm belt. He couldn't claim to know exactly what happened to them, but he doubted that they would ever return for him here. So if I got this straight, Sanji said, now sounding angry, these pirates were a bunch of cowards who cared more about saving their own asses than keeping a promise to a friend. Usopp's voice rang out in outrage. Why would anyone abandon such a loyal creature? Just look at him, it's cruelty on a grand scale. But if you've known all this, why haven't you told him? Nami asked Crocus. Laboon can obviously communicate with you. He seems to understand humans quite well for a whale. I did tell him, Crocus admitted, down to the last miserable detail. He sighed as he said, that was the day Laboon began to howl at Reverse Mountain. Soon after he started slamming his body against the red line. It's as if he believes the wall is what keeps his friends away, and that by breaking it, he can clear the path for their return. He refuses to believe me because then he'll have to admit that it's over, Crocus said grimly, and that though terrifies him more than anything, there's no way for him to go back to the West Blue, so what we have here is a paradox of tragic proportions. Laboon is a lost soul dying to live with his friends, but won't stop killing himself to reach them. Tragedy, Sanji stated, but still, despite all the grief those pirates put him through they did the same thing to you by saddling you with their burden. He pulled out his cigarette and asked what he was going to do, and added that he had done enough for Laboon. The scars on his hide are deep, Crocus answered simply, those in his heart are even deeper. He needs someone to tend his wounds and I'm all he's got. For years he's battered himself and I patch him up. A strange friendship but it works. Their attention was brought out of the story as, with a loud cry, Luffy flew high up into the air on eagle's wings. They all watched in shock as Luffy reached Laboon's head, and found a place that was already bleeding, most likely where he had slammed his head against the red line earlier. This was the opening that Luffy needed, and transformed his body into that of a swordfish. The pointed tip of the fish was propelled by gravity right into the wound, causing blood to gush everywhere. This time, Laboon felt the pain and his eyes watered up in pain as he let out a loud howl of agony. Luffy, having transformed his body back into human form, gripped onto the whale's front tightly. If one were to look closely, they would notice the octopus suction cups that had sprouted along his arms. Between thrashes, Luffy would unstick one of his arms and deliver a powerful punch to the open wound. Laboon was now angry as he jumped right out of the sea and slammed Luffy right into the red line with his body. The waves that the whale was creating almost ended up capsizing their ship, and with the size of the waves, there wasn't anything the Straw Hats could do but hold on for dear life. Luffy got right back up and was now grinning cockily at Laboon. The whale was now seriously ticked off and went to smash him with his tail, which did end up hitting him. Luffy then grew in size to that of an elephant and dug his tusks into the whale's side, but Laboon retaliated by slamming him into the lighthouse. This continued on until Laboon had actually managed to lift a part of his body onto land to try and go at him again, but then Luffy suddenly screamed out, it's a draw. Those words shocked Laboon so much that he stopped. Luffy looked up, dirty and bruised, but was smiling. I'm stronger than I look, but I had a feeling you knew that. Laboon just looked back, and even those who didn't understand whale could tell that he was completely lost here to what was going on. I can always tell when someone's itching for a fight, Luffy told him as he looked up. Well, if you want a battle I'll give you one. Your shipmates used to spare with you didn't they and you miss it? Well, I can rival anything they threw at ya. Tell you what, after me and my friends travel the Grand Line, we'll come back here and find you. Tears were forming in Laboon's giant eyes as Luffy finished, then you better be ready for a rematch. Tears were now falling from the whale's eyes. The anger and madness that had been there only seconds before seemed to fade as he let out another howl. But this time, it wasn't of sadness, it was the thrill of another fight. After a while later, after they had retrieved the mast off Laboon's head, Luffy had gotten some paint and had managed to do a very poorly drawn version of their Jolly Roger on the whale's head where the scars were. It looked just like Luffy's first attempt to draw their flag before, and it just looked so funny painted there that they all laughed a little at it. Hey, not bad, Luffy commented as he looked back to admire his work, also covered in paint. Consider this a symbol of my promise to come do battle with you. He told him, course, it's a rushed paint job, so you'll have to be careful and avoid hitting your head or you rub it off, understand? Laboon grunted in acknowledgement. Good whale, Luffy stated happily. Nami told Luffy to clean himself up as she tried to work out a plan for the Grand Line journey. Luffy looked annoyed, but did what she said. However, as he got back to the deck he spotted two things different here. First off, Ms. Wednesday and Mr. Nine were gone, and second, he spotted what looked to be a cross between a compass and an hourglass rolling around on the deck. What's this thing? Luffy said to himself as he picked it up, but then the crew heard Nami screaming and the noise startled Laboon so that he dove under the water. You mind? Luffy yelled back as Sanji and Usopp climbed up to talk with her, Sanji bearing plates of food, keep it down. You idiots, Nami's voice yelled, the compass is broken. Looking surprised, Luffy put the strange device into his pocket and they followed him up so that they were sitting at a small table outside the lighthouse with the other three already gathered around it. Nami was there with the map and her compass in front of her. The little needle was spinning round and round, never stopping. The needle just spins, it won't stop, she told them all. As they all talked amongst themselves about it, Crocus, who had been standing close by, turned to look at them. It is sadly apparent that none of you possess the slightest knowledge to how things work here, he said. Did you all come here to die? As they all looked to Crocus and he explained, with Sanji warning Luffy not to eat all the food, there is nothing wrong with your compass. The Grand Line has little regards for the rules of the sea. Common sense is useless in this place. The needle, Nami asked slowly, why does it spin? And so Crocus told them the reason why normal compasses don't work on the Grand Line was because of the nature of the island's magnetic fields. In order to navigate the Grand Line, a special compass called a log pose must be used. The log pose works by locking onto one island's magnetic field and then locking onto another island's magnetic field. Luffy pulled out the device, which happened to be a log pose, that he found earlier and Nami ended up punching him for not telling them about it. He argued back that he found it on deck and assumed that those two must have dropped it when they escaped as Nami took it from him. Crocus then finished up his explanation by telling them that there were a total of 7 different routes that diverged from Reverse Mountain and travel east before merging again to the last island, Raftel, an island that's existence was only confirmed by Roger himself. Raftel, Nami repeated softly. That's it, Usopp yelled excitedly, a big grin on his face. That must be where the One Piece is hidden. That's the most promising theory, Crocus said, but no one has been able to set foot on Raftel Island since then. Luffy, who was chewing on some of the bones of the meal, grinned, don't worry, we'll know soon enough. Crocus was looking at him with new surprise as Luffy finished the food and everyone began yelling at him for not leaving anything for them. Sanji, especially, was furious and beat him up for it, however ended up breaking the log pose in the process. Nami kicked both men into the sea, screaming that she was going to kill them if they didn't get out of her face. Fortunately, Crocus had one and he gave it to them as a thank you for helping Laboon. Laboon then came out of the water with both Sanji and Luffy, but also brought up Miss Wednesday and Mr. Nine. Since they lost their log pose, they needed a ride back. This brings us to Luffy sitting up on the table with Vivi and Mr. Nine on their knees. Whiskey Peak, repeated Luffy in puzzlement. Huh, that's a funny name. So what it is? Usopp asked. It's where we live, Mr. Nine snapped, before he added more respectfully, sir. As Nami asked them what happened to their ship, Vivi answered nervously that it was destroyed. Asking us for a ride is pushing it, Mr. Nine, Nami said slyly, especially after you tried to kill the whale. But when they tried to get some real answers out of them, the two refused to answer. Miss Wednesday and Mr. Nine were now begging, telling them that they couldn't tell them anything, because of their line of business. They told them that the only thing they wanted was to just get home. We have confidence in your character, can't you grant us the same courtesy? Miss Wednesday asked. Please, we're begging you, show some mercy, Mr. Nine added. Don't do it, Crocus advised them at once. These two fools are dishonest to the core, they can't be trusted. Nami held up the broken log pose still on her wrist and told them that they didn't have another one and asked if they still wanted to ride with them. The reaction was hilarious as they began yelling at her for trying to trick them, but Nami merely smiled devilishly and said in a fake innocent voice that fooled no one, oh, sorry, I forgot, Crocus gave us his so. And as soon as they heard that, they got back to their knees and began begging for pity again. Mr. Nine's face was twitching horribly, as if he was biting back what he really wanted to say, but to their surprise, Luffy said that it was alright for them to ride with them. Why? Usopp demanded, pointing an accusing finger at them. These two are obviously pretty shady characters, why would we take them anywhere? It's fine, Luffy repeated, don't sweat the small stuff, it'll be alright. Choose your route carefully, Crocus warned him seriously from behind him. Once you head out from here, you'll be committed to that course. It's okay, Luffy said happily. If we don't like it, we'll try a different route next time. Crocus smiled at Luffy's words, admiring the younger man's youthful spirit. Okay, it's time we get going, Luffy declared as he jumped to his feet and looked to the rest of his crew. Now that me and Laboon have an understanding, I can leave with a clear conscience. Just who in the world do you think you are anyway? Ms. Wednesday asked as Luffy stretched out his stiff body. What's that, me? Luffy asked looking back at her before he said confidently, well, I'm the man who'll be king of the pirates. Crocus smiled widely at that, as if remembering something from a long time ago, but Miss Wednesday and Mr. Nine covered their mouths as they fought back the laughs. With the sun setting, they all climbed on board the repaired ship with Crocus letting them know that their log should be pointing directly to Whiskey Peak, and they finished saying their goodbyes. Luffy looked to Laboon. I'm off, Laboon, he said, be ready to fight when I get back. Laboon gave a surprisingly soft, almost purring sound as the ship pulled away. Next stop, Luffy cried out, Whiskey Peak, ready gang, let's set sail. They all cheered as Laboon let out noises of farewell, the crew waving goodbye to him and Crocus. The crew and their passengers were surprised a few days later to find the Mary with a thick layer of snow on deck. Sanji was shoveling it all off, but each shovelful that he threw overboard was replaced quickly as the snow continued to fall. Luffy and Usopp meanwhile were fighting over snowmen when they heard Nami screaming in horror from inside the cabin. What's wrong? Usopp yelled as he and Luffy were stopped in the middle of their snowball fight. Sounds mad, Luffy said knowingly as Sanji declared that he would save Nami from whatever the problem was. Nami, dressed in a warm coat, came out of the cabin, staring at the log pose in horror. No way, Nami screamed before she cried out, make a hard turn 180 degrees, hurry. A 180, Usopp repeated, baffled as he dropped his handful of snow. Why would you want us to turn back? Did you forget something? Luffy asked curiously. The ship has turned around, we're sailing in the wrong direction, she yelled at them, still looking at the log pose. I only took my eyes off the log pose for a second, she looked up at the sky and said, I thought waves were calm. Just then, Miss Wednesday asked from inside the cabin in that same conceited way, you're not a very good navigator, are you? You can't trust anything here, not the wind, sky, waves, clouds, nothing is what it seems in the sea. The only way to get reliable direction on the Grand Line is with the log pose. Everyone knows that, Miss Wednesday finished with a satisfied smirk. But the woman had finally gone too far and Nami kicked her and her partner outside. Shut your condensating mouths and do something useful around here, she screamed as she took charge. Brace the yard, force the wind starboard, turn the ship 180 degrees to the left. Usopp man the lateen sails, Sanji take the helm. When they went running off she then barked orders at the two, work you two. This girl's crazy, Mr. Nine stated as they began pulling ropes. All except Zoro were working desperately, as he was sleeping against the side of the boat, covered in snow. Hey wait, looks like the wind changed. Usopp yelled, getting their attention, and he was right. It changed rapidly from freezing cold to a springtime gale. And that was how it went. The winds would constantly change, waves would become violent or calm when you least expect it. Once they almost hit an iceberg as a fog came pouring in. Although they had managed to turn just in time, the helm was damaged and Usopp went off to fix the leak. Dark clouds came pouring in and they were battling the fierce wind right after that as Sanji was forced to keep bringing food for them to keep their strength up. The winds were tearing the sails apart and water was filling the bottom of the ship. It was chaos. Thankfully, the horrible weather had finally calmed down enough that they could all rest on deck, trying to catch their breath. But true to form, Zoro had finally woken up and was telling them all that they shouldn't be so lazy just because the weather was nice. He didn't notice the evil eyes that Nami, Sanji, and Usopp were giving him as he finally noticed the two newcomers on deck. He went on to ask what they were doing there and Luffy explained the whole thing about taking them home. Grinning evilly, Zoro bent down to look at them. So tell me, what are your strange names again? 'Cause I don't think you two can be trusted. My name is Mr. Nine. Mr. Nine croaked out. I'm called Miss Wednesday, the woman added nervously, her eyes twitching a little fearfully.
Right, Zoro said skeptically, his thumb under his chin. You know those names sound familiar and that's what's bothering me. In fact, the more I think about the more I'm sure I've heard them somewhere before.
The two were looking terrified just as Nami hit Zoro over the head from behind and began to tell him that he was lucky that they didn't throw him overboard for sleeping when they did all the work. But as he glared back, looking ready to tell her off, she hit him 3 times over the head so that he was on the deck defeated, nursing his wounds. Nami stood up in front of them all and declared, listen up everyone, there's no way to know what's gonna happen next. During the terror that most of us just experienced, she shot Zoro another evil look before continuing. I came to an understanding why this sea was named the Grand Line. She held up her fist and finished. My navigation skills are useless here. Anything can happen, but mark my words, I will guide us through. She then pointed through the mist and yelled out, we're here, our first journey on the Grand Line comes to an end. And through the thick mist, they could see the outlines strange, cactus-shaped mountains with several buildings set up on either side of the river that they were traveling on. Luffy was crying out in joy at the idea of visiting another island. As he and the rest of the crew talked in excited voices, Miss Wednesday and Mr. Nine both jumped to the railing. They both said their thanks and goodbyes and chuckled darkly. Bye-bye baby, they finally finished speaking together before jumped overboard. That was a quick exit, Nami said. I guess we'll never learn what those nut jobs are up to, Usopp added darkly, looking over the edge to try and see where they went. Who cares? Luffy asked, turning back to the matter at hand, we're landing. The pirates had received a surprisingly warm welcome from the villagers. They even threw a giant party in the pirates' honor. This turned out to be a setup, however, as the town was actually a den of bounty hunters working for an organization called Baroque Works who hoped to capture the Straw Hats when they were out cold from the party. This didn't go according to plan for them though, as Zoro had only faked being drunk and was able to take on the small army of bounty hunters, easily tearing through their ranks. Soon, most of the buildings were mostly destroyed. There was rubble and broken boards cast every few feet along with giant shards of broken glass and the walls around them looked close to crumbling away. The damage, however, was not all caused by the fighting between Zoro and the Baroque Works. Luffy and Zoro, bloodlust in both their eyes, came bursting through a wall and were going at each other. Zoro's blades clashed against Luffy's arms, which had transformed into the bladed pincers of a prey mantis. As it turns out, the Chimera man had woken up later in the night and, seeing the beaten bounty hunters, thought that the swordsman was attacking their hosts for no reason. As a result, the captain wanted to fight him over it. So caught up in their fight that they didn't even notice the two figures who were pulling themselves out of some of the rubble. A man and woman. The woman had short blonde hair, was wearing a yellow dress with a lemon-like pattern and with 2 lemon earrings dangling from her ears. The man with her was a tall, dark-skinned man with black hair and short spiky dreadlocks. He also wore a brown trench coat with the number 5 printed on along with dark sunglasses. These two were Mr. 5 and his partner Miss Valentines, 2 of Baroque Works agents. Miss Wednesday was also there, riding a duck that size of a horse. She looked different from before. She looked a little beat up as well and her long hair was let down, but she was still staring at Zoro and Luffy with terror on her face. The first two were both beat up, covered in bruises and cuts all over their faces. Looking at them, they didn't have to think hard to what must have happened. The two went charging at the fighting crewmates, convinced that they could win. But they picked the wrong people to fight. You can't beat us, Mr. 5 yelled. Prepare to die at the hands of Baroque Works officer agents. Both Luffy and Zoro stopped their fight and glared murderously at the agents, stopping them all dead in their tracks. The two looked truly terrifying. Their faces were covered in bloody scratches, while their eyes were devoid of any sympathy or benevolence. There was nothing but cold rage that was so strong that they could all feel chills going up their spines. Luffy's were like looking into the eyes of a rabid lion while Zoro's held all the ferocity of a demon. Shut up and go away, they both yelled, raising their fists. You're interfering, and together they sent the two flying with such force that one might have felt sympathy for the two poor fools. With our fight, the two finished screaming out, a trace of evil flashing there. They were sent crashing into the side of the buildings until they were both out cold for good this time. Zoro grumbled to himself, stupid pests, messing with our fight. Luffy growled in agreement as Miss Wednesday was staring at them in amazement as they both went back to glaring at each other. Zoro glared at Luffy, now looking completely insane here. Shall we continue? He demanded. Yeah, Luffy snapped back, looking just as demented as Zoro at that moment. With a crack of his arms, they became the burly clawed arms of a black bear. But as the two moved in for another round, their muscles bulging and the energy they were releasing seemed to bend the air itself as they clashed like sparks between them. However, before these two powerhouses could collide, Nami appeared out of nowhere and punched them both so hard in the faces that they were sent flying, knocked right out of their frenzy mode. You two, what the heck do you think you're doing here? Nami yelled at them both as they lay there, looking stunned at what just hit them. It's lucky for you that you managed to keep the girls safe. You almost lost us a billion berries. She picked them both up by the scruffs of their necks, like how a babysitter would to two brothers who just didn't want to get along, and yelled, you understand? Miss Wednesday was staring at her, not understanding what she was talking about, as Luffy and Zoro were continuing to fight by pulling each other's faces and small punches like little kids. What do you mean? The other woman asked anxiously. What berries? I don't understand. Why did you save me?
As the two continued to fight where they hung in Nami's grasp, Nami smiled and said to her, about that, I think we need to have a little chat. You see, you and I have to work out a contract for a reward. She frowned at the two before she finally slammed them into the ground to stop them fighting for good. Knock it off, she screamed. Later, the trio and Miss Wednesday, or rather her real name Vivi, were all seated in an alleyway. Luffy was sitting up on a barrel and was laughing his head off. Oh, he said in new understanding, they were all bounty hunters. Why didn't you just say so, Zoro?
I did, like 12 times, Zoro yelled back furiously at him. What a funny mix-up. Luffy laughed before Nami snarled at them to shut up, which they did at once. Would you drop it? Zoro demanded as Nami turned to Vivi and offered to take her home for 1 billion berries.
Apparently, Vivi was a princess of the Kingdom of Alabasta who had been undercover at Baroque Works for 2 years with her bodyguard Agarum, codenamed Mr. 8. However, her cover had been blown and Mr. 5 and Miss Valentine had been sent to deal with her before they ran into the two monsters. Agarum had begged Nami, who like Zoro faked being unconscious, into helping the princess. Nami agreed, though she blackmailed the man into paying 1 billion berries to do so.
No, I can't, Vivi said sharply and Nami blinked in surprise, but I appreciate the help you've given me so far. Why not? Nami demanded at once. You're a princess, aren't you? So aren't you rich? Do you know much about Alabasta Kingdom? Vivi asked sadly, and so she went into details about her home and how they were now in the middle of a civil war. The people are revolting and the entire kingdom was on the verge of self-destructing, so she had decided to take matters into her own hands when she discovered that someone was now behind this war. So she and her companion Igaram infiltrated Baroque Works to find out who was behind it all for the last 2 years. You've got some guts considering you're a princess, Zoro said in an impressed tone. So, were you able to find out what their plan was? She nodded just as Nami answered, to create an ideal nation. Vivi looked up at her in surprise and she explained, anyway, that's what Igaram said it was. Is that what you found out? Vivi looked back down at her knees and admitted, it's not. That was only a cover story the boss was using. It's a lie to cover their tracks. Her eyes darkened and she finished. Their true goal is to take over Alabasta Kingdom. They all just looked at her as she said that she now had to get back home and warn everyone what was really happening before it was too late. She looked ready to cry and Nami sighed. Okay, I get it, she said in annoyance. I see how it is. Yeah, it's all starting to make sense now. I suppose you wouldn't have much money laying around during a civil war. Hey, Luffy said eagerly, so did you find out who's in charge? Vivi looked horrified at the suggestion. What? She screamed, causing everyone to become startled at her sudden change in tone. The boss's IDENITY? You shouldn't ask that. But you know, don't you? Luffy asked calmly. Ask me anything but that, she yelled, waving her hands around. If I tell you, your lives will be in danger too. Yeah, I'll pass, Nami added with a nervous laugh, clearly letting them know that she was happy not knowing. This guy is trying to take over an entire country after all. I wouldn't want someone like that chasing after me, thank you. No, you don't, Vivi said loudly. I don't care how strong you people are, you wouldn't stand a chance against one of the warlords of the sea, against Crocodile. Silence, who now? Luffy asked, and Vivi turned white as she realized what she said and covered her mouth when Nami's jaw fell open in horror. You had to say it, Zoro said darkly before they felt like they were being watched. They looked up and they saw a strange sight. There was an otter in a white one-piece cloth with purple polka dots and a vulture with a flowered swim cap, both with thick sunglasses. They all looked up at the duo for a moment before the otter jumped up on the vulture's back and they took off. It turns out the two animals were Mr. 13 and Miss Friday. They served as Crocodile's messengers and were also in charge of executing any Baroque Works agents that failed their missions. Nami then grabbed hold of Vivi's front and began to shake her as she screamed at her, with Vivi telling her how sorry she was. The men on the other hand were looking excited at the thought. Hey, a warlord? That's cool, Luffy yelled out, his eyes shining. Not too bad, Zoro agreed. Luffy began to laugh wildly as Nami continued to yell at Vivi before she began to cry. Being hunted by a warlord in the Grand Line? That's more than I can handle, she cried, covering her face. So when do we get to see this guy? Zoro asked conversationally. I wonder what he's like, Luffy added as Nami yelled out, shut up you. She then turned and began heading down the road. It's been nice knowing you idiots. Thanks for everything, she yelled at them. Where are you going? Luffy called after her. They don't know what I look like yet, she yelled back, I'm leaving. And no sooner had she said that did the otter show up with 3 very detailed drawings of Luffy, Zoro, and Nami. Nami clapped as she saw them. Wow, that's so lifelike, and that was when they took off, their silhouette against the bright moon. Nami turned back to them and yelled, no use in leaving now. I'm really sorry, Vivi said again quietly, but Luffy said that she'll get over it. Where's she planning on going anyway? Zoro asked, as a twisted grin appeared on his face. Well then, it looks like the 3 of us will be sitting right on top of Baroque Works' hit list. Luffy chuckled to himself, that's so awesome. Nami, however, was now sulking in a curled up ball on the ground with Vivi trying to think of something to say to cheer her up.
You have nothing to fear, someone suddenly yelled. The Straw Hats turned to see a fairly tall, muscular man standing there with 3 stuffed dummies and stared intensely at the group of pirates. Though it was clear he was a man, he was dressed in clothes similar to Vivi's, and with thick tube-like hair had been done up in a ponytail and even wearing lipstick. It's, the man, who turned out to be a garum, coughed. He started to hum scales before he went on to say, it's gonna be alright princess, I've come up with a plan. A garum, Vivi exclaimed, coming over to him. What are you?
That's a really funny outfit, old guy, Luffy said as he looked over the outfit. An entire parade of idiots, Nami whispered where she huddled. Igaram began to tell them his plan. Since Baroque Works had learned who Vivi really was, agents would be sent after her to try and kill her. So he came up with the plan to disguise himself as her and try to draw their attention to give them time to escape. So these things are us? Luffy asked as he poked one of the dummies.
A decoy, Zoro summed up for them. While Baroque Works is busy chasing after me, a garum finished up. The rest of you will head with Vivi straight for Alabasta Kingdom along a less direct route. Hold on, just a second, Nami screamed, finally getting back to her feet. Who said we were gonna take her with us? They looked to her and she finished, we still haven't discussed the matter of payment.
Payment for what? Luffy asked as he stared at Vivi. Take her where?
Where have you been, Luffy? Zoro asked impatiently as he stood up and jerked his thumb to a garum. The old man here wants us to take the princess back home to her kingdom.
Oh, is that what all this yelling is about? Luffy said, getting it, and Vivi looked to him in surprise as he finished by saying, sure thing. Nami completely lost her cool and screamed out, crocodile may already be after us. Is this crocodile guy really that dangerous? Luffy asked Igaram curiously. Igaram looked back and explained about how he was one of the 7 warlords, and because of that, there wasn't a bounty on his head. However, once upon a time, his bounty had once been over 80 million. 80 million? That's 4 times Arlong's bounty, Nami screamed out, there's no way. Sure, Luffy answered with a confident smile as memory Nami looked like she was about to burst into tears again. It sounds like it'll be fun.
We are forever grateful, Agaram said, and they could hear the gratitude in his voice as he led them to a small ship and put the dummies on board before he turned back and spoke in a much higher voice. Now then, I, Vivi, will leave from here. Luffy began to laugh. Great imitation, old guy. Imitation of who? Zoro asked, looking at Agaram like he thought that he was insane. But Agaram didn't pay any attention to them as he asked Vivi for the eternal pose and she handed it over, looking like she was doing this against her will.
They could all see the sadness in her eyes. The truth was that she didn't want this, but there wasn't anything she could do about it. What's an eternal pose? Nami suddenly asked and Igaram looked at her in surprise. You've never heard of it, he asked her. You can say it's sorta like a permanent version of a log pose, Igaram answered, holding up the little compass. It looked a great deal like the one Nami wore, only this one was made to look a little more like an hourglass shape with only one orb in the middle with needle floating inside it and the name Alabasta was printed on the top. Whereas a log pose will always lead sailors to the next island on the course, an eternal pose will forever remember the magnetic energy of the island stored inside it. So it will always point to that island and no other. And this eternal pose is set to Alabasta Kingdom. And you're going to use this to set your course to home? Vivi asked him worriedly. Princess Vivi, please take the indirect island hopping route to Alabasta, Igaram told her softly, silently letting her know that he knew the dangers, but he was ready to take them. I have never gone that way myself, but you should only need to pass 2 or 3 islands to get there. He turned his attention towards Luffy. Please, take care of the princess in my absence. Yeah, Luffy said cheerfully. Igaram, Vivi started to say something, but her words died on her lips, unable to come out and say what she really wanted. I expect that your journey will be a difficult one, he said with a gentle voice and an encouraging smile. Please, be careful. Vivi still didn't look happy about it, but she forced a smile and took his hand as they promised that they would see each other again soon. They watched as Agaram set sail, all of them saying goodbye. But before he got too far away, there was a bright light and, to their horror, the ship exploded apart. The blinding light and force of the shockwave created a great wind and blew back at them, everyone looking stunned. The ship went up in flames, burning everything until there wasn't anything but a pile of burnt wood on the water. They're already after us, Nami exclaimed fearfully, once she got over the shock. That's impossible. Luffy said nothing as he turned around and walked over a few feet to where his hat, that had been blown off by the shockwave before, and put it back on his head. He let out a loud yell, and looked ready to charge. Now was the time that they had to hurry and leave before they were killed as well. Zoro was right behind him as he yelled at Nami about the log. She quickly checked and let him know that it was set, they could leave. Get the girl, he yelled back as he turned back to run with Luffy. Come on, let's go. As Nami tried to pull Vivi away from the horrible sight, Zoro told Luffy that he'll get the ship ready and that he should get the other 2. Right, Luffy answered, I'm on it. He sprinted back down the street to the building where they had been staying. He broke down the door in his haste and looked wildly around the room for the cook and sniper. It was clear that there had been a party here, the whole place was a mess, and the 2 were both passed out on the floor, snoring loudly. Luffy grabbed hold of Usopp's nose and Sanji's leg, waking them up, but not soon enough. Come on, Luffy shouted as he ran out the door, which was only big enough for him, and so he pulled his 2 crewmates out through either side of the walls, both of them yelling in pain and confusion to what was going on. Sanji was cursing at him to stop it and Usopp was screaming that his nose was gonna fall off. Luffy didn't stop until they reached where the ship was docked, and Zoro was just finishing up pulling up the anchor. Hey, I got them. Luffy screamed up, holding them up. Bring them up, we're ready to go, Zoro told him. Luffy turned around to check and saw Usopp and Sanji were both out cold. What, they're still asleep? He shrugged and dragged them onto the Going Merry. Suddenly, they heard arguing and, they looked behind them to see that Nami brought Vivi here and she was yelling at her, we don't have time to look for him. I'm not just gonna leave him here, Vivi yelled back. But listen, Nami screamed, looking close to slapping her. Zoro yelled out asking what was the problem down at them. Apparently her duck's gone missing, Nami screamed up at him, and now she's refusing to leave without him. This duck, he asked, pointing to the duck that was standing next to him. He's here, both women yelled in fury. Yeah, he was there when I climbed on board, Zoro stated. Made it here before I did, Zoro informed them. With the knowledge that her duck was safe and sound, Vivi climbed up the ladder, while giving them all directions to the best way out of here. With the sails opening, the Straw Hats were more than happy to say goodbye to Whiskey Peak and sailed off into a thick fog. As they got underway, Zoro turned to Vivi. Hey, he stated, and she looked up in surprise.
Mr. Bushido, she asked. Zoro asked how many people did she think that they were going to send after them. Vivi told them that there were at least 2,000 loyal employees and several bases like this one set up in the area. As she told them that, Sanji and Usopp both came to and began screaming that they wanted to stay another night.
We should have just left them behind, Zoro said irritably as Nami went and punched them both, shutting them up. Nami, will you explain it to them? I just did, she answered. Okay, that was fast, he said in surprise. I left out the complicated parts, she added. By this point, the first rays of light were starting to appear on the horizon and they were clear of the island, though they were now forced to sail very carefully through all the fog and avoid the rocks. One false move, and they could end up sinking right here. Finally, it's getting light out, Nami sighed in relief. I'm just glad we got away from the people chasing us, a voice said. That's for sure, Nami agreed. With all this fog, we'll need to be careful to avoid the rocks, the voice spoke again. I'll take care of it, Nami shouted confidently before she realized that she didn't know who had spoken. She looked to Luffy and asked hesitantly, wait, did you? Luffy looked at her in confusion, until they heard someone clear their throat behind them, and as everyone looked up they saw a figure sitting comfortably on the upper railings. The new figure was a woman in her 20s. She was a tall, slender, yet athletic woman with shoulder-length black hair. She has blue eyes, with dark, wide pupils, and she has a long, thin and defined nose. Her skin was lightly tan, and she wore a revealing purple cowgirl outfit, complete with hat. It's you, Vivi stuttered in shock and fear. I just happened to run into your dear Mr. 8 a while back, the woman said coldly. He didn't look so good. Vivi's eyes turned dark as she yelled, so you killed Igaram. You, what are you doing on my ship and how did you get here? Luffy demanded of the stranger. Who are you? Answer him, Vivi yelled. What are you doing here, Miss All Sunday? So you know who she is? Nami questioned. Which of the numbered guys is she partners with? Her partner is Mr. Zero, the boss, Vivi said gravely. She's a bad guy, Luffy questioned her as Nami screamed in fright. She was the only one who knew the boss's identity, Vivi explained as she continued to glare up at Miss All Sunday, as if expecting her to start attacking at any moment. That's how we found out who he actually is, by following her back to him. However, Miss All Sunday said, to be accurate, I allowed it. So she's a good guy then, Luffy said, trying to understand this. I know you knew we were there, Vivi yelled. You're the one who told the boss what we knew, weren't you? That's right, she answered in a bored tone. Alright, so then she is bad, Luffy finally concluded, pouting, and Zoro told him to cut it out. You still haven't told us what it is you're doing here, Vivi yelled again, and the agent was looking annoyed at the rudeness. Oh, right, she said coolly, you were just so serious about the whole thing I couldn't help myself. A princess doing whatever it took to help her country while making herself an enemy of Baroque works. The idea was just so ridiculous. Vivi was looked enraged as she screamed out at the top of her lungs, you killed HHHHHHIMMMMMM. The 5 Straw Hats had leapt into action. Sanji and Usopp were both up on their feet, Usopp with his slingshot loaded on one side, and Sanji on the other with a gun pointed directly at her head. Zoro was below them with Nami, both of them had weapons as well. Usopp and Sanji exchanged a brief conversation to what was going on, but the woman didn't look worried at all. I would really appreciate it if you would, she said softly, and it all happened so quickly that they all missed what happened as she apparently threw the 2 off the railing. Stop pointing those at me. You mean, Zoro said gasped, she's eaten. Nami went on before her staff and Zoro's sword were knocked out of their hands, and then Zoro finished, a devil fruit. But which one? What's her power? Nami cried out, now standing farther back with the others in front of her like shields. Sanji looked up to get a good look at her and hearts reappeared. Wow, he gasped, as if he had never seen anything like her before. Now that I get a look, you're beautiful. Miss All Sunday chuckled a little at Sanji's words before she looked back to Vivi. Now there's no need to get so excited, she informed her, you can all calm down. I haven't been given any orders to follow you here. I have no reason to fight you. Holding up her hand, she used her powers to get hold of Luffy's straw hat, spinning it around on her hand in a bored way. So, you're the captain, she said, looking over at Luffy. I've heard so much about you, Monkey D. Luffy. Give me my hat back, Luffy yelled in rage, shaking his fists at her. You don't want me to come up there and take it. You are a bad person. I demand you leave this instant, Usopp yelled from his hiding place behind the mast. Bad luck, the woman corrected as she put Luffy's hat on top of her own before going on, picking up a princess who Baroque works already made up their mind to see eliminated, protected by a mere handful of pirates. But your luck gets even worse, because of the direction your log pose is indicating, you see? Nami was looking at their log in fear as Miss All Sunday answered, the name of the next island is Little Garden. We won't even need to lift a finger, she finished up, you'll all be dead long before you reach Alabasta. My hat, give it to me, Luffy screamed, obviously not caring about anything she said. Leave now, evil doer, Usopp yelled. Evil doer, Zoro repeated, rolling his eye, seriously? That's all a matter of opinion, the cowgirl answered, not at all offended by it. You don't think it's a little foolish allowing yourselves to be wiped out? She asked as she threw back Luffy's hat and something over to Vivi. When she held it up, they saw that it was an eternal pose. An eternal pose? Vivi whispered as she looked at it suspiciously. Using that, you can just skip right past Little Garden without stopping, All Sunday answered her a little smugly. She also explained that this one island was near Alabasta and that none of their agents know that course so they shouldn't be followed. What? So she's good after all? Nami suddenly asked as she looked up at her, trying to figure out what was going on. But the gesture seemed to make Vivi angry as she yelled up, why are you giving this to us? It's gotta be a trap, Zoro said firmly, but Vivi was staring at the pose with a wondering expression and they could tell that she was trying to figure out what to do. Oh, does it? All Sunday asked as Luffy walked over to Vivi and grabbed the eternal pose out of her hands. Forget your thingy. We don't need it, he yelled as he then crushed it until it broke into nothing but shards of glass and wood. Nami and Vivi were both looking horrified at what he had done. Nami obviously didn't feel that way as she kicked him hard in the face and knocked him to the deck. You jerk, she screamed out, pointing up at the woman. She just went out of her way to show us an easier course to follow. Maybe she actually is trying to help us get away. But Luffy didn't react at all for a moment before he turned to look up at All Sunday and declared that she wasn't the one who decided where the ship goes. Both Luffy and the woman looked at each other for a few extra long seconds, with All Sunday just looking at him, as if she was trying to figure out a complicated question, before she smiled, as if she had it answered. Well, that's too bad, All Sunday told them all casually as she walked along the upper deck, looking a little satisfied as she did so. It was as if she was glad that he had decided not to accept her offer. Nami looked ready to yell again but Luffy answered, she blew up that funny old man and he was nice so now I hate her. I'm sorry to hear that, she stated looking back at him, and I'm sorry you didn't accept my offer. If you survive, I hope we meet again. No, Luffy said childishly and she actually chuckled at that. All Sunday gave them one last smile before she jumped ship and when they went running off to look, they found her leaving on the back of a giant sea turtle, heading back to Whiskey Peak. Luffy watched after the turtle with bright eyes as Vivi fell to her knees in defeat. That woman, she cried out, I don't have the slightest idea what's going through her head. Then there's no point in thinking about it, is there? Nami asked irritably. There's someone on this boat who's just like that, Zoro added as Usopp demanded to know what was going on and Sanji swooned over Vivi. After quickly explaining everything that was going on to Sanji and Usopp, their cook sighed and confessed that he was sorry that he missed all the fun. But it sounds like there'll still be plenty of demand for my skills. No need to worry now that your sleeping prince has awoken, my sweet, you'll be safe. Usopp was stating the opposite. He was glad that he is asleep, as Sanji asked if Nami was jealous. She gave him a frosty look and gave him a definite no. Excuse me, Vivi asked hesitantly, and they all looked to her. She was standing there, looking truly terrible that she got them involved in this mess. I'm sorry, but is it really alright that I'm on your ship? I'm just causing you a lot of trouble. Nami, meanwhile, looked put out as she came over and started poking Vivi's forehead. It's a little late for apologizes, don't you think? If you didn't want to cause us trouble you shouldn't have told us who you were. Sorry for that, Vivi said. Isn't that right, Luffy? Nami yelled and Luffy cheered, saying that he was hungry too, which didn't do anything to boost Vivi's confidence. Well, for now, Zoro said, ending the fight, at least we know where we're heading to. Little garden, huh? Sanji said. Remember what she said? Usopp said worriedly, are we gonna die? Luffy laughed. Who knows? Let's go pirates. Later they were all standing on the Mary's deck with Sanji passing out fruit drinks to them all and Luffy asking them if they wanted to get out the fishing gear. Fishing? Heck yeah, I'm in, Zoro said agreeably. Sounds good to me, Usopp said eagerly. I'll even make you one of my custom fishing rods, you'll love it. It was then that the men were all giving the duck, Karoo, drink after fruit drink, even cheering him on with each one he took. Nami came out of the cabin with a couple more drinks and Vivi, who was standing up there, looked to her, saying loudly, they're acting like idiots. Maybe this will help, Nami said, holding out the drink to her and Vivi looked surprised at that. Just relax, she went on, these guys may go through their goofy phases but when things get rough, they get to work. Trust me, I should know. Sorry, Vivi said, calming down, I don't know what's wrong with me, I'm getting worked up over nothing. Nami just smiled. This ship will put you at ease, she reassured her, you'll cheer up in no time. As she said that, Karoo had drank too much and was looking ready to burst. The others were all laughing around him and even Vivi cracked a smile as Karoo lay on his back, a fountain of juice erupting from his mouth. Yeah, she said, they're funny. Soon though, Nami's words went to the test. A dolphin, the size of a sea king had jumped out of the sea, and as if they had this all planned out, they all dropped what they were doing and got to work. Like a well-oiled machine, they got the sails ready and turned around, all of them knowing just what to do without being told. Soon they used the waves that the dolphin created to ride out and go at an amazing speed, all of them even enjoying the ride. Vivi stared at them all in amazement as Luffy asked Nami for direction when the excitement died down. Nami told them to sail portside and they turned without any other complaints. Just after that, they could see it in the distance. Through light mist, they could make out a large island that looked like a tropical jungle. There's no mistake, Nami declared as she checked the log post to see that the needle was pointing directly at the island. Cactus Island and this one are definitely pulling against each other. She pointed at it and cried out, our next stop. Everyone cheered as they slowly approached. This is it, Luffy yelled, jumping up and down with zeal, our second island in the Grand Line. They followed a little river right into the island, the heat of this humid weather and thick plant life already starting to make them all uncomfortable. But Luffy wasn't deterred at all as he said, I can see why they call this place Little Garden. I can't, what's little about it? Zoro asked him darkly. Yeah, this island looks pretty harsh if you ask me, why the cute name, Nami added. The crew soon found themselves standing next to a shallow creek where Luffy had come running up to with Vivi riding Karoo. Luffy had skidded to a stop and went over to the water, something catching his eye. Hey, what's the matter? Vivi asked, wondering why he had stopped. Over here, check it out, Luffy called out excitedly as he picked up something from the water. It's a shellfish that looks like a squid. He held it up to her as she got off her duck to get a closer look. Shell squidfish, he finished proudly. How strange, Vivi said, frowning as she looked at it, it sorta resembles an ominoid. Cool huh? Luffy asked and they heard the ground shaking, the sounds of giant footsteps. They all looked around and soon saw what it was with their own eyes. That's weird, Luffy yelled, looking up to see the giant creature overhead. What's a sea king doing on land? Vivi screamed out what it was. A dinosaur. Awesome, Luffy screamed as Vivi and Karoo could only yell in terror. Chapter 12. The two could only stare up at the supposedly extinct animal in shock. Eventually, Vivi started to talk again. She spoke about how this island somehow stayed frozen in time. Luffy looked at her and she explained that the climax must have stayed like this since ancient times. Luffy's laughter rang out and he leapt up while his arms elongated to those of a gibbon so that he could hang onto the dinosaur's neck. Dinosaur, he screamed joyfully. Are you crazy? Vivi screamed in terror. Luffy went jumping up to the dinosaur's head. He was standing up and looking around eagerly. Luffy began yelling down at Vivi that he found a place to have their lunch. It's dangerous up there, come down already, she yelled, like a mother would to a child who had climbed too high in a tree. It may seem nice but it's still a dinosaur. We have something in common. We both love to eat. Luffy waved down happily. He then called out that there was a mountain full of holes and that they should go and check it out. Vivi was continuing to yell at him to come down as he was trying to get the dinosaur to take him to that mountain. The poor thing howled in pain when Luffy turned its head sharply. The noise it made was so loud that it shook the land and soon dozens of other dinosaurs, much larger ones, appeared from out of nowhere. Luffy was now fighting with the dinosaurs. They were all going at him, looking like a tangle of snakes above them as he slid down their necks like slides, jumping from head to head with the skills and laughter of his namesake, until he was finally eaten by the biggest one that was covered in scars. Vivi screamed when she saw the giant blade come flying out of nowhere and lobbed the neck of the beast off so suddenly that Luffy popped right out of the neck as it fell. A giant hand then appeared and caught Luffy like he was an action figure. The hand led up to a well-built giant with a beard so long that it went past his waist. He was dressed in Viking attire with a helmet that went right over his eyes. Luffy was standing on the giant's palm as the giant began to laugh. Gag, the giant laughed. What fun, that was glorious. Watching the likes of you grapple with long necks is the most entertainment I've had in quite a while. You're my first visitor in a long while. Wow, you're huge. Are you human? Luffy asked, without a trace of fear. Human? What a joke. The towering man laughed as he heaved his sword up on his shoulder. Greatest warrior of all Elbaf, I am Dory. Well, hi, I'm Luffy, and I'm a pirate, Luffy answered as if he hadn't noticed that there was anything wrong. Dory laughed again as he said, a pirate? Well, good for you my friend. By the way, Luffy said, pointing down to Vivi, who was trying to get Karoo, who seemed to have fainted, to wake up so that they could get out of here. I'd like you to meet Vivi and Karoo. Say hi to Dory, Luffy added, waving down at them. Vivi was looking angry with him and yelled back from the ground, that's great, Luffy, just can't shut up.
Dory just laughed again and invited them to his home in a good-natured way as he bent down and picked Vivi and Karoo up, both of them screaming fearfully as Luffy laughed. They spotted the mountain that Luffy talked about before and Dory had already thrown an enormous chunk of meat to Luffy while the two were laughing. Luffy sat up on top of it, and was already making a head start on it.
You sure knew how to cook, giant, Luffy laughed up at him. Why thanks for the compliment, your pirate goodies are good too, my little friend, Dory said happily as he laughed with them, although the portions are a little small. Luffy went on speaking, enjoying the mint. Yeah, I know what you mean, but the chief on my ship made it special for this trip so I'm glad you liked it otherwise I'll have to beat you up. Dory stopped in mid-laugh and demanded, was that a threat, shorty? Vivi and Karoo freeze up in terror before he then started laughing, slapping his knee. I like you little pirate, you're really funny. It was a very interesting conversation from that point on as Luffy then asked Dory why he was living here all on his own, and Dory explained about how he and another giant named Brogy had been battling here for 100 years. How that, in their land, when a fight breaks out and neither side yields, their god would then decide who is right of winning the duel in their life, so they had been battling each other all this time but there has yet to be a winner. Vivi however couldn't believe the reason for that and was asking if there was possibly any hatred between the two after all this time, but Dory just laughed as she continued to look confused. Suddenly, the volcano went off and Dory was getting to his feet, a flash in his eyes and as they looked up at him, all of them feeling the surge of energy go through them. Dory picked up his sword and shield, heading off to the battleground as he quickly explained how that volcano was their marker. They must rush off to fight whenever it erupts. Vivi tried to stop them, telling him that it was senseless to keep fighting and asking why he hated the other giant so much, but Luffy told her to stop, that this wasn't anything like that. You're right, Dory agreed with a firm smile. This is about honor, I had forgotten. He then went running off towards the battle, our reason for our brawl. And at that moment they felt it, an enormous shockwave that came through the entire island. It was so great that they could all feel it. It sent a few chills up their spines and even Luffy was knocked backwards by it. They watched and soon the battle ended, in a draw. When it ended, they were able to get a good look at the giant Brogy. Like Dory, he too dressed in Viking attire, complete with a red helmet with two horns. Brogy, himself, had a blonde beard shaped like an axe's blade, beady eyes, pig-like nose, but he looked to be just as good-natured as Dory was as he tossed him several barrels. Dory had rejoined Luffy, Vivi and Karoo as he explained that he had seen Usopp and Nami with Brogy and that he thanked them for the drinks. Vivi began asking Dory if it really took a year for the log to reset. Dory admitted that it was the truth to Vivi, and also informed them that no human had ever survived on the island for the full year. He told them that some become dinosaur food, others have died from heat or starvation, some of them have even been dumb enough to attack him and Brogy. Dory ended by stating he supposed that an entire year just seemed to be too long for humans. Vivi was looking stricken, telling him that her country could be destroyed even if they could survive the year. She's right, Luffy added, plus I'd get bored here after a year. Isn't there anything else we can do about it, old man? Dory thought it over as he put the barrels down and admitted that there was another eternal pose on the island, but that led them to Elbaf, and that was basically what he and Brogy had been fighting over this whole time. He stated that they could try to take it from them if they wanted, but Luffy shook his head, telling him that they weren't trying to get to Elbaf, but to Alabasta. Vivi agreed, saying that they had to stay on the course that would lead them back to her home. Dory thought it over again and stated that they could try sailing randomly. If they were lucky, they'd get somewhere sooner or later. They all thought about it before Luffy burst out laughing. Maybe so, he laughed, we may actually get there. Dory began laughing with him, along with the Straw Hat's captain. For some reason, the whole thing did seem funny now that they mentioned it. Now that I think about it, someone did leave the island once before his log was reset, Dory confessed as he roared with laughter. And what happened to him? Luffy asked, through tears of mirth. How should I know that? Dory stated and soon, Luffy was practically rolling on the ground from laughter. I'm sure he was able to get to the next island, he said, though it was clear that he didn't believe it as Dory agreed just the same as they enjoyed themselves. Karoo was looking close to laughing with the other two, but stopped when he saw the outraged look on Vivi's face, as if she couldn't understand just what was so funny. But just then, what sounded like an explosion came from within Dory's stomach. He let out a strangled yell, his eyes rolling into the back of his head and smoke began to billow out of his mouth like a volcano. Luffy let out a horrified yell as he jumped up to see for himself. He was yelling at Vivi what happened, stating that was the same alcohol they had on the ship. Vivi then suggested that the Brogy was responsible for this. Luffy obviously felt the same way. His eyes turned dangerous as he jumped down and yelled right in her face. Hold it, were you even watching them? They fight their duels honorably, no way he'd do that. Alright then, who did do it? Vivi demanded just as Dory got back to his feet, reaching for his sword. His eyes were so angry they were now practically glowing red. There was no trace of the friendly, gracious giant here. There was cold fury practically radiating from him. Blood spurted from his mouth. You strangers, Dory growled, breathing hard. It wasn't Brogy. No way, no warrior of Elbaf would dare so. Who else is there to suspect on this island then, but you? Luffy glared up at the giant. Karoo screamed and went running off as Vivi told Luffy that they should get out of here. But Luffy wouldn't move, declaring that maybe talking wouldn't change anything, but running wasn't going to do any good either. Luffy passed Vivi his hat and told her to stand back while he took care of things. She stared at him as she took the hat and asked, "You're going to fight Dory?" Luffy cracked his knuckles and admitted that he didn't want to, but he had to settle this. Vivi shook her head as she looked to Dory and tried to reason with him that they weren't the ones who did this and that he was in no shape to fight. But he was beyond listening as he swung his sword, blood coming from his mouth. The fight began and as it went on, it was clear that Luffy was trying his best not to wound the already hurt giant. Instead of using any of his attack forms, Luffy would simply dodge wide swings, only using his powers to enhance his maneuverability. Dory wasn't done yet as he finally slammed his foot down on top of Luffy. However, this little fight seemed to be too much for him as he held onto his stomach, falling to his knees and finally passing out when he hit the ground. Luffy was laying in the boot print, gasping for breath, dirty and bruised, but otherwise looked relatively unharmed. Vivi came running to him, asking if he was alright, but Luffy brushed off his own minor injuries and instead asked about Dory as he took his hat back. He should be okay, she said softly looking at him. Guess you were right about fighting, she admitted. He seems a lot calmer now. Luffy put his hat back on and, his eyes feral slits, snapped, well, I'm not, the old guy was right about one thing anyway. The other giant would never do anything like this. But I know that our friends would never do it either, they aren't like that. Yeah, Vivi said softly, but then, there must be somebody else on this island. Luffy decided without hesitation. Before the conversation could go any further, the volcano went off again. At the noise, Dory's eyes opened and he looked ready to go off. Breathing hard, still having blood on the side of his mouth, Dory tried to get up, but he doubled over in pain, still holding onto his stomach. Luffy tried to stop him as Vivi pleaded for him to rest, but he wouldn't listen. He claimed that he was a warrior and that if he was going to die, he was going to die as a warrior no matter what, even as blood erupted from inside him. With a great effort, he managed to get back to his feet. Still breathing hard, Dory made to run off, but before he did, he took hold of the mountainside and picked it up so that he could drop it on Luffy, to keep him from moving. Screaming loudly, Luffy fought to pull himself out, but Dory said softly to himself, "Forgive me, Elbaf." Luffy stopped as he watched Dory go over to pick up his battered sword again. It's been over a century since we started the battle, this duel, injured or not, I cannot allow myself to run away from this fight. He held his sword tightly as he straightened. To do so would be like running away from the title, warrior, and if I was no longer a warrior of Elbaf, Dory stated grimly, then I would no longer know who I am. He looked down and added, I'm sorry I suspected you of causing the explosion. Luffy was now struggling to pull his body out from under the mountain, but his legs were so well pinned that even transforming into the smallest bug couldn't get him free and he risked crushing himself if he went into one of his bigger forms. Dory sighed as he said that he knew now that this was judgment from Elbaf, their god of war. Luffy was looking furious as he screamed out, listen to me, God's protections and judgments have nothing to do with what's going on. If a god told you to just run off and die, would you? Someone's interfered with your duel. Dory stopped for a moment and listened to what Luffy was saying. And a duel that's been interfered with isn't a fair fight anymore. Luffy screamed out at the top of his lungs, isn't that right? Silence. Dory screamed out, sounding angry again. What could you possibly know about this? You're a human who can't have been living on this earth for more than 2 decades. How can you possibly hope to understand the ways of the warriors of Elbaf? And without another word, Dory kept walking with Luffy beating his fists around like a child having a tantrum, trying to get the rock off him, screaming for Dory to let him go. Vivi just stared at him, trying to calm him down. The look on her face clearly asked why he was so upset. Who was it? Luffy demanded angrily. Who would dare to interfere? I'll kill them. While the princess tried to think of an answer, a familiar voice suddenly sounded off behind them, screaming for Luffy. Usopp came bursting through the trees, tripped, bounced on a rock before crashing right into the mountain. Usopp was looking up and when he spotted Luffy and Vivi there, he ran over to them, shouting out, I have terrible news, the dinosaur ate Nami. Luffy also yelled in terror. Usopp cried out that they were running away from the dinosaurs together, but when he turned around, she was gone. They both began to freak out until Vivi yelled for them both to calm down and think things through. That just because she disappeared didn't mean that she was eaten. Usopp demanded to know just what else she thought could have happened and Vivi finally suggested the answer. I don't know for sure, she confessed, but if Baroque Works followed us from Whiskey Peak it would make sense for them to go after Nami, not you. I think we may be in great danger, we should go. Usopp gasped at Vivi's words. You mean Baroque Works is here on the island with us? He asked before he thought it over, and his fear was temporarily replaced with confusion. Wait, but why capture Nami and not me? Vivi explained that they most likely didn't know about Usopp or Sanji even existed and so that meant that they were probably not on Baroque Works' assassination list because they never got in their way. She then suggested that the alcohol was probably meant for them instead. Luffy and Usopp's eyes widened as Usopp asked what she meant and she told them the whole story about the exploding drinks. No way. Usopp screamed out, sweat falling in his eyes wide in horror. They actually exploded inside the guy? He looked behind him in the direction of the battling giants and asked, wait, he was injured that badly and he still ran off to go fight? I tried to stop him and that's how I ended up like this, Luffy explained darkly, still trying to pull himself out. This is horrible. Usopp yelled in panic. Those two have been fighting for as hard as they can for 100 years and they always ended in a draw. In the distance they could hear the sounds of them fighting. Plus, their duels are fought with the most honor and pride in the whole world. There's no way they can settle at once and for all like this. Vivi just looked at them as Luffy fought harder than ever to get out. However, soon they saw what looked like a geyser of blood shoot above the trees. They all stared at it and knew it could only mean one thing. Luffy was now going crazy, banging his head against the ground in fury. Usopp and Vivi tried to calm him down but he ignored them both as he fought. WHO was I-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T. He screamed out at the top of his lungs. WHO did T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T-T- himself. This lost its effect because his knees were shaking together. Vivi said that she was going to go with him, but someone said, "You're not going anywhere." Looking back, they were standing there where the two they saw before, though it was hard to tell it was them without the beat-up faces. Mr. Five and Miss Valentines were there, holding onto a beat-up Karoo. Vivi shouted for him to let the duck go. Mr. Five did, but only because he wanted to. He threw the hurt duck to the ground and Vivi ran over to him in horror, calling out his name. "You can have him back," Mr. Five said. "We don't need him." Miss Valentines laughed mockingly as Usopp asked Luffy who they were and he said that they were from the last island. "Karoo never did anything to you. Why did you have to do this to him?" Vivi screamed at them. Mr. Five merely answered that they didn't have to hurt him if he just cooperated with them. They had wanted to use him as bait to lure them into the jungle where they could attack them, but Karoo had refused to help them and kept silence the whole time. But when they found out that Luffy was trapped like this, they didn't think they had anything to worry about. As they laughed at Karoo, Vivi declared she was going to kill him. Usopp demanded to know if they were the ones behind injuring Dory, which they didn't bother to deny. As soon as he heard, Luffy was now looking ready to kill as he tried to crawl out. Vivi pulled out her weapons and looked ready to fight as well, but they didn't seem concerned. The two charged ahead, but Usopp's exploding stars didn't work as Miss Valentines flew out of the way and Mr. Five sent his own bomb at him. Miss Valentines fell on Usopp like a boulder and Mr. Five grabbed Vivi by the throat. Mr. Five reassured them that he wasn't going to kill them because Mr. Three gave them orders to bring them in alive. He passed Vivi to his partner as he walked over to Luffy, and he actually exploded, burning Luffy, Usopp, and Karoo in the process. The three lay there, their eyes rolled back and smoking. Mr. Five smirked down at Luffy. "Consider this our thank you for what happened at Whiskey Peak. You should learn to mind your own business, you pathetic excuse of wannabe pirates. It will be quite beneficial for your heath. By the way, we have your swordsman friend. We've captured the other girl you brought along with you as well." "So you caught Zoro?" croaked out Luffy, his face still in the dirt. "That's right," Mr. Five said with a sneer, and suddenly, Luffy was chuckling softly. "In that case," he whispered, "you're in more trouble than I thought." "Well," Mr. Five said, "let's see how big you talk after one of my kicking bombs blows up that little face of yours." Luffy forced his head to look up, a smirk there. "Try whatever you want, I'm gonna kick your butt," and then he spit on Mr. Five's shoe. Mr. Five grew furious and then he kicked Luffy's face, which did explode. Vivi screamed as Mr. Five continued to kick 1, 2, 3. He kept kicking about 13 times, each kick exploding, until he was tired and Luffy was burnt black. "You weak little fool," Mr. Five said, as Vivi screamed out for them. Luffy managed to get out a choking laugh, which caused a small cloud of soot to come out of his mouth. Mr. Five developed an angry tick mark at the straw hat wearing idiot who refused to stay down. "And what?" he sneered at Luffy's prone form, "is so funny this time?" Luffy stopped chuckling and looked up at the Baroque works agent with a strange gleam in his eyes. "Thanks for that. I was so upset about what happened to that giant guy that I couldn't think clearly. Your kick knocked some sense into me though, enough that I just figured out how to get out of this." Mr. Five was about to retort before he noticed Luffy's body shrinking. Unlike before, Luffy went for a form that, while smaller, was easily able to wiggle out of his trap position. He became a rat. 1. Ignoring Miss Valentine's girlish shriek at the sudden appearance of the rodent, Mr. Five was more focused on how the boy he'd previously thought to be hopelessly trapped was now free. He barely had time to mutter, "Oh, crap," before Luffy's smaller form shot up to his previous height and beyond as he took on a rat-human hybrid form. The now taller Luffy gave the bomb man the grin of the mouse who got the cheese before slugging the man hard in the chin, knocking him all the way back to his still shrieking partner. "Remember when I said you guys were in more trouble than you thought? Yeah, turns out that's happening now instead of later." Luffy smirked in a bloodthirsty way as he marched forward, cracking his larger knuckles as he went. Mr. Five scrambled up to his feet and, casting a worried glance at the approaching Ratman, said to Miss Valentines, "I think we've overstayed our welcome. Let's report back to Mr. 3. The blonde woman quickly nodded her head and Mr. Five once again exploded, but unlike the previous time this was more of a smoke bomb than an explosive one as a thick cloud of dust covered the area. Coughing, Luffy tried to pick up where the two creeps were at, but due to the dust his vision was blocked and his sense of smell was messed up. Plus, the bang from the explosion left his sharp ears ringing, so he couldn't make out a thing. When the smoke cleared, there was only Luffy, Usopp, and a now recovering Karoo in the clearing. "Oh no, those two jerks kidnapped Vivi," Usopp cried out in terror. Still in his hybrid rat form, Luffy growled, "And I can't pick up their scent, the explosion must have covered it. Darn it," he whipped his tail angrily, "I'm really getting sick of those two." Karoo let out a quack and Luffy whipped his head around to the duck. "Really? Can you lead us there?" Usopp looked at Luffy strangely. I didn't say anything, Luffy." "Not you, the duck," the Chimera man said as he pointed to Karoo. "He says he knows where those two were going since they took him from there earlier. He can lead us to those two creeps and the rest of the crew." Usopp exclaimed bewilderedly, you can speak duck? Luffy shrugged as he shrank to human form. Well yeah, I can understand all animals. I can only do it when I'm in either animal or hybrid form though. Human and partial transformations don't work for some reason, too. Anyway, let's get going. With that, the two followed the large waterfowl as he led them through the forests. They traveled for nearly an hour before they came across a clearing that contained a worrying sight. The giants were on the ground. Dory was face down and bleeding as Brogy was being restrained with large quantities of wax, including what looked like large wax spokes impaled in his hands and feet. Vivi, Zoro, and Nami were there as well, and they seemed to be trapped in a giant cake with a spinning pumpkin on a pillar above them. Flakes of wax from the candles on top of the pumpkin were falling fast and covering everything beneath them with a coating of wax. The four underneath were already halfway covered with it, and Zoro seemed to be arguing with the girls over something. Watching them were Mr. Five and Miss Valentine's, however there were two others there with them. There was a young girl with blushed cheeks and braided pigtails, while the other was a rather frail-looking man with one big 3 achieved through his top knot. Seeing enough, the trio picked up speed till they were running full force into the area. Just as Zoro plunged his blades into his feet, and then Luffy, Karoo, and Usopp came bursting into the clearing with such force that they were sent flying. When I get back I'm gonna kick the crap out of you, screamed Luffy as they threw by and smashing into some trees. Luffy, Nami's voice called in relief. Usopp, Karoo, Vivi yelled as the three came marching back. All three of them were looking ticked off. We're here, Brogy, Usopp yelled. Don't worry, we'll pick up where you left off. Thanks, Usopp, he said, from where he lay as Nami screamed for them to hurry up and beat them until they were beyond recognition. Luffy promised that he intended to as Mr. 3 laughed at him, trying to mock him on how pathetic it was that he had such a high bounty. But Luffy just noticed his hair and gasped that it was on fire as Mr. 3 screamed at him to shut up. Yes, he has weird hair, Nami screamed at him. Now could you break this pillar? We're about to turn into wax statues here. Luffy looked up at them in blasé surprise and asked bluntly, oh, are you guys in trouble? Nope, Zoro said, his sword over his shoulder, no trouble at all. Wait, Zoro, your legs? Nami gasped, and that was when they saw blood seeping over the edge of wax. Zoro admitted that he must have made it about halfway through and Nami screamed at him, asking how that was no trouble at all. Vivi looked sick at the sight of it, her face turning a bluish tint as Zoro ignored the girls and asked Luffy if he could take care of the pillar, and Luffy smiled confidently. Zoro then smirked back as he lifted his white blade high and Nami asked him why he was standing like that. If I'm gonna be a statue I prefer this pose, he said as if answering telling her what 2 + 2 was as Vivi shouted at him, sounding close to hysterical. Nami was also yelling at him, telling him to at least do something about all the blood because she was getting nauseous looking at it all. So quite looking at it then, Zoro told her off. It's kinda hard to ignore, she yelled back, and soon they were both arguing as Vivi stared at them, as if she was convinced that they just didn't realize how much danger they were in. Brogy smiled in understanding at their now calm attitude. Even Miss Goldenweek noticed as she spread out a blanket and served herself some tea. She pointed out to Mr. 3 how they didn't seem concerned with what was about to happen to them. As Usopp and Karoo moved back to hide in the trees, Luffy went against Mr. 3. Right off the bat, the Candleman was able to trap his feet. This proved to be a bad thing because in the end, Luffy was able to use this to his advantage by turning his legs into a snake's lower body and, using the now loose wax, slammed his leg locks into the pillar, smashing it. The giant pumpkin fell, and for one horrible moment, they thought they were going to crush the three trapped below. But instead, it landed on the top tier of the wax cake and continued to spin, the process picking up rapidly. Luffy asked them why they didn't run for it. Nami and Vivi screamed that they were stuck. Oh, really? He asked in surprise. Is that what's going on? The only thing you guys kept saying was for me to break the pillar, so that's what I did? Mr. Bushido, do you really think it's a good idea to put our lives in that guy's hands? Vivi screamed at Zoro. Well, we don't exactly have much of a choice here, do we? The green-haired swordsman asked, not looking the least bit concerned. I don't know about you, but I'm having a little bit of trouble moving right now. And you don't seem to be bothered by it somehow, she screamed hysterically. Mr. 3 laughed out, saying that all Luffy had done was move the candles closer and sped up the process, turning them into wax statues. Wait, Luffy yelled, finally understanding what was going on. You guys are gonna turn into wax figures. That's what we've been trying to tell you, Nami screamed. Please just hurry up and destroy this thing, Luffy. Vivi begged, and Luffy said that he got it this time. Mr. 3 tried to attack him just as Usopp sent an exploding star at him. However, Mr. 5 stepped in and, not only did he catch it with his mouth, but he swallowed it. Luffy went back to trying to break the pumpkin. He leapt into his gorilla form and was about to use his increased strength to smash the remaining wax just as Mr. 3 created a wall to block it. He then tried to trap him up again, but had only been able to trap one of Luffy's arms in the wax, which Luffy used to launch another attack at him, using the wax on his arm to break through Mr. 3's shield and send him flying. Luffy, however, was suddenly standing there as if frozen, and Nami screamed at him to hurry up, but he kept saying no despite them pleading. He just kept saying no, that he didn't feel like saving them. The crew failed to notice two things. Luffy was standing on a strange, black symbol on the grass. Miss Goldenweek holding a black-tipped paintbrush in her hands. Nami's eyes widened. Luffy, what's wrong? Yeah, Luffy said, still in that dead tone, but for some reason I can't get motivated to help. What do you mean can't get motivated? The three screamed. Finally, Vivi noticed the mark and yelled at Miss Goldenweek that she was behind it, which the girl confirmed. It's my colors trap, betrayal black, she said as she enjoyed some rice crackers. If you touch the paint you'll want to betray your friends no matter what they might say, even if they beg and plead for help. Vivi explained about Miss Goldenweek's ability, how her paint created different emotions and it could use it to manipulate others' minds. Does that mean that all he has to do is get away from the paint and he'll be okay? Nami asked as she tried to yell at him to get out away from it, but Vivi was telling him the opposite, screaming at him not to step outside the symbol and not to save them. And he did. Luffy snapped out of it and came back to his senses. Once he was freed, Vivi was screaming for help again. Luffy tried to charge in again to help, but Miss Goldenweek trapped him in another color trap and the yellow paint on his back was making him laugh helplessly. Colors trap again. Laughter yellow, she declared, shouldn't have stepped outside the circle. Nami yelled at him to take his shirt off to get rid of the paint, but he couldn't move from laughing. Zoro glared at the wax covering his arms and mentioned that they'd be lucky to stay alive for another 5 minutes. It was looking bad, but thankfully, Usopp came running out on Karoo, running from Mr. 5 and Miss Valentine's. They ran into Luffy and smeared the paint, getting Luffy to stop laughing. Hurry and take her out before she does something else, Usopp yelled. Luffy, now looking annoyed, yelled at Miss Goldenweek for her to stop as he tried to fight, but instead she painted another symbol on the ground, this time a bright red color. And like a bull to red cape, Luffy couldn't attack anything but the spot on the ground. Finally, Miss Goldenweek combined her yellow and blue paints to make colors trap, tranquil green, so now Luffy was so peaceful that he was having a cup of tea with her. Luffy's face was twisted in pain, trying to break the spell. By this point, even Usopp was yelling at him about what the hell he was doing. With the help of Usopp and Karoo, they hit him with another exploding star so that they were able to burn the shirt and the colors trap right off. At this point though, the trapped straw hats resembled little more than wax statues, their faces set in different expressions. I'm tired of your stupid paints, you're through, Luffy declared, waking up and gasping for air, his skin now burnt. I'm not going to let you hurt any more of my friends. His eyes narrowed as he yelled out, now I'm really mad. Mr. 3, who finally came back, had used the distraction to create himself a wax suit of armor, before he had Miss Goldenweek painted to make it stronger. As Luffy turned his attention back to Mr. 3, Usopp suddenly realized and he screamed out the way to save the others. That he reminded him that it was still wax and if they could melt it, they could still save the others. No way, seriously, Luffy cried out excitedly and Miss Goldenweek confirmed it as Mr. 3 yelled at her for that. Luffy, now in his Chimera form, fought Mr. 3 while Usopp worked out a plan to get the others out of the wax. He covered a rope with oil and told Karoo to run around the whole thing while he was slowly being crushed to death by Miss Valentine's. Thankfully, Luffy was able to grab hold of Mr. 3's burning hair and brought the little flame over to light the rope. It was a massive fireball, like an explosion, going up in a tower of flames. The heat alone felt like it was going to knock them over. The heat alone was easily enough to melt the statues and Mr. 3's armor until they were a mass of wax. With his protection gone, Mr. 3 turned and went running off into the jungle with Luffy and Karoo on his heels. Luffy suddenly found himself in a clearing full of wax statues of Mr. 3. There were more than he could count, of all different positions all looking at him. Just then, he heard Mr. 3's voice around them, trying to taunt Luffy into coming closer and try to find him. He then claimed that when he least expected, he would stab him. Luffy just stood there, as if lost in his own thoughts before he looked up. Luffy suddenly grew horns out of both his forehead and his nose as his skin became rough hide. 3, now standing as a triceratops, Luffy charged in one random direction, and amazingly found him. How could you have known that this was where I was? He asked through foam in his mouth before he passed out from shock, the man being pinned to the tree with 2 of Luffy's horns under his arms while the third was just below his groin. Each horn was just a hair's breadth away from impaling the man, and the shock of it all made him lose consciousness. Instinct, Luffy answered just as Karoo spotted Miss Goldenweek trying to sneak away and he went after her, her scream echoing around them. They soon were back clearing with everyone, even with Brogy out of the wax and was crying his eyes out. He was crying so much that his tears were making a waterfall and a rainbow to match. But to their amazement, the sounds of his wails had woken Dory up and he was now sitting up, freaking everyone out. As it turned out that it really had been the weapons that saved him and Usopp realized that no weapon could hold up for 100 years of battle. They had to have been dull by now. Brogy, however, was crying shamelessly as he hugged Dory and continued to sob and laugh at the same time. With the playful punches they were throwing at each other and soon they were fighting again. After all this madness, they took care of their injuries as they told Dory everything that happened while he was out cold. As they talked, the two apparently forgot all about their bounties thanks to their years trapped on this island. Vivi tried to apologize to them, telling them that it was her fault that they came here in the first place but no one else seemed to buy that as they all enjoyed the rice crackers that Miss Goldenweek left behind, and Luffy was even trying to get them to have a party. Nami was yelling at Luffy and Usopp, who were fighting over the crackers, about what they were supposed to do over their log pose. All of you helped save us from those other guys, Brogy said. If we can, we'd really like to repay the favor. But when Luffy suggested that they could help with their pose, they sadly admitted that there wasn't anything they could do about that. Just then, Sanji came out of the jungle, swooning declares of love when he saw the women. Usopp and Karoo were outraged. Of course he's happy, the big, useless jerk. He yelled, he shows up after we take care of everything. Sanji yelled in shock after he spotted the giants and demanded if one of them was Mr. 3. When they pressed him to how he learned that name, he explained that he had been talking to Mr. Zero over a transponder snail in a hideout in the jungle and pretended to be Mr. 3 when he talked to him. And since I had him on the line, he finished up, I went ahead and told him that we were all dead. So he thinks that he doesn't have to send anyone else after us anymore, Vivi gasped in understanding. So you're saying that we're finally free from people chasing us now that we can't go anywhere anyway? Usopp yelled dramatically. Oh, that is just perfect. Sanji couldn't see what the problem was as he pulled out the eternal pose to Alabasta that he stole. Which stunned them all, their jaws dropping open as they stared at it, but soon it was a celebration as Vivi hugged him tightly and they were getting ready to leave. Giant old guys, it's really been a lot of fun, Luffy said, waving up at them. Both giants seemed to have been lost in their thoughts for a moment, as if remembering something from a long time ago when they heard Sanji and Zoro go on about their hunting contest, but we gotta go. Of course, Brogy said in understanding, right? We can tell that you really need to get going. It's too bad that you have leave so soon, Dory added, looking directly at Vivi. I hope you make it to your homeland in time. Me too, thank you, Vivi said gratefully and they all started to head off with Usopp declaring that someday he would visit Elbaf one day. The Straw Hats were standing on the Mary's deck and sailing down the river to the ocean's edge. It turned out that the giants were standing on either side of the river, their backs to them and their capes waving in the wind. It looked as if they had come to say goodbye. As they got nearer, Brogy spoke without looking at them. A great danger still lies ahead of you. It is an obstacle that has always been here, Dory added, just as dramatically, to try and prevent people reaching the next island. Straw Hats were looking scared as their jaws dropped, but Dory went on, but every one of you fought like true warriors to protect the pride of our duel. And because you were willing to do that no matter what enemy you may face, Brogy stated. We will never let them destroy your pride, friends, Dory declared, his voice echoing around them, as if proving the sincerity of their words. You must have faith in what we say, Brogy told them. Go straight, no matter what happens, keep going straight, understand? Yeah, got it, Luffy cried out, no matter what happens, just go straight. They sailed past them both, with them bidding their final farewells, but soon Nami yelled out in terror to see something enormous rise out of the sea. The water rising up and some of them screamed when it was revealed to be an enormous goldfish, greater than even some sea kings. Hello Island Eater, declared Dory's voice from behind them. You will open the path, yelled Brogy, in the name of Elbaf, you will open it. Nami screamed at them to turn, but Usopp and Luffy both refused, saying that they just had to keep going straight. When she couldn't calm down, Luffy just told her to calm down as he threw the last cracker at her. Nami kept screaming at him to chance course, but Zoro leaning back against the door telling her to just give it up. Sanji, Vivi, and Nami continued to try to change his mind, but onwards they went. The last thing that they saw before they were swallowed was the two giants holding their weapons high. Just go straight, Usopp screamed, but he sounded close to tears, go straight. What does it matter? Nami hollered at him, it was so dark that they couldn't see anything in front of them, we've already been eaten here. Straight, you hear? Luffy yelled from the front, just keep going straight. You'll see, Usopp called from the front, impatiently looking around, waiting, but before they were able to ask any more there was a shockwave behind them and they were shot forward as the entire goldfish was ripped apart so that they were sent flying out into the open sky. The giants' battle cries behind them. It was just like how Luffy arrived with Sanji and Yosaku to Arlong Park as they were soaring high, across the bright blue sky and warm sun. We're flying, Luffy screamed out. Straw Hats were smiling in amazement as Vivi and Karoo cowered in terror. Don't bother looking back, cause we're going straight ahead. Look at us, it's so incredible. Usopp was crying with awe. They cut, the sea, itself, the strength of, the Elbaf warriors, is amazing. The Mary hit the water, and by this point the island was almost out of their sight, but they could still just make out the voices of the giants behind them yelling out one last thing to them. Friends, go, good luck. Usopp declared to the others that he will go to Elbaf someday, to one day see the village of warriors. Luffy and Usopp were both singing and dancing on the Mary's railing about the giants of Elbaf with Karoo running in circles behind them. Nami leaned up against the mast, looking a little red in the face. Finally, the duo slipped and almost fell off the railing, but it didn't faze them, they were still laughing the whole time. Sanji was inside making some snacks while Zoro was lifting a set of weights that were even bigger than he was. His ankles were heavily bandaged. All in all, it was a pretty normal day. Soon, Sanji came out with a whole platter of sweets for the girls before snipping at the boys that there was more food inside when they began drooling over the plate. They went climbing up the stairs like a group of monkeys and they followed them to see them tearing into the food like pigs at a trough. Disgusting, Sanji hissed as he came in and began working on the dishes. He always said that he would beat some manners into them, but it seemed that no matter what he did, it just wasn't good enough to get through those thick skulls. They all stopped what they were doing though, because Vivi was suddenly shouting at them from outside, and her voice sounded close to panicking. Hey everyone, come quick. The men went to the door to see what the matter was. Luffy called to Vivi, with a mouthful of food. What's wrong, Vivi? Are you okay? Nami has an awful fever. Vivi shouted. Sanji knocked Usopp and Luffy out of his way and screamed in terror. What, Nami's sick? Nami was lying on the deck and breathing hard, as if it hurt to take a single breath. Her face was a bright red and already she was starting to break out in a cold sweat. Vivi had the boys carefully bring Nami down below deck, after giving Zoro the eternal pose, and they did what they could to try and help. The best that they could do was to make her a little more comfortable as her fever continued to rise. Sanji was crying his eyes out, looking heartbroken, while Vivi wet a town in a bowl of water. It's most likely the climate, Vivi said as she laid the cloth across Nami's forehead. It's quite normal. See, sailors in the Grand Line aren't used to the change in weather and can become quite ill. There are countless stories of tough, notorious pirates who suddenly died. Vivi explained to the others that because of the changing climates, a person's immune system was ravaged by colds and fevers until they just couldn't take it anymore. And she also warned that even the slightest cold could be deadly if they weren't careful. As Sanji cried out in despair, Vivi quickly asked if there was anyone on board who knew anything about medicine. Wordlessly, Luffy and Usopp both pointed to Nami and that was when everyone knew that they were in worse shape than they first thought. Vivi looked anxiously as she smoothed out Nami's blankets. Well, when you're sick eating lots of meat always helps, right Sanji? Luffy suddenly asked their cook. Sanji sniffled a little as he looked to Luffy and answered him. Meat is protein and that does give the body energy to operate properly. I can cook some food to give her energy, but there's no guarantee that it'll cure her. I'm not a doctor. He looked to Nami sadly and went on in a forlorn way. Besides, if my cooking made that big a difference, she'd never get sick. I put 100 times more care in preparing her meals than I do for you losers. He finished. I feed Nami fresh meats and vegetables to ensure balanced diet. Anything that's rotten or moldy, he pointed to them, goes to you. Jerk, Usopp exclaimed, slapping his hand. Luffy proclaimed that Sanji's food still tasted good to him. My point, as long as I'm this ship's cook, nobody's going to feed Nami better in terms of nutrition, Sanji said firmly. I can do anything in the kitchen, still, I do know that there are specific foods for different kinds of illnesses. But I can't make that call, she needs to be diagnosed by a doctor who'll tell us how to help her. Just feed her everything that we got, Luffy suggested. Sanji was just telling him that she was too sick to eat as Vivi checked her temperature and gasped out that she had a fever of 104. There's bound to be doctors and nurses in Alabasta that can help, right? Usopp asked anxiously as Vivi leaned back on her knees. How much longer till we get there, Vivi? Vivi thought it all over, trying to think of a way out of this mess as she confessed. I don't know, at least a week, and that's too long. She's sick, maybe we're overreacting? Luffy asked the other two. I don't know, I've never been sick, Usopp and Sanji answered together, tilting their heads in confusion. Just what are you people? Vivi screamed at them wildly. This is serious, she shouldn't have such a high fever unless her body's fighting an infection. This is bad. Whichever's wrong, it's possibly life-threatening. Those words put the entire room into an uproar as the three men freaked out. You mean Nami's gonna die? Luffy screamed in horror, while Sanji broke down sobbing and Usopp running around in circles in panic. Your screams aren't helping, Vivi yelled. We have to find a doctor to help Nami before she dies. Luffy screamed loudly, his words almost being drowned out by Sanji's sobs. Okay, everyone just calm down, Vivi commanded, you're only going to make her feel worse. But then a weak voice spoke up. It was so quiet that it was hardly heard over the noise, but it was enough to calm everyone as they looked to Nami. Listen, she whispered, and she slowly sat up, I'm fine. Nami, Vivi asked worriedly. Oh, she's cured, Luffy cheered happily before Usopp hit him over the head and screamed at him to shut up. Nami, however, was breathing hard as she pushed the cloth away and told Vivi to look in her desk for a newspaper. Once she found it, it turned out that their situation was worse than they ever thought. Apparently, 300,000 of Alabasta's Imperial soldiers had defected and joined the rebel army so that now the rebels outnumber the soldiers and the tide has changed. But the worst bit of news was that Nami confessed that she had been hiding the paper from them for the last 3 days. Hearing that devastated Vivi so that she fell to her knees, looking ready to cry. I'm sorry I didn't say something earlier, Nami told her softly. We can't change our speed so I didn't want to worry you. There's nothing anyone can do right now. She looked to Luffy and asked, you understand, Luffy? Luffy looked like he was trying to figure out a really hard math problem before he said, things are bad and they're beyond our control? That sunk in better than I hoped, Nami said with a smile like a teacher who was just given the right answer from a difficult student. But Usopp was insisting that they take her to a doctor, which Nami dismissed, stating that no one has a temperature that high and that she probably had a little heat stroke. She got out of bed, but it was clear to them that it seemed to take a lot of effort as she got up, merely stating that she appreciated their concern but that they still had to get to Alabasta as she walked up the stairs with some effort. There was a long silence in the room as they watched her go. Wow, she recovered fast? Luffy asked in confusion. No, Usopp hissed at him, she's faking. Vivi, meanwhile, was still on her knees and staring at the paper. Now that this conflict has escalated, even more blood will be shed throughout the kingdom. We're at war, she whispered tearfully as she looked at it. If I don't put a stop to this insanity, the entire kingdom of Alabasta will be doomed. Crocodile will move in and seize control. She crumpled the paper and cried out desperately, you're trying to get me home safely, but there's no time. I need to get home as quickly as possible. If I don't make it back in time, 1 million innocent citizens will give their lives needlessly. There are 1 million people there, Luffy gasped. Wow. What a horrible burden you have to carry. I'm sorry, Sanji said to her sympathetically, as she cried. Just then they heard Zoro's voice from outside yelling at them to hurry up and get on deck. Sanji began telling Zoro off for the orders, but Zoro replied that they were to shut up because Nami told them to chance course. For those who weren't here, they couldn't understand why because the weather was perfect. The wind, Nami said, without looking at them. They looked confused as she went on. There's a powerful wind, and it's heading right this way. She turned, but Luffy was there, checking her forehead for a fever. Luffy hollered in pain because her fever was so hot that it hurt his hand. He began giving her orders to get back to bed while they found a doctor for her. Instead, she got angry, and began yelling at them all that she was just fine. But they were all giving her worried looks, none of them, not even Luffy, buying that for a minute. Even Sanji was actually backing Luffy up, trying to convince her to just go lie down, but she finally lost her temper and screamed at them until they got the message. But their attention was drawn back to the scene as Vivi came charging out of the door and begging them to listen. They looked up as she called, I have to ask you all a favor. As a passenger on your ship, it's not my place to ask this, but I have no choice. My homeland is in jeopardy of being destroyed, so I would really appreciate it if we could move even faster. Every minute that I'm out here puts more of my people in danger of losing their lives. We need to head to Alabasta at full speed. The men were all looking at her with hard expressions. Of course we will, Nami said agreeably, just like we promised. Vivi smiled and suggested that they hurry up and find a doctor. After all, the only way they could move top speed was to get Nami healthy as soon as possible. Right, Luffy called out, smiling in approval. No one makes this ship move like Nami. Everyone agreed and Nami thanked her as she tried to walk over to her. She apologized, just before she fainted. Luffy then screamed, what the heck is that? They looked to see what he was talking about. Usopp screamed as well. Not too far away, an enormous cyclone had appeared out of nowhere, one so big and large that it towered over them as large as the giants on Little Garden. The lightning flashed and the wind was so strong that even though they were far enough away not to have to worry about getting sucked in, the Mary was tossed around like a toy in a bathtub. It's a cyclone, Vivi screamed. It's huge, yelled Luffy, hanging onto the mast. The Straw Hats yelled at how close a call that was, as the storm was exactly where they were originally headed. If they hadn't changed course when they did, they'd be dead right about now. The lightning got harsher and they hung on as Luffy yelled that they barely missed it before he yelled that they were to find Nami a doctor no matter what, and that was when it all faded. After clearing the storm, the first thing they saw was of a gentle snowfall around them. Usopp, Zoro, and Luffy were all on deck, the first two wrapped in tight blankets. See any doctors yet? Luffy yelled up to Zoro. Luffy, you can't be serious, Usopp whispered to him as Zoro called down what they thought about people standing on water. Luffy and Usopp asked what he meant. Instead of an answer, he told them to look ahead and they all did. And it was just as he said. A man was standing on the water directly in front of them. For standing there was a tall man with wavy lips and a sad expression. He looked a great deal like a jester with his green-blue costume. Luffy asked Usopp if he thought that he was a doctor, causing a massive case of the face palms. The man began talking about how chilly the weather was to the Straw Hats. Suddenly, the water underneath the man rose up suddenly. A wave so big that it almost overturned the Mary. With that, a large round ship had rose up beneath them like a submarine would. It had large steel plating around the ship, with a star-like pattern. Two large gears are seen towards the side of the ship in the form of a giant hippo wearing a crown as its bow. There were hundreds of men on board and the pirate flag held a skull with a tongue out and a crown on its head. The men jumped on board the Mary and threatened to shoot as they held the 3 men at gunpoint, though only Usopp looked scared. Just then 2 more men showed up with the jester guy they saw a moment ago. The first was a man wearing a long orange cloak, with gloves that cover all fingers but his thumb, and resemble an afro each. He also had a large black afro on his head, and 3 small ones on his beard. A heavy, overweight man with dark violet and a cylinder-shaped jaw made up of tin plates, was standing there as he enjoyed a large slab of meat on the end of a knife. He was dressed in tin plate armor and a hooded cape that made this guy look a bit like a hippo. The fat man, who the crew members called Wapple, stood on the Mary, watching the whole thing with a bored expression, as if he could think of a million places he'd rather be, as he watched them all. Just then, the cabin door shot open and Sanji came running out, demanding to know what was going on. Sanji saw that they had guests, but rather than be concerned, he casually lit a match for his cigarette before he asked again coolly, "So, what's going on here?" Luffy looked up. "Well, we're under attack, and it's still snowing." "Well yeah," Sanji stated patiently as he looked to the guns with mild interest. "The guns pointed at my face kinda gave it away. What's next?" Wapple continued to chew a chunk of meat off his knife. "You all consider yourself a band of pirates?" he asked. "That's amusing. I only count 4 of y'all." He then bit down on the blade, breaking it with his teeth. The straw hats all cringed as he chewed up the knife and swallowed the whole thing like it was a cracker. Wapple finished up the knife and added, "So strange that your group would have so few members." "K, that's just weird," Luffy said as they all stared at him. "What kind of guy likes to eat knives?" "And that's a lot coming from someone who eats almost anything he can catch," Sanji added, looking at him. "Alright," Wapple said, still chewing, "I'll keep this simple. See, my men here and I wish to travel to Drum Kingdom. You wouldn't happen to have an eternal pose or a log pose, would ya?" Sanji told him a straight no that they never even heard of Drum. Luffy then told Wapple to leave because they were in a hurry. Though Wapple merely shrugged, not at all surprised that they didn't have anything, but he didn't seem upset. Instead, he said that he would settle for their treasure and their ship. And to their amazement, his jaw spread wide enough as he went and bit down on the ship's side. "He's a ship-eating monster," Usopp yelled terrified as he pulled off a huge chunk of wood and began swallowing it. "Hey, our ship isn't your lunch," Luffy yelled out, and the men all pointed their guns at them, warning him to stay quiet. Luffy, of course, took them both out. As the men all prepared to fire, the monster trio all went out of control, taking out all the guards with no effort at all. The whole time, Wapple was eating the side of the ship. Luffy came charging over, just as Wapple clamped his mouth down on him, swallowing him whole. But the man's mouth was suddenly wrenched open wide, revealing Luffy in the form of an elephant. The Pachyderm's large body being too large for even the mouthman's jaws allowed Luffy to easily escape. With an annoyed huff, Luffy turned around and raised one of his back legs for a kick. Just before he attacked, Vivi came out this time, demanding to know what was going on, but arrived in time to see Luffy send him flying, screaming out for him to just leave. The men were all staring with their jaws open as they watched Wapple become a star in the sky. Freaking out, they all climbed back onto the ship and immediately went off to try and save him. "This is far from over," the jester, whose name was Chess, yelled, pointing a finger at them. "You'll pay, I promise you'll pay." A few days later, the crew was back in Nami's room. Nami's faces was a bright red and she seemed to be struggling for breath as she tried to breathe. Luffy and Zoro were there keeping a close watch on her when suddenly they could hear Sanji's voice calling out from above deck, "Island dead ahead." Luffy looked up, looking thrilled. "Are you serious?" he cried happily, before he looked to Nami. "Oh, an island. We found an island. Hey Nami, did you hear that? This means we can get you a real doctor. He'll fix you up." He then chanted that she should wake up, but Zoro told him to go up and that he'll watch her. Luffy didn't need to be told twice as he almost went skipping up to the deck. It was an island covered completely with white snow with several tall mountains that looked like tall cylinders covered with ice and snow, almost like drums. The tops of them were completely flat and they towered over everything on the island, casting shadows across the landscape. Luffy began to scream excitedly as he ran up to jump onto the Mary's head and was yelling at the others. "There it is, Nami's saved." It was at this point that he noticed white powder falling from the sky. "Alright, it's snow," Luffy yelled with stars in his eyes, "an island of snow." "Whoa, Luffy, wait. Just so that there's no misunderstanding between us," Sanji called loudly. "We're stopping to find Nami a doctor. We're not here to have an adventure, are we clear?" But Luffy wasn't even listening as he went on to say how much he loved snow, and Sanji rolled his eyes, knowing that there wasn't any point going on when he got like this. "Hold on," Usopp asked, shivering from the freezing weather. "You sure this is a good idea? There could be snow monsters. Besides, we don't even know if there's people there or not." "Oh no," he gasped his hand over his heart. "I'm having a relapse of my don't go to the island disease." "Snow, it's so white, it's beautiful," Luffy continued to say dreamily as he looked at the sparkling snow while Sanji just shook his head at them. Luffy looked ready to jump off the ship once they neared the shore and heading inland along a river. Sanji was staring up at the mountains in wonder. "Look at the mountains," he said. "They're unlike anything I've ever seen." But then Usopp was asking Luffy if he was cold dressed like that, and he looked back in confusion, as if wondering what he was talking about. "It's 10 degrees below zero," Vivi added. "That's when bears get ready to hibernate." Luffy was silent for a moment, as if this thought was being processed and then, "It's cold," he cried out, shivering where he sat, and both Sanji and Usopp yelled at him, "You just figured that out." The small ship continued onwards, deeper into the island. The snow shone so brightly that it was almost painful to look at. So far they hadn't seen anyone else, but there was the lingering feeling of being watched. Soon, Vivi had spotted what seemed like a good place to anchor as Zoro called to them all, "'Kay guys, Dr. Search. Who wants in? Guess we gotta find people here first." Luffy, who was now wearing a coat that added protection to the layer of fur he now had raised over most of his body, raised his hand. "I'm in." "Me too," Sanji exclaimed. "Fine, go have fun," Usopp yelled in the background. But then someone yelled out, "That's far enough, pirate." At the voice, their heads jerked up to see that they had been surrounded on all sides on the cliffs, by several dozen people at least. Though they looked like ordinary citizens, they were all armed and looked ready to fight. "People, Well, that was easy, Luffy said, not sounding concerned. Usopp looked around nervously and informed Luffy that they didn't look friendly. Suddenly, a man stepped forward. He was a large and rather imposing man, with slick black hair and a slight goatee. He was dressed in a long white fur-lined green tunic and armor plates on his arms, with an extra-large spade in a sheath hanging on his back, and the way that the people all gathered around him, it was clear that he was the leader. I'll only say this once. Your kind is not welcome here. Leave immediately, the man, who the Straw Hats heard was named Dalton, called. We only came here to find a doctor, Luffy yelled. We have someone who's sick, Vivi yelled pleadingly. You'll have to do better than that. We won't fall for that old trick, someone shouted. This is our island, another person yelled, holding up his gun. We won't let any filthy pirates land here. Soon everyone screamed for them to leave or else they'll blow them out of the water. That's great. We barely said hello, and they already hate us, Sanji said cheerily. Get out of here, a person yelled at him as he shot near his feet, startling them all. Big mistake, Sanji growled, looking ready to fight as Vivi moved to stop him from acting recklessly, but in the end, that same man lost his head as he fired again. This time he struck Vivi in the shoulder. Vivi, Luffy screamed. He turned towards the shooter, completely enraged. Why you? They all held up their weapons, looking ready to fire on them all. Luffy looked ready to take them all out, but then Vivi got up and stopped him by his waist, holding him back, even as the blood rushed down her arm. Stop it, Vivi pleaded. Fighting is not going to help anything. Luffy glared at Vivi as she tried to tell him that she was alright, that it was only a graze. She then lowered her head to the deck and cried out, as you wish, we will not dock here. But please, will you summon a doctor? Our friend is suffering with a severe illness. Please help her, I beg you. Luffy looked dumbfounded. Vivi, you don't deserve to be captain, Vivi stated harshly without lifting her head. We can't get into a fight here. Luffy's expression was void of all emotions as he merely looked at her as she continued to beg for help. Think about Nami. What will happen to her? Vivi asked him. Luffy looked back to the townspeople and seemed to come to a difficult conclusion. Yeah, right, I'm sorry about that, he said softly. He fell to his knees next to Vivi and bowed his head just like she did, his hat flying off as he also asked for help that they bring a doctor. The townspeople merely looked on for a few agonizing seconds before Dalton said, I'll show you to our village. They all looked up at him as he turned, follow me. See, just ask politely, Vivi said in a know-it-all voice before they got ready to depart. They soon found themselves in a small, but warm house. There was a roaring fire going in the fireplace while Luffy, Usopp, Sanji, and Vivi were all gathered around Nami's bed with Dalton there and he even passed them a few warm drinks. Dalton then started to speak to them as he pointed to the window. Those mountains out there are known as the Drum Rockies. Look closely, do you see the castle on top of the tallest one, the one in the middle? Barely making out the structure, Usopp questioned Dalton about the castle. That castle has lost its king, Dalton explained. Yeah, I see it up there, Sanji said as he looked as well, but Vivi was asking what was so important about the castle. That castle is where this land's only doctor lives, Dalton informed them. Dr. Korea. She's the one who the people here call a witch. What? Sanji cried out. Of all places, why does she live on top of the mountain? We need to call her here right now. Nami needs her help. I'm sorry, but I'm afraid there's no way to contact her, Dalton answered, and he truly sounded sorry here. Sanji growled in frustration. You can't be serious. What kind of doctor is she? Dalton explained that her medical skills are actually impressive but that she was also nearly 140 years old. 140? Sanji repeated. No wonder she doesn't get around much. Dalton just explained that she likes pickled plums as Vivi asked what the people here do if they get sick or injured. She comes down from the mountain whenever she feels like it, Dalton explained. She looks around for patients, treats them, and before she leaves, she takes whatever she wants from their houses as payment. She doesn't sound like a very nice lady, Usopp said. It kinda sounds like she's a pirate, Luffy added. But how is a woman as old as she is capable of getting down that mountain? Vivi asked, not understanding something like that. Dalton seemed to think it over for a moment before he confessed. It's an odd rumor around here, but several of the villagers have claimed to have seen her at night riding a sleigh of some kind through the sky. They see her silhouette when the moon is out. That's the reason she is thought to be a witch. There are others who say they've seen her with a strange creature, a creature none of them recognize, Dalton added, and Usopp seemed to freak out about snow monsters. Dr. Korea is the only doctor we have, but she's still a woman I would prefer to stay away from, Dalton warned. All we can do is wait for the next time she decides to come down the mountain. Vivi and Sanji were both exclaiming that they couldn't wait that long, but Luffy got up from the floor and went over to Nami as he began to gently slap her face, trying to wake her up. Hey Nami, wake up now, Luffy asked. Luffy, you idiot, what are you doing to her? The other three yelled at him, but Nami slowly opened her eyes and she looked over at him. Hey, look, she's awake, Luffy exclaimed to them before he looked back to her and explained, here's the thing. The only way to see the doctor is to climb the mountain. So, we're gonna have to climb a mountain. Nami's face turned to one of great surprise while Sanji shouted out, are you crazy? What about Nami? How do you intend to get her up? Easy, she'll ride on my back, Luffy answered. That's only going to make her even more sick, Vivi yelled at him angrily. What's the problem? I thought we needed to hurry, Luffy said, not understanding what the problem was. We do, but you'll never make it up there, Vivi yelled, pointing out the window at the mountain. Look at how steep and tall that thing is. I can do it, Luffy said confidently. Maybe you can, but climbing that thing will be way too hard on Nami, Sanji exclaimed. Yeah, but look, even if we fall or something we'll land in snow, Luffy said indifferently. That doesn't matter. A fall like that will kill even a healthy person, Vivi yelled out, and acting like that ended the matter. Even Usopp was backing them up, arguing that Nami's fever was too serious and that she's almost dying. Let him do it. The voice had come from Nami started to groan in bed, and like before, the entire room fell silent as they looked over at her. I need to get over this thing, and quickly. We need to hurry, for Vivi. Still breathing hard, she pulled her hand out from under the covers and held it up as she forced a smile. Come on, Captain. Let's go. The other three stared at them, dumbfounded. Even Dalton was looking at her in surprise. Luffy grinned back at her and gave her a high five that reminded them when Arlong Park fell and she had given back the straw hat, even back to when they first met and she agreed to join up with him for a while. That's what I'm talking about. Leave it to me, he promised as they got ready to leave for a dangerous journey, again. Soon they were all standing outside Dalton's house. Luffy was carrying Nami on his back as he took the form of a mountain goat as Vivi was tying a cloth around them to help make sure she stayed on. While Dalton was surprised at the boy's transformation, he easily accepted it as he explained that he was a Zoan fruit user himself, having the Oxox fruit model, Bison.
Sanji sighed a little as he watched them. How he wished that he had offered to carry Nami Swan up like this. He was sure that he would have made the journey a lot more comfortable for her than that animal-brained captain.
You know you're in no shape for a trip like this, Nami, he told her, but she was already sleeping like a baby. Are you sure you'll be okay? Vivi asked worriedly. It'll take you hours to get there. Luffy didn't answer that as he looked to Dalton and asked for some meat for the road and he looked at him in bewilderment. Sanji declared that he would go with them to make sure that they got up there in one piece as Usopp warned Luffy that he couldn't fall, not even once, or Nami will die. Vivi finished tying Nami on and told them that she would stay behind because she would only slow them down. Usopp nodded in agreement as Luffy told Nami to hang on tight and they looked ready to start running. I guess you're set on going, Dalton said. I'm not going to try and stop you, but I will ask that you climb up from the other side. That way you can avoid the Lapons on this side. They're fierce carnivorous rabbits. You run into a pack of them, you're as good as dead. Luffy was reassuring him that they'll be fine as he looked to Sanji, who agreed firmly. You can't be serious, Dalton said loudly. Do you know how easily those things can kill you? Nah, we'll be alright, Luffy said confidently as he took off, calling back to Sanji, now hurry it up Sanji before Nami dies. The blonde cook looked annoyed, yelling after him, don't say things like that you idiot, you wanna jinx us? And so they took off. It was already starting to snow with the wind picking up quickly so that it was difficult to see anything in front of them. But they could still see the main mountain in front of them as they made a straight beeline for that, leaving nothing but deep imprints in the snow behind them. 1. Interesting fact. Rats can contort and flatten their bodies to fit in most spaces, allowing them to go into places like houses easily. Luffy momentarily forgot this fact in his anger and frustration, but thanks to having the sense knocked back into him he was able to remember this and easily squeeze out of the mountain. Also, gave you all something original to read, yay. 2. I mentioned this in the first chapter. I believe that Luffy can understand animals while using his animal or hybrid forms. He can't do it when he's mostly human though, because unlike Chopper he wasn't born an animal and has to rely on his devil fruit's power to understand them. 3. I'm pretty sure you all saw this coming after the ending of last chapter, but yes, Luffy now has dinosaur animal forms. You may proceed to thank me. 4. I would personally like phonics for the though and input they put into their review. That being said, however, I kept it with Nami being sick for several reasons. Luffy would most likely be able to brush off the sickness like he does most anything. Luffy could possibly turn into an animal with a stronger immune system to fight the sickness, and while Luffy's powers might make the trip up the mountain slightly easier for him, please keep in mind that he's carrying a dangerously sick person who can't handle much at this point. I hope you continue to enjoy my writings. Chapter 13 Sanji in a mountain ram form. Luffy with an unconscious Nami strapped to his back kept up their march towards the drum-shaped mountain. Luffy suddenly called out, it feels like it's gotten a little colder, the wind's picking up too. Sanji rolled his eyes, as if fighting back to urge to tell him, no duh. Luffy, trying to pass the time, decided to spark up a conversation with his chef. He talked to Sanji about how people in countries of snow never sleep at all. Sanji looked to him. Huh, why? Cause if they do they'll freeze to death, Luffy said as if it was a little known fact. Sanji thought that over before he cried out, don't be an idiot, everyone has to sleep sometime. It's the truth, someone told me a long time ago, Luffy insisted. Just then, a strange white rabbit jumped them, attempting to bite Luffy. Luffy easily moved out of the way as the rabbit, which could only be one of the Lapons Dalton mentioned, missed and hit the snow behind them. Luffy didn't show any signs of even noticing that something just tried to attack him as he and Sanji went on with their discussion. Who? Usopp, Sanji said, who didn't react at all at the rabbit attacking them a second ago. No, I heard it at a pub in my village, Luffy explained. Sanji challenged Luffy's theory by asking why Dalton would have a bed in his house if he never slept. Luffy blinked, having never thought about that. I guess that's a good point, he admitted before his eyes widened as if he just figured out the answer. Hey, maybe it's for when he dies. As the Lapon continued to try and attack them, this time going after Sanji, probably thinking that he might have been an easier target. But Sanji easily dodged it without even bothering to stop running. It was really funny to watch after a while. The little guy kept trying to attack them, but they kept going onwards, still continuing their conversation without ever stopping. Sanji then began to ask Luffy about if he knew that women who lived in snowy countries all have skin as smooth as silk. How come? Luffy asked curiously, isn't it obvious? Sanji asked with a tone of irritation. He went on to explain that the women who live where it's cold have to rub their skin all the time to keep warm and that's why their skin was always soft, smooth, and so white that it was almost see-through. When Luffy asked why it was white, the whole time the Lapon continued to try and attack, though it never worked. But Sanji answered as if he was being dumb, because the snow, it's constantly falling all over them so it dyes their skin all white. Geez, you're really dumb, you know that? Luffy said. Sanji glared as he shouted out, give me a break, like you really want to talk, and to take his anger out, when the Lapon attacked again, Sanji kicked it far away from them, as if kicking a ball as it went flying. You're becoming a pain in my butt, he yelled and watched the rabbit disappear into the distance. Really, what's with that thing? Luffy asked as he watched it fly away, to which Sanji gave a non-concerned shrug. Onwards they went towards the mountain. For Sanji and Luffy the journey was becoming harder with each minute. The wind picked up and was trying to blow them backwards, the cold slowing them down as they reached even deeper snow. Even with Luffy's thick wool pelt, he started feeling the biting cold as Nami shivered on his back. Nami, just hang in there a little bit longer, Sanji said as he ran next to Luffy, and muttered more words of encouragement. We gonna get you to a doctor alright? The snow getting really deep around here, Luffy commented as they fought their way through the deep snow, and Sanji barking at him to try and run more smoothly because he was making it hard on Nami. But the two suddenly stopped and were staring in front of them at white snow. Luffy's animal instincts started going haywire while Sanji got a bad feeling that was honed thanks to his years of training. The whiteness in front of them suddenly moved and, for a moment, they thought they were looking at a herd of polar bears, but bears don't have long ears. It was hard to guess how many there were, but there had to be several dozen of them at least, large rabbits as big as bears, standing upright with arms like gorillas, pinkish red eyes looking at them and fangs bared. Sanji seemed completely taken aback as he stared at them. What are these things? Well, they're big and they're white, so they must be polar bears, decided Luffy, though for the life of him he couldn't figure out the overly long ears. Just then, the one in front jumped, his teeth showing as he attacked. Sanji screamed, "Look out!" Luffy jumped out of the way as the Lapon's attack broke the snow like stone. Serious, how can it move like that? Sanji asked in shock. Is it a gorilla? No, it's a polar bear, cried out Luffy. It's a rabbit, Sanji screamed suddenly. How do you go from a gorilla to rabbit? Luffy yelled back. These must be the Lapons that Dalton was telling us about. Sanji suddenly spoke as they looked back at them, and he was clearly trying to think of a way out of this. Well, there sure are a lot of them. Just then, Nami groaned a little on Luffy's back and everyone turned their attention to her. They couldn't tell if she was aware of what was going on, or if she was dreaming now as she whimpered a little in her sleep, obviously in a lot of pain. Nami, Luffy suddenly asked, and she looked up as even past Sanji was looking at them, ignoring the threat of the Lapons for the moment. Hurry, Allah, basta, Nami whispered, though it had been very difficult to make out the slur in her words. They didn't need to guess what she was trying to say. Luffy's eyes grew concerned as he whispered quietly to her, just rest, never mind that. We'll worry about that later. It wasn't clear if she could understand his words, but the gentleness in his voice seemed to soothe her because she did appear to fall back into a deep sleep when she pressed her face against his back. Sanji was also smiling at her. She's not even worried about her own life, he said softly as he looked back to the Lapons. Just hang in there a little longer, Nami. Let's get going. We have to make it to that castle where the doctor lives, quickly. He stepped forward and yelled out, "Move it, you stupid bunnies." The Lapon in the front took a step forward, clearly tired of waiting. They're coming, Luffy exclaimed. Yeah, Sanji agreed before he said very seriously so that there couldn't be room to argue. Listen Luffy, I don't want you fighting these guys, alright?
Luffy was about to argue against that, but in the end Sanji managed to convince Luffy to stand down and he nodded in understanding as he heaved her back onto his back when she slipped a little. Then, Luffy had one of his once-in-a-blue-moon brilliant ideas. He asked Sanji to momentarily hold Nami, which he eagerly did but still asked his captain what he was doing. Luffy went back to his human form, grinned, and said, I'm going to try and talk them into letting us pass.
With that, his hair turned white and went to cover his entire body. In a moment, Luffy took the form of a Lapon nearly identical to the ones in front of them minus the scar under his one eye. The giant rabbits in front of them seemed fairly surprised by the sudden change, but they held back for the moment to see what was going on. Luffy stepped forward and started making grunting and growling noises to the other Laffins. One, obviously the leader by its stance and the crescent scar by its one eye, stepped forward and growled back. This went on for about a minute before Luffy turned back to his human form, calmly took Nami from Sanji's hands, tied her back to his back, took a deep breath, and yelled, "Run!" The Lapons finally attacked, all of them at once, and Luffy had to dodge every blow that was sent his way. What the heck did they say, Luffy? Sanji screamed as he kicked one of the Laffins away from the group. That smaller rabbit you kicked earlier, apparently that was the Alpha's kid, and they're not gonna stop until they either pay us back or eat us, Luffy shouted out. Sanji paled. Oh crap. Though large for their size, they were all remarkably light on their feet and acrobatic, not to mention this was their territory, their home island. They clearly had a big advantage not just in numbers but on terrain as well. Remember not to fight, Luffy, Sanji reminded the straw hat wearing boy. Luffy yelled, that's a little difficult. Luffy continued to escape around the Lapons, trying to be as gentle as possible with Nami as Sanji kicked every Lapon that got too close. However, it didn't seem to be doing much damage for they kept throwing themselves at them. Sanji cursed. He explained to Luffy that he couldn't get his footing well enough in the snow to land a good kick. Each one of the Lapon's ears twitched a little in. They're attacking all at once. Luffy screamed as the sky was filled with the monster rabbits, and Sanji screamed for him to head to the trees as he covered him. Luffy gently placed Nami on his back, turned back into his mountain goat form as he turned and ran, heading right to the cover of the foliage, the wind blowing off his hat at the same time. It was a bit of a shock when he didn't turn back for it, but here, Nami really was the first priority. Thankfully, Sanji had managed to grab it as he ran after him, with the rabbits still after them. The rabbits were easily able to catch up to them, even able to cut them off more than once. They charged out at every direction and it was impossible to tell where they would come from next. Once they had reached the trees, however, the rabbits only kept watch, not able to move as easily with all the tree trunks in the way. Go left, Sanji ordered, pointing straight to a high cliff. The only chance they had to get away here, we'll head to the mountains. Okay, Luffy said, and they turned together as Sanji went on about how to shake them off. The biggest problem was when they looked through the trees, they could see that they were keeping up with them, ready to strike when they escaped the cover of woods. Another rabbit appeared and tried to strike at Luffy, who dodged it, and he looked like he was about to attack back, but Sanji stepped in. Once he took it out, he began to tell Luffy off for attacking as he tried to keep Nami from slipping again. Luffy apologized as Sanji put the straw hat back on Luffy's head. This is no time to be screwing around, he said as they ran, getting nearer to the cliff, but that meant running out from the trees and they were surrounded again. Sanji was forced to stay behind fighting them off as Luffy reached the ledge, screaming that they could go up from there. Right, go on, Sanji yelled as another Lapon tried to attack him, but Luffy used him as a stepping stone to jump up safely to the ledge, with Sanji right behind them. The two were looking down at the whole herd of them, and Luffy just had to stick his tongue out at them childishly, which led them all to jump at once. Did you really have to taunt them? Sanji demanded. Sorry, Luffy cried out as the cook ordered them to just make a wild run for the top of the mountain. They kept going for what felt like hours, and they only stopped when Luffy and Sanji when they had to catch their breath, but when they looked back, it was a shock to see that the rabbits had disappeared. They coming? Luffy asked. No, it doesn't look like it, Sanji called behind him, looking back and forth, trying to make sure that there wasn't anything there. Alright, I guess we lost them, Luffy said with a smile. Sanji disagreed, pointing in front of them to see that they were back. In front of them, the whole herd was there, much farther away than they had been when they first ran into them. How'd they get there so quickly? They don't give up, Luffy exclaimed loudly just before the entire herd suddenly started to jump up and down in place. Why are they jumping up and down? Luffy asked, his instincts causing his fur to stand on end. Still, he tried to remain optimistic. Maybe they're grouchy cause they're hungry? Sanji went as white as the snow around them. Wait a second, don't tell me, oh no, he gasped as his eyes widened in realization. He was so shocked that he dropped his cigarette, looking ready to cry. Those stupid bunnies, great, they've done it now, this isn't good. Wait, what are you talking about? Luffy asked, looking back at him, and what are the bunnies doing? Sanji was telling Luffy that they had to run, and as he said that, he was actually backing up a few steps. We're running again, Luffy repeated in confusion, where to? Anywhere, as long as it's far away, Sanji screamed, completely losing any cool that he had. That was when they could hear a deep rumble going through the snow beneath their feet, as if there was another giant walking around. Just then, the whole ground was trembling, almost like there was an earthquake happening. The thick snow above them slowly began to slide off the mountain, and before anyone knew it, a giant wall of white appeared and was heading straight for them as big as an ocean wave during a grand line storm. Because there's about to be an avalanche, Sanji shouted as Luffy screamed and they ran for it. Without looking back, Luffy quickly did the same and they ran back down the mountain as the endless waves of snow continued to chase after them. As fast as they were, however, they couldn't outrun this. Those stupid overgrown bunnies, I'm gonna kill them, Sanji screamed. Luffy screamed out in panic to Sanji as to how they were supposed to escape all the snow. No clue, Sanji screamed over the roar that was quickly catching up. All I know is that our first priority is Nami, our second priority is Nami and our third priority is Nami. Got that, Luffy? Protect her even if it kills you. I got it, but how'd I do that? Luffy screamed as the avalanche pulled trees up and they became part of the mess that was still hurtling towards them. A light bulb went off in Luffy's head and he asked if it would be a good idea to turn into a bird and fly them all to safety, but Sanji gave a negative as it would both take time to lift off that they didn't have, and there was no telling what the rough mountain winds would be like for turbulence. They kept running as fast as they could before Sanji spied a high ledge just ahead of them and he screamed to head for it. Why? Luffy yelled back. Just run, we need to get up as high as we possibly can, Sanji yelled back in reply. His expression showed that he didn't understand, but he followed Sanji to the cliff anyway just with the snow was at their heels, and as they continued on they jumped just as the avalanche finally caught up. But it was far from over. Sanji was just starting to say that they made it in time, but then more snow came tumbling down. This time there was nothing they could do as it washed over their heads. The two froze in fear as they stared at it, and suddenly the force of the avalanche knocked them right off their feet and were sent flying in the air. Suddenly they were all suddenly sliding down the avalanche with all the wreckage from the nearby trees. Luffy was up in the air, spinning a little as he looked around desperately for a way out of this, Nami still sleeping like a baby on his back. But just as it looked like Luffy had run out of luck, he turned in the air and managed to land onto one of the tree trunks, now sledding down the mountain like a toboggan. Luffy was looking around for Sanji and he spotted the cook ahead of him, quickly being buried alive in front of them. Sanji, Luffy screamed in worry as he stretched out his horns for him, grab on. Sanji pulled out of the snow and pulled onto the tree behind Luffy and Nami. Thanks for that, Luffy, he panted. Luffy noticed they were going back the way they came as he yelled that they were just going to keep going down the mountain unless they did something. Sanji was furious. No way, he yelled out at once as he looked back at the quickly shrinking mountain behind them. I'm never gonna let that happen. We've come all this way and we were almost at the base of the mountain, just feet away from the doctor. He glared back at Luffy and yelled, Luffy, you need to come up with a way to stop all this right now. But Luffy looked completely lost as Sanji continued to rant. It's all because of those stupid bunnies, he declared. Next time I see them, I'm going to turn them into a big bowl of stew. As if they heard the threat, the Lapons appeared out of nowhere and looked ready for round 2. They could only look on in amazement to see that the overgrown rabbits were riding tree trunks like snowboards. Luff didn't notice them right away and was muttering about rabbit stew and how good that sounded. The battle went on against the duo and the Lapons. Unlike before, however, the two couldn't run anywhere but down on the makeshift sled. They were completely surrounded on all sides and the bunnies just kept jumping up with perfect teamwork. It was only going to be a matter of time before they hit their target and do some real damage. What do we do? Luffy yelled frantically, already running out of room where to go. The only thing we can do at the moment, slide faster, Sanji yelled as he pushed their tree to go faster. What is their problem, getting all this worked up over one little brat? Sanji yelled as they were ruthlessly attacked and they were forced to jump a little on the tree to avoid the attacks. Seriously, he yelled, unsure as to how much longer they could keep this up, but things just went from bad to worse when they looked down the mountain and could see that directly in their path was a giant rock with several broken and jagged tree trunks, and they were heading right for it. With the bunnies on either side of them they couldn't maneuver to avoid this incoming impact. The two on the tree spotted it as well and they were screaming about what to do. You can't crash into that thing, Sanji yelled as the Lapons started their attack again. You're the one in charge of keeping Nami safe right now. That's easy for you to say, Luffy screamed, the rabbits determined to make the kill here. Just as Luffy declared that they were going to crash, Sanji did something truly selfless this time. At the last second, he grabbed hold of Luffy by the back of his jacket and threw him right off the tree. Ladies get treated gently, were the last words he cried out, a satisfied smile on his face as he made his last request. So you take care of her. Sanji, Luffy yelled in horror as he crashed. With a horrible crunching sound, Sanji hit the rock and, as limp as a rag doll, he was thrown right off with several other Lapons and the debris of some trees. Almost as if in slow motion, Sanji's body fell from the air and hit the snow, being buried a second time. Luffy screamed out, horrified at what just happened before he transformed back into his human form in order to grab hold of the same miniature cliff that almost killed them. Dangling on as the rush of snow rushed all around them, he looked back, seeing that Sanji was already mostly buried, and he screamed out his name. But Sanji never answered, and it was either because he was out cold or too hurt to do so. What were you thinking? Next time you do something like that, warn me, Luffy screamed as a long monkey's tail burst from his spine and wrapped around Sanji's hand, but this time Sanji was pulled away too fast and hard for Luffy to pull him back. All he was able to say was a single mitten, and Luffy freaked out. Sanji! Luffy yelled in desperation. His voice echoed around them as he screamed out, Zoan JJJJJJI. After the avalanche subsided, the landscape was different. There was snow covering everything, much more than before. You could still make out the shape of the avalanche surrounding them. Instead of even level of snow, there were large packs of it like miniature hills and large, broken trees scattered every few feet. It was as silent as a grave around them. Luffy was still hanging from the cliff. Apparently it had been just high enough to have protected him and Nami from the current of snow. He appeared to be unharmed, but he was shaking as he stared around him, trying to figure out what he should do. He pulled himself up to the ledge, quickly untying Nami from his back and gently laying her down beside him.
He was breathing hard as he looked up, trying to get some kind of glimpse of Sanji, but nothing. He looked from the landscape to Nami and back again before he seemed to have made up his mind. He pulled off his coat and covered her like a blanket, and even pulled off his mittens to serve as a pillow for her head. She wasn't looking good at all. Her face was as red as a tomato, and it was clear that her fever was reaching dire levels by this point.
Nami, I'm sure you're cold, Luffy said to her softly, though he wasn't sure she could even hear him. Just hang in there a little longer. Luffy took off his hat and placed it on her chest, finishing up by saying, listen, hold on to this for me and I'll be right back, okay? Convinced that she would be alright by herself for a moment, he turned and dove off the ledge, as he started to look around for Sanji. When he landed, he took the form of a black-furred Saint Bernard and started sniffing around at the snow. Luffy was running across the snow, sinking deep every few feet before he was able to pull himself back up and continue searching. Every time he called out for Sanji's name, it seemed to become more desperate as he picked up his pace and began to run. Onwards he went before the snow that he stepped let out a soft groan beneath his feet. Luffy stopped dead as he looked back and he got down on his knees as he began to dig. Luffy's paws worked frantically as he continued to dig down deeper and deeper. Finally he spotted the dark coat that Sanji had been wearing. Luffy let out a cry of shock and dug more desperately. Soon, Luffy had been able to pull him out and lay him on the snow with his muzzle. The chef was a mess. There was a blue tint to his face as he struggled for breath, and he was completely out of it, but miraculously alive. Luffy sighed in relief as he went back to human form and tried to shake him awake, but realized that there was blood on his hands when he touched Sanji's chest. Not enough to worry about him bleeding to death right away, but even Luffy could tell that he needed a doctor just as badly as Nami did. Sanji, are you okay? Luffy screamed out, but he might have just been talking to the snow for all the good it did. Realizing that Sanji wasn't going to answer him anytime soon, Luffy got back up, carefully dragging him with him up the snowy slope to where Nami was waiting for them. Luffy lay Sanji down before he turned Nami over and heaved her onto his back again, letting her keep his coat, but he left his mittens there. Luffy's body seemed to stretch and grow as translucent, nearly white-colored fur. In the form of a polar bear, Luffy snorted as he picked up Sanji like a sack of flour under his arm and began the long hike back up the mountain. Luffy wasn't moving as fast as he had been before with the added weight and cold hanging around him. Even with his enhanced strength, the bear boy knew not to apply too much force or to go too fast, lest his precious cargo wind up worse than before. He went through all this freezing cold on his own, but suddenly he spotted something digging in the snow up ahead. It was the baby rabbit that caused the whole mess. The little rabbit was digging desperately in the snow where he saw that it was trying to dig out a gigantic paw with claws, which could only be its parent. Luffy was slowly making his way towards the little baby, still trying to dig around the clawed paw. As Luffy looked closer, there was some pink in the snow and the little baby's own paws looked frozen. He was sucking on them in pain as he cried out, still trying to help free its parent, though at this rate it wasn't making much progress on its own. But it didn't give up as it kept going, and they knew that it probably would have kept going even if it destroyed his paws. As Luffy's crunching footsteps drew nearer, it heard him and stopped to glare back at him. It turned around, shielding its parent's giant paw with its own body, growling at him not to come any closer. Luffy came right up to the baby Lapon and stared down at him, his expression unreadable as the little guy snarled, trying to scare him into just leaving. His eyes shadowed over so that they couldn't be seen. With his other arm, he slowly reached down towards them. The little baby covered his head and closed his eyes, clearly thinking that he was going to hurt him, but instead, Luffy reached over to grab the large Lapon by its paw, and with a great pull, managed to pull it out of the snow. The full-grown Lapon seemed to be dazed and confused, but was still alive as the little baby cried out and hugged the massive, furry stomach, burying its face in the warm fur. Luffy heaved Nami up higher on his back and continued on his way, both crewmates lying limp as dolls. Luffy was speaking again as they got closer to the mountain. I'll get you there, don't worry, you just stay alive, both of you. They walked on for about 15 more minutes and nothing happened, but that soon changed. There was the sounds of something crunching through the snow behind them and a familiar voice yelling out smugly, found you. Wapol was running towards them on the back of giant hippo-like animal with long hair with his two flunkies. Luffy turned as well just as Wapol went riding right up to him and stopped so that he was blocking his way. Now I'll make you pay, you straw hats, Wapol cried out. Wapol declared that he was going to chew Luffy up into little pieces and spit him out. While he wasn't sure if the bear holding the two people was in fact that boy who sent him flying earlier, he recognized the blonde man from the ship as well as the hat placed firmly on the bear's head. Move it, Luffy said simply. Huh, I don't think so, Wapol said smugly. Why would I want to do that? Luffy must have known that he couldn't afford to waste any more time here as Wapol declared that he had no intention of making it easy for them to get away from here after what he did to him. But to add insult to injury, Luffy just turned and walked around him as if he wasn't worth the trouble of fighting and continued upwards. Hey, Wapol yelled. Wapol began yelling at Chest to write down a new law in a giant book. that anyone who ignores the king will be executed, and he ordered the two flunkies to kill Nami and Sanji since they were ignoring him the most. Luffy immediately turned around in shock. What did he say? The two jumped high in the air and were giving chase. I got the woman on his back, Chess cried out. I'll take the man with the afros, whose name was Kuromarimo, declared as they jumped, several sharp spikes coming out of the afro on his fist. Luffy immediately moved back, making sure that he was able to get Sanji out of harm's way before he made to attack. Suddenly, Luffy stopped. His eyes looked to Nami and Sanji and gritted his teeth as he started to run, narrowly missing the arrows that Chess shot. Can't fight, Luffy cursed as he made a run for it. You're gonna regret this later, Luffy yelled to the three of them, don't follow me. There were several more arrows heading for him. They would have struck Nami in the back, but at the last second, Luffy actually did a backflip, narrowly missing them as he kept running as soon as his feet hit the ground. It was quite impressive, given Luffy's 9-foot-tall frame and 500-pound bulk, but let it never be said that Luffy was ordinary no matter what form he's in. Luffy kept running as fast as he could, despite everything. He ran on for some time, eventually losing sight of Wapol and his men far behind him. Luffy looked back for a moment and he couldn't see anyone either. Huh? There's no one. That's weird. Did they already give up? He asked himself in confusion. Suddenly, Wapol's giant mouth appeared through the sleet in front of him. Luffy looked back to avoid it at the last second. He missed being eaten by jumping up high into the air as the rest of Wapol stepped out of the snow, but he was smiling as the two henchmen appeared as well from just above them. Here's what a snow bottle's really like, Kuromarimo yelled, white concealment. Those two are so incredibly weak that just one shot should be enough, Chess said, his wavy lips turning into a slight smile. But this time Luffy couldn't move in midair like this and he screamed out as they moved in. Just as all hope seemed lost, several white blurs jumped up from behind them and knocked the two lackeys away like cats batting balls of yarn away. Lapons, Wapol cried out in disbelief. The two flunkies were wondering the same thing. Kuromarimo just demanded, did those things just protect him? That's impossible, Chess cried out. Lapons never form bonds with humans, they're nothing but wild beasts. Luffy landed farther in front of them as the two rabbits stood between him and Wapol, one of them looking back at him with a baby hanging onto its back and a jagged scar over one of its eyes. Luffy stared at it and it stared back. I know you, Luffy whispered quietly, looking at them. The two just continued looking back at Luffy. This time there was a calmness in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Just then, they both pumped their arms out. Luffy smiled as well as he cried out, thanks a bunch, you guys saved me, and without another word he turned and continued to run as the Lapons turned back to face Wapol and his men. The journey got harder as the blizzard quickly got worse. Luffy was soon struggling to take a single step forward. It was like every step forward he took, the wind blew him back 2 steps. It didn't take too long for it to become so that he couldn't even see in front of them. The snow was now up past his knees, and even as a bear he was feeling cold by this point. He was shivering as he forced his freezing body to keep going forward, his face now almost as red as Nami's under his fur, and he was gritting his teeth together to keep them from chattering. Luffy kept walking. He kept chanting one word under his breath as he fought against the powerful wind like a spell. Doctor, doctor, doctor. Luffy was now forced to move, had hardly more than a crawl by this point. He contemplated turning into a penguin to just ride the snow on his belly, which he cursed the fact he didn't think of it during the avalanche, but realized it was too risky with 2 sick, injured people, and also there wasn't a sharp enough decline to gain momentum. But at long last, after what felt like a lifetime, he finally came to a solid, white wall directly in front of them. It took him a minute to realize what it was as he looked up and couldn't even see the top. They finally made it to the base of the mountain. Luffy stared up at it, as if he couldn't believe that he got here. Luffy looked around, clearly hoping for some kind of way up. There's a doctor up there, Luffy said to himself, and he seemed to be preparing himself for something unpleasant. He took another look at his two friends before he said, alright Nami and Sanji, just a little farther to go, hang on a little longer. The captain retied Nami extra tight on his back, shifted back into his human form, and picked up Sanji by his teeth. His body then took on the shape of a monkey and, it could only mean one thing. Luffy found several grooves in the mountain and tested his weight. Luffy had pulled himself up the ground and very slowly was making his way up the impossibly tall mountain. How he was able to climb like this was anyone's guess, but he was definitely making progress as the ground soon disappeared from sight from the snowstorm around them. Every second the wind got harsher and the temperature seemed to drop. There was so much snow that it was a miracle that Luffy could see more than a foot in front of him. Yet despite all this, Luffy kept going with surprisingly gentle moves, as to not make it any harder for his friends than was necessary. When he looked back down at the ground to see it disappear in the blizzard, there was a powerful resolution shining in his eyes. He was going to climb this mountain and reach the top no matter what it took. Luffy would stop every few feet to catch his breath or to search for more grooves in the mountain for him to grab hold of before he was able to pull himself up even farther. Time seemed slow down around them as quickly as Luffy was freezing. His body was turning a dark red color under his much thinner fur and blood was dripping down his arms as his fingers and toes were cut like they were digging themselves into shards of glass. And fate seemed to laugh at him as an extra strong gust of wind came out of nowhere and blew his red coat right off Nami's back and fluttered away from them like the very last leaf in autumn being blown off the tree. The scariest moment was when Luffy stretched his hand out to grab hold of the next groove. His hand ended up slipping in his nails, that had already frozen, cracked. Luffy screamed. However, when he did open his mouth to shriek, he ended up accidentally dropped Sanji, who fell lifelessly. Luffy looked down, horrified that he had dropped him. San NJG, he screamed at the top of his lungs and he stretched his tail down like a snake and hooked on Sanji's coat, causing Sanji to bounce up and down a few times like a yo-yo. That was a close one, Luffy muttered as he carefully brought Sanji back up before he kept going, blood now rushing down his arm from his injured hand. It only became even more painful to watch as Luffy's visible bright red skin slowly started to turn red to blue to a very sick-looking purple. Luffy stopped, his chest breathing hard through gritted teeth, trying to get as much air as he could before he kept going. His hands were now starting to go to a very pale color, though it was hard to tell with all the warm blood that froze on his arms and shaking limbs. Luffy continued to heave himself up several feet, but the rock he grabbed onto broke and he slid down the mountain. Luffy dug his hands and feet into the mountain. The already sensitive skin was being torn to shreds and left 4 long trails of blood on the mountains. Luffy slowed down and eventually stopped. He was shaking as he hung onto the side of the stone, biting down on Sanji's coat as he seemed to be fighting the urge to scream again, his unshed tears freezing like icicles on his face. He must have slid down a good 40 or 50 feet, yet he began again, still climbing up as if nothing happened once he got his bearings. No matter how cold it was, no matter how much pain he was in, he wasn't not giving up, he would not let go. It could have been hours or even days before the top of the mountain finally came into their sights. These last few feet were clearly the most painful for him and he slowed down considerably, now struggling to move. He was either so cold that he couldn't move his limbs properly, or was in so much pain that it was too much for him to do so, most likely both. But he kept going, using what was left of his inner strength to climb. His eyes were glassy and dazed by this point and it seemed as if he was fighting hard to stay awake. Finally, Luffy's hand reached the top. His whole body was shaking so badly that it was a wonder that he was able to hold on to anything as he heaved his sick body up and over. Only when he was up did he open his mouth and let Sanji fall into the soft snow beneath them as he slowly looked up and stared in front of him. They looked up and there was a beautiful castle that shone in the light and seemed to twinkle as if it was made of ice itself. Luffy finally spoke. His voice was so hoarse that it almost didn't sound like his. "We're here," but even as he said it, everything around them seemed to blur and fade until he fell face forward in the snow, blacking out. His body went back to his human state and his exhaustion and the cold hit him tenfold. He could vaguely recall hearing the sounds of snow crunching around them as the memory faded and they were back in the warm night air, but he vaguely saw 2 figures. One was carefully turning Sanji over and opening his coat so that he could get a look at his chest, which was bruised and bleeding. The other figure was an elderly woman. Despite her aged face and thick sunglasses, from the neck down, her body appeared to be very young and she was dressed in a flowered print shirt that showed off her middle and her navel ring as well as a purple hipster pants. Luffy could only watch as she lay aside her bottle of alcohol as she examined the 3 of them. She spoke, her voice sounding aged but also a hint of a witch's cackle was there. "He climbed this mountain with his bare hands? That's almost 3 miles of sheer rock to go up." Luffy was shivering on the ground as she looked down at him and added, "His entire body is on the brink of frostbite. What was he thinking dressing like that for such a climb? Draw some hot water and throw him into it." The other figure, who curiously looked like a small bipedal reindeer with a large pink top hat, continued to look at Sanji's injuries and declared, "This guy's bleeding a whole lot. He's got 6 broke ribs, and a spinal fissure. Can I operate on him, Doctorine?" The woman, who could only be Dr. Kureha, gently lifted Nami up to get a good look at her. When she frowned, they could tell that Nami was in serious trouble. It was confirmed as she said, "Apparently the most critical of our 3 patients is this girl. This one's dying." Dr. Kureha turned to the other and started listing a list of things to get for her. He looked back up at her and asked, "She has an infection?" "Yes," she confirmed, looking back at Nami and finishing, "and the infection isn't from anywhere on this island." Suddenly, Luffy's bloody hand shot out and grabbed hold of Dr. Kureha's arm. The 2 looked at him in surprise, clearly having thought that he was out. Luffy slowly turned his face towards them, trying to form words, but his teeth were chattering together so much that it only came out as short pants and garbled words. But Dr. Kureha seemed to understand as she said in a slightly gentle tone, "Don't worry, boy. I'll make the bleeding boy and the sick girl better. You can rest easy, alright?" Luffy still seemed to want to say something as he continued a choking sound. His vision grew darker with every second, but Luffy took one last deep breath and finally forced himself to say something, so cold that he stuttered. "Those T2 or MIF friends okay?" Dr. Kureha observed him as a smile pulled at her withered mouth. "I figured that, kid. I'll save them so don't worry," she said before she turned towards the other figure. "Chopper, let's begin treatment." That was when Luffy seemed to be at peace with the thought that they were in good hands, and he let his hand fall. He was out before it even hit the ground. When he awoke, he was in a room filled with a mixture of objects and books. Judging from the stone walls, they guessed that they were inside the castle. There were 2 beds and both Luffy and Sanji were sleeping in them. Both of them were covered in bandages. Most of Luffy's body, as well as Sanji's chest, were both heavily wrapped up as the reindeer, named Chopper, lay a bowl of blood-stained wrappings on a small table next to Luffy's bed before he looked over at him. He cautiously approached the bed, as if getting ready to back away should something happen. He was looking over Luffy with a critical eye, but not as if he was trying to detect the source of a medical problem, but as if he was trying to figure something else. Just then, Luffy's eyes opened and the fuzzy room slowly started to clear and Luffy croaked out, "Hungry, so hungry." He turned his glassy eyes next to him to see Chopper there. "Need meat," Luffy said, and a groan and drool was starting to form from his mouth, his teeth taking on a fang-like quality. Chopper backed away from him, knocking a tray of tools to the floor before he backed into Sanji's bed. That was when Sanji began to speak, almost as if he was in the middle of a dream. Venison stew should be shimmered in a large pot for 3 hours until all the meat becomes tender. Chopper slowly looked over and Sanji was finally waking up, a vindictive smile curling on his lips as the little reindeer backed away, shaking with fear. Luffy sat up in bed, his eyes never leaving Chopper as he croaked, "Meat."
Sanji then grabbed Chopper's arm. "Venison," he declared as Chopper screamed and backed even farther away as drool was cascading down Luffy's mouth and he finally screamed out loudly as the 2 jumped from their beds and threw themselves at him.
"Somebody help me," he screamed at the top of his lungs as he bolted. Luffy and Sanji were on each side of him like a couple of kids fighting over a toy. Luffy shouted for Chopper to stop running as he tried to chew down on Chopper's arm with Sanji screaming to wait so that he could cook him up first. They ran around the room before breaking through the door. Suddenly they were in the next room with Dr. Kureha and Nami sitting up in a bed, finally awake. Though her eyes were still glazed over and her face was still red, she looked a lot better than she had been before. Luffy noticed that she was sitting up, and all thoughts of trying to eat Chopper had been driven from his mind at the moment. Sanji skipped over to Nami's bedside as well. Luffy cried out happily that she looked like she was all better. "Getting there, thanks," Nami answered, her voice still sounding a little weak, but she gave them both a smile. "Right," Sanji decided, clapping one of his arms, one tasty venison dish for Nami coming right up. They then looked behind them to see Chopper was trying to sneak out the door without them noticing. The moment that he felt their eyes on him, he froze for a moment before the two screamed out, "Come back!" Naturally, Chopper turned and ran on ahead with the Straw Hats behind him. Onwards they went. Luffy and Sanji were able to catch up to him and were now attempting to stop him, Luffy actually chewing on one of Chopper's antlers. Mentally, Luffy cursed that he lacked the strength to simply become a wolf or another predator and take the strange deer down right then and there, but beggars can't be choosers. Sanji kept telling Luffy not to eat him until he cooked him up. But then Chopper finally had enough of fighting them off and grew big by changing his form, which actually looked more like a gorilla crossed with a reindeer, but looked almost human. The two sure didn't see that coming as he screamed out, "I am not food for you, okay?" And he gave them both a hard punch, sending them straight into the floor and things blacked out there as their heads cracked the stone beneath them. Later, they were back in the room with Nami sleeping in the bed, and the two were finishing up some food as Dr. Kureha watched them. Luffy stood up and slammed his hands on the table as he said loudly, "You should be one of my crew, please, old lady. We really need to have a doctor on board." Dr. Kureha raised a single finger up to silence Luffy as she asked, "Luffy, you did tell me that was your name, right?" "Yeah," he said slowly. "And did you just call me old lady?" she asked, as if making sure she heard her hearing was working correctly. "Yeah, right," he answered bluntly, "that's what I said, old lady." With a loud cracking sound, Dr. Kureha kicked him so hard that he went flying across the room and slammed into the wall, leaving deep cracks in it as she yelled out, "If I were you I'd be a little more careful of what I say." Dr. Kureha smirked as she leaned back in her chair and said, "I'm still within my youthful 130s, thank you." "Geez, you're a tough old hag," Sanji said, and she answered him by slamming him face first into the wall and he slid painfully down it. "Are you boys really asking me to become a pirate?" Dr. Kureha said. "That would be an incredible waste of my precious time. Besides, I have no interest in life on the sea." Luffy dragged himself back to the table and when he got back up on his feet, they could see blood dripping down from his nose and from between some teeth. "Those are all lame excuses, it's about adventure, old woman." "Well, this one's a slow learner," she said. "Didn't I just tell you to watch what you say?" It was then that Chopper was noticed standing in the doorway, and as soon as they saw him, Sanji and Luffy's jaws dropped hungrily as Chopper's fell open in fear, literally hitting the floor. Soon they were chasing him around the castle again with Chopper screaming the whole way. However, as the two kept chasing Chopper, Dr. Kureha eventually put an end to it when she showed up with a pair of swords and charged at them. They completely forgotten about being hungry as they screamed and ran from her. "Scary hag," they screamed. Chopper was out in front as the duo ran right behind him as Kureha gave chase. This went on for a while, but the two eventually lost Kureha in the chase, but then the two were standing in a large room, most likely like the entrance hall of the castle. It was covered with snow everywhere. Icicles were hanging from the roof. Even the doorknobs on all the doors were frozen shut as the wind was blowing so hard that you would swear that you were outside. Sanji also asked why the castle was freezing. Luffy looked at him blankly for a few seconds, as if trying to process what he said before he hugged his shivering body, saying that he was freezing. "Not the sharpest knife in the drawer, are y'all, Luffy?" Sanji demanded as they came to the railing to get a good look at the whole place. But before they could really get to observe everything, Dr. Kureha appeared once again. She swung from out of nowhere with many sorted weapons on her back, everything from swords and knives to spears and maces. Luffy and Sanji didn't waste any time and ran for their lives as she threw them all at them. "Come back here just a moment, boys," she screamed as they dodged the weapons, an axe almost beheading Luffy as she screamed for them to stop. "You should rethink this idea of asking the old hag to join our crew," Sanji screamed at Luffy as more items went flying by. A real doctor doesn't chase her patients around a freaky snow-filled castle trying to kill them. Finally, it looked like they had been able to shake off the mad doctor as they headed to a large wooden doorway that was left wide open. Sanji pointed out the door to Luffy and they went over to it, both of them hugging their bodies as they tried to keep warm and headed over to shut it. "Hey," called a familiar voice from overhead them and they looked up to see Chopper standing on the balcony on the floor above them. "Stop it, don't touch that door, get away." Sanji and Luffy both looked up at him in surprise. "Never mind him, let's close it," Sanji told Luffy and they moved back to the door, "or we're gonna freeze to death." "That's a good point," Luffy agreed, but that only made the Chopper furious. "Stop," he screamed out, "didn't you hear what I said?" And when he shifted into his human, gorilla, reindeer, thing form, he ripped off part of the railing as he screamed out, "Get back." Luffy freaked out and had to jump back to avoid getting hit with shrapnel. "What is with this guy?" he screamed out in shock. "What the heck is he so angry about?" Chopper panted angrily at them, practically acting like an angry bull as he glared down at them. Suddenly, Sanji told Luffy to come over as he stared up at the door. Luffy looked up to see what Sanji was looking at and they saw a nest of baby birds chirping loudly on the top of the door. Sanji said to Luffy, "It's a bunch of baby snowbirds. See, if we close the door, they'd fall." "So, that's the reason they're leaving it open," Luffy said in wonder. They stood there for a moment staring at the nest happily before they remembered that it was cold and went running back in to get out of the wind. While they had been distracted by the birds, they hadn't noticed that Chopper had already left. But then Luffy paused for a moment. "Hold up a sec," he said quietly. "Yeah?" Sanji asked from behind him and making him jump. "That weird reindeer guy, wasn't he speaking earlier?" Luffy asked him slowly as Sanji's eyes widened at that as he realized that he was right. "Now that you mentioned it, I remember seeing him walking on two legs too," the cook said. They stood there frozen for a moment before they screamed out, "He's a monster." After a second, Sanji realized the irony the direction this conversation was going and whacked his captain over the head with a kick. "Idiot, like you're in any position to call someone else a monster. You freaky walking zoo," he admonished Luffy. Rubbing the lump on his head, Luffy seemed to ponder this for a moment before bopping a fist into his other hand and saying, You're right." He then gained a wide smile with his mind still on Chopper. "What a cool guy, I bet he's really interesting." Luffy suddenly screamed out eagerly, "Hey wait, I know, he should join us." This leads to Luffy looking around the castle, clearly looking for Chopper, and when he went bursting through random rooms, calling out for the monster. He kept grinning the whole time until he finally found him after about 5 minutes of searching. Chopper, who had been looking through a microscope, was startled so much that he accidentally sent some of the equipment flying off. Panicking, him jumped up and caught them all. In the end he was forced to stand on one leg, while his arms, leg, and even his antlers were balancing the test tubes and bottles. It was such a way that one wrong move would cause him to fall and everything would break. Whoa, amazing. Luffy said impressed. You're a cool monster. Suddenly a wicked grin came over his face as he came forward, but what happens when I do this? And he did an evil thing by starting to tickle him. Chopper almost fell as he yelled at Luffy to stop it, but Luffy kept tickling him as the reindeer fought hard to keep himself from laughing. Luffy had no such problems and was laughing loudly, tears in his eyes. That's funny. That seemed to make Chopper angry as he yelled out, shut up, get out of here. But Luffy grinned as he came almost face to face with him. Come on, let's you and me be friends, please. I really do like you, you know? Chopper's limbs were shaking worse than ever as he stared at him, his expression holding nothing but shock as he croaked out, you like me? Luffy nodded to what Chopper said and added, you'd make a great pirate. Chopper put most of the equipment down and backed away from him, holding onto a vial full of purple liquid. Did you slip and hit your head on the ice or something? He demanded hotly. I don't want to be a pirate or your friend, see? Luffy came forward, telling him that he had to become his friend and that his crew would love him. Chopper just turned and ran. Hey, wait, Luffy yelled as he gave chase. Why would I want to be friends with you? Are you making fun of me? Chopper yelled back, almost childishly as he ran down some stairs, slipping and bouncing down the rest of the way. He was forced to catch the vial with his feet as Luffy laughed when he saw how he landed on his head. I think you're the funniest guy the first no, oh yeah, we're gonna be great friends, Luffy decided firmly as Chopper put the vial down. However, the reindeer was able to escape, which led to some sort of storage with Luffy still calling out for the reindeer to come out. But he was distracted when he saw the plate of food there and he would naturally put his search on hold until he ate. I love being a pirate, he said happily to himself as he swallowed the apples. Chopper stuck his antlered head out from behind a large crate as he watched Luffy swallow the entire plate of food. Hey, he said called cautiously, looking ready to run at first notice, why you're really a pirate? Luffy looked back to him. Well, yeah, of course I am, he said before he swallowed and went on about all the awesome things the pirates did, and he definitely got Chopper's interest. As he started talking about adventures and everything they went through, Chopper was like a child being told an amazing bedtime story. And when he was done, Luffy asked, so will y'all join us? Chopper was looking deeply tempted by the offer but seemed to snap out of it as he looked over his shoulder. Ah, sure, he said carefully, but first, why don't you come this way first? Really? Luffy asked eagerly. What? Chopper led Luffy to a random room with bars on a little window and locked the door behind him. Hey, Luffy yelled, shaking the bars, what's the big idea? Now you can't pester me, Chopper declared as Luffy glared down at him with a heavy frown. I just want you to join us, he pouted like a little kid who had been told to go to his room for being bad. That's exactly what I mean by pestering, Chopper yelled and Luffy began to whine for him to keep joining. Shut up, now you stay right there, he finally called, holding up the key for Luffy to see. You were injured too, you know, so just settle down. As he turned, he didn't notice Luffy stretching his hand, now in the form of a sloth's paw, out to grab the key. As Chopper walked away, he noticed that the key was gone and his face turned a little blue as Luffy opened the door, a grin there as he held it up. Get away from me, Chopper yelled out as he ran once again and Luffy was right after him, telling him to come back. Luffy continued running, calling for him to stop running, and to everyone's surprise, Chopper did stop so that Luffy slid and crashed into the wall. But Chopper didn't pay any attention to that as he stood there, shaking and his eyes wide. That sent, he said, anger in his face. Luffy looked up from the hole he made in the wall and Chopper only said one word, wobble. With that, Chopper bolted once more but with much more urgency than earlier. In fact, he was so fast that Luffy couldn't even keep up with him while in his human form. Luffy sighed at losing sight of the cool monster again before his face light up as his head took on the form of a bloodhound. Sniffing the frigid air, Luffy easily caught Chopper's scent and went running after it. Soon he was standing outside the castle. Chopper and Doctorine were facing down Wapol and his two flunkies on either side of him, and even that strange hippo that Wapol rode on was right behind them. This castle is no longer yours, Wapol. It saw enough corrupting and misery during her reign. Leave, Doctorine yelled, not showing the slightest bit of fear as she stared him down. Not just here, the country too. Drum Kingdom has already died out, moron. Wait, yelled a voice behind them and looked back to see that Luffy had come running out of the front doors, his eyes burning fiercely. This guy is mine. Luffy ran past them all, straight at Wapol, who looked stunned at his appearance before Luffy slammed his fist right into his face, sending him flying. Everyone was gaping at him, even Doctorine and Chopper, their jaws wide open. However, Wapol's flunkies had grabbed hold of Wapol's feet and were holding onto him as he dangled from the edge. I'm really sick of you guys, you know that, Luffy said angrily as the wind continued to blow around them all. What's your problem? You were getting in our way before we even got to this island. The last time I ran into you guys I couldn't fight cause I had to protect my friends, Luffy continued, his eyes shadowed over again before he looked up, grinning wildly, but now, you guys are soon gonna get it. How dare you? Kuromorimo cried out in outrage, kneeling on Wapol's side. Do you know who you attacked? This ain't no lowly commoner. This is Wapol, the king and absolute ruler of Drum Kingdom. That's right, Chess yelled, also sounding outrage. Show some respect, he's this country's monarch. How dare you do such a thing to his most excellent of excellences, for shame. Who cares? He ticked me off again, Luffy yelled, pulling his cheeks out and sticking his tongue out at them. Dr. Kureha asked if Luffy had run into Wapol before, though it sounded like she already knew the answer. I sure have, Luffy yelled, looking at her. He's that annoying big-mouth pirate. What did he do? She asked, and he went into a rant about how he attacked him and his friends as well as ate part of their ship. He was yelling, stamping his feet in the snow and declared that he was going to take him out. But before he did, Sanji asked if he was cold without a coat. Luffy blinked as if he just realized something. Hey, Luffy yelled, looking back at Wapol and yelling out, did he say he was a king? But I thought he was a pirate. Took you long enough, Sanji yelled at him. It was so funny hearing them talk when their enemy was here that they all completely ignored Wapol when Luffy finally said that it was cold out here. You really are an idiot, Sanji said in annoyance. Quickly, Luffy bulked up into his polar bear form, much to the two doctors' shock, but they quickly got over it due to the more serious threat grabbing their attention. The two lackeys suddenly went to strike at Dr. Korea, but Chopper in his human form went to intercept them. This was a front, however, as Wapol suddenly appeared from behind the two with his mouth open wide. They all cried out in shock to see that Wapol was now chewing on Chopper like he was a stick of gum. Sanji screamed out, "Luffy, grab my leg from there." "Leg," called Luffy before he smiled, understanding what he wanted him to do. Sure, he quickly reached out paw and grabbed onto Sanji's outstretched leg, like this. "Yeah, just don't let go," Sanji yelled as he prepared to swing his leg. Sanji swung his leg out and sent Luffy flying towards Wapol. Spinning like a torpedo, Luffy hit Metal Mouth right in the stomach, and not only did this cause Wapol to spit Chopper back out, but he was hit so hard that when he flew back and knocked into his hippo it was sent, not just off the mountain, but flying into the sky. It flew farther and farther away until it was a little star in the distance and was gone. Chopper was thanking both of them for saving him, praising how amazing they were. Luffy merely nodded as he looked back to Wapol. Whoa, Big Mouth is still alive, but his hippo is heading towards the moon. Wapol grew furious that they had dared to attack him. "That's right, I'll show them the Munch Munch factory," he declared, and Luffy seemed impressed that he got back up to his feet. "Wow," he even said. He stood up. "Yeah, but how?" Sanji asked him, letting him go, and from the look of things decided to deal with Luffy later. "You hit him pretty hard." "Guess, he's tough," Luffy suggested. Wapol then turned to Chess and demanded that he remind him what he ate today and in the order. Chess pulled out a notebook and recited them all, which included 2 cannons, some cannonballs and gunpowder along with a cottage. "And you thought I ate a lot," Luffy said to Sanji. "You do," Sanji reminded him, "but this guy's a bigger pig than you." Wapol slowly began to transform. Wapol transformed into a house complete with doors, chimney, and windows included. He also transformed his arms into cannons and a large door in his stomach. But then, once he was an overgrown house, he turned and swallowed his 2 henchmen. "That's so mean," Luffy yelled. Wapol moved around awkwardly for a moment, as if doing some kind of dance, with steam coming out of the cannons and chimney on his head. But then the large door on Wapol's stomach opened up and stepped out a new creature. Now, they had been expected to see something like a horrible monster, but instead. So lame, Sanji deadpanned as the 2 morons seemed to just be piggybacking on each other, with only their outfits merged. Luffy, however, was staring at them with a freaked out expression. "Oh come on," Sanji groaned, wishing his Rock for Brains captain would stop getting excited over every little thing. As Luffy and Sanji stared at it, Dr. Ian suddenly started speaking, warning them that they shouldn't let their guards down. She explained that it was because of these 2 the citizens couldn't stand up to them and how the doctors were all exiled. Article 1 of the Drum Kingdom's constitution, those who don't do as the king wishes will be put to death. That's the number 1 law of this country, Wapol declared, pointing one of his cannon arms at them. He then yelled out that they broke that law and he was going to punish them for their crime, but he added that he was going to get rid of the Quack's flag on the top of his castle. They all looked to the tallest point of the castle and spotted it as well. Though it was hard to tell at this distance, it was a pirate flag with a skull and crossbones. However, what made this one special was that it also had cherry blossoms. Wapol held up his cannon arm and fired. "It's time to take that flag down." "No," Chopper gasped and stared up in horror as they watched. As if in slow motion, the cannonball struck the flag and exploded. As the smoke cleared, the waving flag leaned and started to fall, barely hanging on. Rage was building up in Chopper as Luffy also stared up at it. "Hey reindeer, that flag," he began, but he stopped as he looked at past Chopper's expression. A strange understanding seemed to cross Luffy's face as if he suddenly knew what the problem was. Chopper lost his temper completely as he turned with tears burning in his eyes and he ran at Wapol. "How dare you? You attacked Doctor's flag, you creep." Chopper ducked under Chess-Marimo's legs and shifted to his human form, or heavy point, as he jumped up to grab hold of Wapol by his face. But what got them all was the fact that he was crying. "Doctor, he tried to save even you," Chopper yelled in tears as he held up his fist, looking ready to attack him, but he froze, as if he couldn't bring himself to do so. Chopper choked out, I won't hurt you if you just leave this country forever." Dr. Korea started yelling at him, looking both angry and worried as she told him that he couldn't trust a word what he said. But as they argued, Luffy spread his arms out, turned them into wings, and was now rocketing up to the castle to grab hold of the falling flag. Chopper didn't notice any of this as he turned back to his mentor and stared out, but Doctor said. Wapol's worried face turned into a smug smile and pointed his cannon arm right in his face before he fired. "Chopper," Doctorine yelled out worriedly as Chopper slowly fell back, his eyes rolled into the back of his head, blood falling from his face and his fur burned. "Hey, Big Mouth," that got everyone's attention as they stared up. Luffy was standing on the top of the tower. He had ripped off one of his sleeves and used it to tie the flag back up. Wapol called up furiously at him, but Luffy wasn't fazed. "You guys weren't real pirates. You were just fake ones, weren't you?" He screamed back down at him angrily. "That's why you don't know what flying a pirate flag means. 'Cause you were just a bunch of fakes who didn't risk your lives." "What a pirate flag means, Straw Hat." Wapol began to laugh as if Luffy had asked the simplest question in the whole universe. "Don't make me laugh, flags have no meaning." Luffy glared down at Wapol and shouted out, "If you think that, you're dumber than you look." "Listen, pirate flags stand for something, Big Mouth," Luffy said, holding onto the pole of the flag as it blew in the strong wind. "They're not raised as some kind of joke." "Moron," Wapol yelled, clearly not caring about anything that he said. "The only joke is that I've let you live as long as I have. Since you dare put that flag back after I knocked it down, it's time I deliver the punchline." He raised his cannon arm once again and Chopper screamed for Luffy to look out. But even as Wapol fired and sent the cannonball flying at him, Luffy stood his ground and refused to move. "Do your worst, you can't break this flag," Luffy proclaimed just before the ball hit and there was an explosion. Wapol just laughed smugly, grinning cockily as he said, he was blown to pieces. When the smoke cleared, Luffy was still there, holding the flag high, not caring about the fact that he was burned black. Wapol stopped laughing and the spectators didn't blame him for that. I told you, you can't break it, Luffy yelled as he continued to hold the flag up. What? How'd he do that? That's impossible, Chimera cried out. I have no idea who this pirate flag originally belonged to, but it doesn't matter, Luffy declared, still holding the flag as he glared down at them all, ignoring what they said. A pirate flag is someone's pledge to risk their life. It's not something to laugh at. Even as they stared up at him, Luffy then screamed out at the top of his lungs, it stands for something that you jerks will never understand in a million years. Wapol and Chimera looked like they were being hit with a wave of power. Luffy's anger was so strong that they could all feel it. Before their eyes, they felt as if the entire animal kingdom was bearing down on them. It won't break, ever, Luffy shouted out, glaring fiercely down at them because the skull on it is a symbol of faith. He then turned to the other group. Hey, reindeer, Luffy suddenly shouted down at Chopper. I'm going to kick these guys' butts for showing your friend's flag disrespect, you in? Chopper blinked, startled before he asked, me, you idiot, Wapol yelled, getting his anger back. You just don't get it, do you? Alright then, since you feel so strongly about that flag, I'll destroy you along with it. He looked like he was about to fire once again, but Sanji was finally about to step in. I don't think so, Tubby, he shouted out, but just then there was a loud cracking sound and he screamed in pain, almost falling. Looks like your backbone gave out, Dr. Kureha informed Sanji from behind just as grabbed hold of his ribs in agony and she added, your condition will continue to worsen if you keep moving. So, stop, she screamed as she ran up and kicked him hard in the back, doctor's orders. Wapol however was laughing at seeing Sanji now screaming in pain as Dr. Kureha dug her heel into his back. If you two want to fight among yourselves, then please, by all means do so, but I hope you will at least watch your friend and that flag get blown to bits. He turned his attention back up at Luffy and started dishing out threats by the time that Chopper spoke up, stop it. That's the spirit, Luffy encouraged as slammed the flag back in its place, cheering Chopper on the whole way. Encouraged by that, Chopper went back to trying to attack Wapol, but he was blocked with Chimera jumped in the way and blocked Chopper's attack. Dr. Kureha watched, still having a foot on Sanji's back, would you look at that, that little furball has more courage than a full-grown man. I'm sorry, freak, but there is no way I'm going to let you lay a single paw on our king, they declared together. Chopper changed back into his usual form as Chimera looked him over. Wow, there really are some strange creatures in this world. You must be the Yeti the villagers hated and feared. They tried to kill you and chased you away, right? Chimera went on to try and mock Chopper, reminding him that he lived alone and that he was a monster that everyone wanted to kill, but he couldn't understand why he was trying to save this country and that had to be the stupidest thing that they ever heard of. Luffy watched the scene calmly as if he knew how this would all play out as he got ready to descend. Shut up, Chopper yelled at Chimera. Even if I don't have friends, I can still fight for something I believe in, and as long as the flag flies, I will. Hey, that's not true, Luffy's voice called and once again, they all looked up to him just as he jumped off the tower with grasshopper legs and went hurtling down at them. You do have friends, I'm your friend, reindeer, me. Chopper seemed too stunned to speak, his eyes wide in amazement as Luffy fell towards them. Wapol screamed in fear as he hit the ground and knocked him and his freaky fused henchmen right on their butts. Chopper screamed in worry for him, but when the snow cleared, he was kneeling in the snow, perfectly unharmed. You should be flat as a pancake, Chopper yelled in a stunned voice. Yeah, but I'm not, it'll take more than that to do me in anyway, 'cause I'm an animal man, Luffy explained, still grinning. Luffy pointing to the fused freak and asking the reindeer if he minded dealing with them. That one over there, Chopper repeated, glaring at Chimera, piece of cake. Good, while you're doing that, Luffy said, looking to Wapol, who had just gotten back to his feet with a loud clunking sound. I'll deal with this one. You dare to knock me, this country's monarch, over, Wapol demanded hotly as he glared down at Luffy. You'll pay for that insult. I'm taking you down, Chopper declared, facing down Chimera, who snapped back, is that so? You and what army? How you little freak? Freak, croaked out a feeble voice and saw that Sanji was trying to get up, but Doctorine was forcing him to stay still. That's like the pot calling the kettle black. Doctorine kept stepping on his back and making him scream in agony as she informed him that if he kept moving around, he could lose the ability to walk. And don't worry, she added, when push comes to shove, my little reindeer can hold his own.
Listen up, Chopper yelled, interrupting the fight. They looked back at him as he glared at Chimera. He took a deep breath and proclaimed with pride in his voice, my name's Tony Chopper. Not freak, it's a name the world's greatest doctor gave me. He was a wonderful man, and even if he forgave you for disrespecting his flag, I won't forgive you.
Luffy smirked at him and Chimera stepped forward, ready to fight. But then Chopper pulled out a small yellow ball that Chopper called a rumble ball. Chimera vowed that he was going to protect Wapol, and then engage a fight with Chopper. The reindeer then bit down on a rumble ball, and much to Chimera's surprise, he achieved more than his regular 3 transformations, and Chopper admitted that he has 7 different forms after taking the rumble ball. Luffy was so amazed that he started crying. Your friend, Doctorine said, noticing the tears and asked, what's the matter with him? There's just so much happiness of meeting a transforming reindeer that a guy can take, Sanji answered as Wapol appeared behind him, looking ticked off at how he was ignoring him. After witnessing him evading their attacks with jump point, and blocking them with guard point, and even destroying their hammers with arm point, Chopper used his brain point to locate Chimera's weak spot. After identifying his chin as the weak point, Chimera was easily defeated in 3 minutes. Sanji noticed a certain Lard Butt King was missing as he barked at Luffy where he went. When Luffy realized what he was talking about, he began to look around them wildly as Dr. Kureha said, well, since his hippo got knocked away, I doubt that he snuck off very far. Yeah, but how? When'd he go? Luffy demanded. Probably while you were drooling over those transformations, Sanji roared out. As they thought it over, they realized that there could only be one place that Wapol snuck off to. There's not much up here, just the castle, Sanji before his eyes widened and he shouted out, and Nami's all alone in there. Luffy went charging off with a loud battle cry, Sanji forced to crawl behind him, threatening to cut Wapol up into pieces and feed him to the sharks if he touched her. It didn't take them too long to find Old Metal Mouth, but when they did, they were startled at what they saw. Instead of the fat man they had seen before, he was now thin and slender. It was as if he lost all his weight in just a few minutes. He had Nami pinned to the floor and he was licking his lips as he opened his big mouth and declared, "Time to gobble you up, Straw Hat." Luffy's voice almost sang out from behind them as he cried out, "Found you," and he kicked out with a donkey leg, hitting Wapol in the face and sending him flying back and away from Nami. Nami was breathing hard as he came up to her, now just as confused as the rest of them to how he got so thin so quickly, but as soon as she caught her breath, she gave him a hard bonk on the head. Nami's face became dangerous as she asked in a forced calm that made his voice die in his throat, "So, do you mind telling what took you so long?" Luffy gulped nervously as he tried to explain why he let the corrupt monarch get as far as he did. Nami decided to forgive him, so long as he paid interest. "Hello," Wapol yelled out, getting their attention, "I'm still here." Luffy looked up at him in surprise and said, "Oh, that's right, I still need to kick your butt." Wapol was now standing in front of a door he declared was the room to the arsenal and that all he had to do was devour all of the weapons in there and he'd finish them all off. But as soon as he reached for the key, he noticed that it was gone and then he went running off with Luffy right on his heels. He chased after Wapol again to the upper levels and through the snow-filled castle. The upper levels were even colder than the lower ones, with snow up to their knees as Luffy went hunting around looking for Big Mouth. He finally found him in one of the towers, found with a giant Gatling gun with a hippo head decorating the cannon head that he was about to fire at him. Convinced that victory was finally his, Wapol pulled the lever, laughing as he did so. He froze, waiting to see what happened, but just as the cannon began to fire up, it suddenly died out. A little of steam snaked out into the cold air just seemed to add insult to injury as Wapol stared at it with a stupefied expression. Even as Wapol pulled the lever again and again, nothing happened as Luffy looked on, as if wondering if this was a joke or something, and they noticed why the gun wasn't working right. There was chirping going on inside the cannon's barrels and they spotted another family of snowbirds there, the mother and her chicks. Luffy smiled at the little birds before he began laughing at Wapol. "Stop it, how dare you laugh at me," Wapol yelled, sounding like a little kid who was being laughed at. Now embarrassed, Wapol resorted to yelling at the birds as they chirped at him. "Shut up, you dare mock me too, stupid bird, I'm the king of drum." Wapol opened his mouth to try and eat the mother bird. Thankfully, Luffy stopped him by transforming his lower body into a snake and using the powerful tail muscles to grab his mouth. "Yeah, so what?" he demanded, still grinning. "It doesn't matter if you're a king, or even if you're a god. It doesn't matter if you're someone who's great, or someone who's not so great." He grinned even wider, "I'm still going to kick your lousy butt." Wapol just chuckled darkly to himself, not caring if his mouth was being restrained as he said, "It does matter, Straw Hat, Drum Kingdom is a member of the world government. Don't you know what that means? It means this is a capital offense because I'm the king." Luffy only grinned even further as he stated, "Like I said, Big Mouth, it doesn't matter. King or no king, I'm taking you down." Wapol seemed to realize that Luffy wasn't bluffing here as he started to panic, but then he grinned evilly as he asked, "Oh really? Not if I kill take you down first." He then forced his mouth open, Luffy's tail stretching out to keep Wapol from trying to eat him like on the ship. "That won't work," Luffy laughed as Wapol tried to free himself. "But this will. Munch munch tongue cannon," Wapol shouted out, and he wasn't kidding around here. His tongue really did turn into an actual cannon and was pointing directly at Luffy's face. Startled, Luffy jumped back just as the blast went off. "That idiot," he let his guard down. Wapol laughed loudly, not noticing Luffy had appeared behind him and grabbed hold of his shoulders. "Well, looks who's talking," Luffy stated as he became a Lapon and Wapol screamed in terror when he realized that he wasn't dead. Jumping up, Luffy began to spin around rapidly. "Lapon seismic toss," Luffy shouted as he sent Wapol crashing right up to the ceiling and through the roof. Jumping out the window so he was outside, Luffy crawling up the tall turret that Wapol was trapped in. Luffy jumped up, right into Wapol's face and he screamed fearfully when he saw him, tears in his eyes as Luffy said, "I told you not to mess with that flag, now I'm finally gonna kick your butt." Luffy stretched his Lapon arms out, even as Wapol pleaded for mercy, giving him offers of status and even offering him to be vice king. Luffy had enough and sent him flying off with his new attack, Lapon Lariat, to the face. He was gone, far off into the distance and out of sight. After the short but satisfying victory, Luffy, the newly arrived Zoro and Usopp were all standing there, pulling themselves out of the snow. Apparently, Zoro stole a coat from one of Wapol's men and he thought that he was some of his guards and tried to attack them. Luffy began speaking about how impressed he was that they climbed up here, but Vivi, who just came up from some stairs, explained about the rope car before she asked how Nami and Sanji were. Once he reassured them that they were all right, a look of relief came over her face as Zoro asked him what he was doing on the top of the castle. "Beating the crap out of that king," he answered coolly as Dalton was heaving himself up the stairs and into the cold air. He looked a real mess. He was deathly pale, and blood was dripping from his mouth and as he held onto his chest, they could see more blood seeping through. "Oh, okay," Zoro said, looking as if he couldn't care less about the answer as Dalton looked up in amazement. "You mean that person I saw flying through the air, that was Wapol?" he asked, standing unsteadily on his feet as he came over to gab at him. You beat him?" "Yep, I sure did," Luffy said proudly as Usopp went on about fighting an imaginary condor on the way up here. "And his two henchmen, what happened to them?" Dalton went on. "Oh, well the reindeer beat them up," Luffy answered back happily and Dalton was looking completely lost here. "What? Those two, a reindeer?" he stuttered as Usopp's story got old quick. Luffy changed the subject by calling to his sniper, "Oh, hey, Usopp, I made a new friend, you gotta meet him, get this, he's a reindeer." "Reindeer?" Usopp repeated, clearly not understanding what he was talking about. A look of marvel came over Dalton's face. Just then they heard some snow crunching a little bit away and they looked to see Chopper hiding behind some trees as he watched them. "Blue Nose," whispered a voice and he looked up at Dalton who was staring at him. "You never gave up, did you? You still kept fighting, believing in what this country could become." He then fell to his knees and gasped out, sounding like he was crying. "And now thanks to you, Drum Kingdom it can finally be reborn." Soon, the other villagers showed up and spotted him hiding. At once they started to freak out and backed away as they looked for their weapons. Dalton tried to stop them, telling them not to shoot as Usopp freaked out and screamed out that he was a Yeti, and that someone should shoot him. Chopper turned and began crying as he ran away. Luffy got angry and hit Usopp over his head. Jerkface, he's not a Yeti, you idiot, he's my new friend. That thing's your friend, he screamed back in shock. You guys scared him so bad he ran away, Luffy yelled as he went running after him. I'll bring him back so that you can meet him, you jerks. He then yelled out, come back reindeer, I want to introduce you to my friends. Later outside the castle, but it was night and the snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes and the snow sparkled from the full moon. That was illuminating the doctor's flag at the top of the castle. Usopp was busy building a snowman as Zoro watched Luffy walking around, still calling out for Chopper. Let's be pirates together. Luffy continued to shout, come be a pirate with us, okay reindeer guy. Come on, Luffy, Usopp said tiredly, holding the snowman's head in his hands. Why don't you just give it up? We've been tracking him forever and he still hasn't shown up. He's not interested in becoming a pirate, Zoro stated patiently, you're just gonna have to accept that. Luffy turned to give them a hard look. No, he said stubbornly, that's not true. I want the reindeer to be a pirate with us. Just because you want something doesn't mean it's gonna happen, Zoro yelled, losing his patience. Luffy ignored him as he went back to calling for Chopper, and he probably would have kept looking all night if that's what it took. There was another crunch of snow behind them and they all looked up to see that Chopper had finally come out and he had turned to face them just as Vivi and Nami were dragging Sanji out of the castle. Literally dragging him by his legs, he seemed to be out cold. Reindeer guy, Luffy exclaimed happily as Zoro and Usopp both looked up, and this time Usopp didn't panic when he saw Chopper. Tony, Nami exclaimed in surprise when she saw him standing there. Hey, you gonna come on our ship and be a pirate with us, Kate? Luffy asked excitedly and they all knew that even if he said no, he wasn't going to let it go. Chopper had his face down so that they couldn't see him and whispered that he couldn't. Sure you can reindeer, it's a whole lot of fun, Luffy insisted. That's not a very good argument, Usopp yelled at him. I can't, Chopper whispered before he looked up and yelled out, I'm not a human, I'm a reindeer. I have antlers and hooves, see, I even have a blue nose. He paused here for breath, it seemed as if he had been wanting to say all this for years. Okay, maybe I do want to be a pirate, Chopper cried out, but I can't ever be one of you. I'm not human, I'm a monster. I can't be your friend and I can't become a pirate on your ship, you see, I'm just here to say, thank you. He looked like he was about to cry as he finished up and looked directly at Luffy. I appreciate you asking me to join your ship. That was really nice, thank you. Luffy frowned at him, looking close to a pout as the Straw Hats looked at him. I'm going to stay here for now, Chopper said, sounding like he was trying to convince himself that as he looked up with a forced smile, but if you wanted to, you can stop by here again. But Luffy heard enough. Shut up, he suddenly shouted, let's g-g-g-g-g-g-g-g-o-o-o. He screamed out, punching the air and his hat being knocked off. And, to the reindeer doctor's amazement, Luffy transformed into a half-human, half-reindeer that, while bigger than him and lacked the blue nose, was almost identical to Chopper. Suddenly, Chopper saw Luffy's image overlapped by another man who'd found him wounded in the snow all those years ago. In order to show the younger Chopper he meant no harm, he had stripped down naked in the snow to show him that he meant no harm. Now, another human was showing him that it didn't matter to him if he was a human or an animal, and that he wasn't alone. It was here that Chopper couldn't stop the tears as he burst out crying. With that, Tony Chopper became an official member of the Straw Hat Pirates. Chopper had told his new captain that he was going to say his goodbyes to Dr. Kureha before leaving. Shortly afterwards, the other members of the crew all gathered. The Straw Hats were all standing outside the castle again, only now Chopper was missing and they could hear screams of terror inside the castle. What's going on? Zoro asked, looking back to the castle. There's a lot of noise going on inside the castle. How inconsiderate, Nami stated, making all that noise while those two were trying to say goodbye. That's just downright rude. Suddenly, they heard someone call out to them. Turning towards the castle's entrance, they saw that Chopper was pulling a sleigh behind him and was being chased by Dr. Kureha who was swinging around a heavy spiked ball, and looking like she was trying to kill him with an insane look on her face. Chopper screamed at them to get in the sleigh and that they were going down the mountain. They jumped in just as Doctorine threw the spike ball, narrowly missing them as they jumped down onto the rope that connected them to the ground and rode on through the night sky, their silhouettes against the bright full moon, making them look as if they were flying. After the entire crew was now down the mountain, near the shoreline and they could see the Drum Rockies in the far distance, so small that you never guess what a nightmare it was to climb. They were all just starting to get out of the sleigh, Sanji having to lean a little on Usopp's shoulder, just as they could hear the sounds of miniature explosions in the distance. The booms were coming from the castle and suddenly lights appeared so that they could all gasp. Oh, cool, Luffy said next to them in awe as they all stared at it. There, on the middle mountain, it looked like it had turned into the biggest cherry tree imaginable and pink blossoms fell like snow. The mountain was enshrouded by cherry blossoms. The entire sky was lit up and millions of petals were falling around them, drifting everywhere and turning the white around them into a brilliant shade of pink. Chopper could only cry in happiness as the crew stared in wonder. Soon they were back on the Merry and sailing away from the island, the cherry blossoms still fluttering everywhere, making the whole thing seem more beautiful than ever. The Straw Hat Men were all partying, as Usopp was yelling for Chopper to come join them and Luffy was trying to get him shove the chopsticks up his nose. Sanji cheering out that, it's a great moonlit night and cherry blossoms are in the air, how can we not party? They're a handful, Nami whispered to Chopper, who was trying to crawl away from them, already looking like he was second-guessing his choice to come with them. I hate to tell ya, but your new friends are about as crazy as they come. My friends, Chopper repeated slowly as she nodded back at him, telling him that he would get used to it. Meanwhile, Vivi was trying to warm Karoo up. Apparently they found him in the river, and after Chopper spoke to him, it turned out that Zoro was swimming in the river and disappeared, so he jumped in because he thought he was in trouble and he got frozen in it instead. It was then that it was revealed that he could speak to animals as well, no matter what form he was in. Nami praised him for his medical skills and talking to animals. He was pretty talented and he began dancing in happiness. When Zoro asked what she meant, she explained that Dr. Kureha taught him everything she knew. Huh? The three of them gasped. Impossible, Zoro said in a stunned voice, all three of them staring at Chopper. Chopper, are you really a doctor? How cool, Luffy said in shock. No way, Usopp gasped. Really, Luffy, if you didn't know that, then what did you think Chopper was when you asked him to join us? Nami asked irritably. I was thinking he was a transforming reindeer monster, and that he's cool, Luffy answered, folding his arms without a second thought. Backup food, Sanji added, and Chopper froze at that before he gasped that he left his medical bag behind with all his tools. But Nami held it up for him, asking if this was it, and he stared at it as she explained that it was in the back of sleigh, and she asked if he was the one who packed it and got it ready, but it was clear that he hadn't. The party went on, as loud and wild as it always was when they threw a celebration. Zoro and Sanji were fighting and Luffy was cheering them on as Usopp tried to get their attention as Vivi was trying to help Karoo, who was choking on food. Even Chopper was getting in on it as he put the chopsticks up his nose. Usopp cheered out, I propose a toast to our new friend Chopper, and soon they all cheered, holding their glasses up high as they sailed into the night.